Soft music played inside the enormous mansion. A vast multitude of the Empire's most noblemen had gathered there. A moment later, the butler announced, "Sir Felix Chamberlain and Lady Claudia Chamberlain have arrived." Two young men entered the hall. The three young men standing nearby seemed not to notice the new guests entering, or simply ignored them. One of the girls present slightly extended her hand and greeted the newcomers. Then the girl pressed her mouth to her interlocutor's ear, covered it with her hand, and said, "Claudia, it's time for you to choose." Her interlocutor's eyes widened in bewilderment, and she asked again, "Who?" The girl who started the conversation hesitated and said, "Who do you mean? Of course, you have to choose a suitable groom." Claudia still looked at her with confusion and asked again, "Why?" After this, her companion was speechless. She thought, "How can I say this? If you don't make a choice, they'll kidnap you, wreak havoc, and then lock you up with 3 more scoundrels." She continued whispering in Claudia's ear and said, "Everything happens for a reason. First, listen to me." She said that the first candidate is His Highness the Crown Prince, who will take the place of the ruler of our L'Occitane Empire in the future. Then she added, "If you choose His Highness, you will become the mother of an empire." To which the girl thought, "Here he is, a man named Lucas Darien L'Occitane." The girl thought that she didn't like him at all when she looked at the Crown Prince's face. After this, noticing the confusion on Claudia's face, her interlocutor wanted to loudly call her by name. She told Claudia that she thought the Duke standing next to her was also a good option. She said, "Corral is a city of primordial chaos, tacitly known for all manner of crimes. They say all power there lies in the hands of His Highness, and he runs everything. Moreover, this man, in the opinion of many, is not inferior even to the Crown Prince in wealth and influence." This man's name was Benjamin Lamberg. He said, "It would be better to hear the girl's own opinion about who owns her heart." Hearing this, Claudia quietly said, "I'm not interested in criminals." At the same time, the girl standing next to her was ready to scream loudly again. Why doesn't she want to choose anyone? There was still one option left, and she said, "Then how does the hero of the empire, the Holy Knight, suit you?" After the religious reform, even clergy could marry. Constantine was such a man, and he immediately said, "I think you've already heard the answer." Claudia seemed frightened. She said that a priest who had sworn to dedicate his life to serving God should not renounce his faith and marry. That would be disrespectful. The girl cried out, "What outdated views you have, Claudia! You must choose as soon as possible." Everyone stood and waited to hear what the girl named Claudia would say when she said, "I didn't want to say this, but I. Then she fell silent. But after this, Claudia seemed to pluck up her courage and shouted loudly, "I'm going to spend my whole life with Irene." A young man wearing glasses and holding a glass in his hand, standing nearby, heard this and looked strangely at Claudia. One of the young men standing nearby looked at her in the same strange way. Everyone was surprised by Claudia's words, that she was going to spend her life with some Irene. But the girl standing next to Claudia was most surprised by this answer. She couldn't believe she'd said, "all my life." This girl's name was Irene Ember. Her real name was Kim Hisu, and a year ago, she was transported into a romantic fantasy novel. No matter how you look at it, she ended up in this novel and seduced the main character, who was being coveted by completely different people. She found herself in this novella in the role of another victim of these same people, who could not forgive her for her misdeed. This novel was a drama filled with brutality. Irene Ember, or more precisely Kim Hisu, had an uncanny ability to draw people to her. However, this ability only extended to those of the same gender as her, so Irene was surrounded by only girls. She had a novella that she had loved since school, and never parted with this book. The book was called The Flower That Blooms on a Withered Branch, Sarav for short. It was a romantic fantasy novel. However, it is known not only as a drama filled with cruelty, but also as a gripping book that once you open it, you will never be able to fall asleep again. The girl remembered even crying over the book. She told herself, "Claudia, I would have treated you so much better." Kim Hisu even left a comment on the book's fan forum. However, this doesn't necessarily mean she wanted to be reborn as the novel's heroine and live within her. But that's exactly what happened. Her name is now Irene Ember, the eldest daughter of the debt-ridden Viscountcy of Ember. Her life is quite complicated. In the book, she became friends with the novella's protagonist, but then got into an accident that resulted in her death. And now Irene, clutching her head, thought, "I don't want to die in the novel. If I want to survive, I need to avoid the main character at all costs." She remembered well how her life had begun. The Viscountcy of Ember was already almost buried under a mountain of steadily mounting debt, and she found herself in a very difficult situation. It was at that moment that she met Claudia, who became her light and found her girlfriend. It was thanks to her meeting with Claudia that she was able to rise from the poverty she had fallen into and return to high society. It was only because of their friendship that Claudia decided to fully repay the Ember family's debts. She paid, and as a result, Irene found herself by Claudia's side. That is why Irene decided to remain Claudia's doormat for the rest of her life and worship her as her savior. Now she stood in a huge ballroom next to a girl named Claudia and 3 men, each of whom planned to become Claudia's life partner. Irene turned to the girl standing next to her and asked, "Claudia, isn't it dangerous to say that you will never get married?" Claudia looked at her with surprise and directness and asked, "Why?" Irene wanted to scream. Her heart began to beat faster in her chest. It was necessary for her to continue living. Claudia, as if nothing had happened, laughed and said, Irene, your mouth is now triangular, like a chipmunk's. It's so cute. After that, she took Irene's face by the cheeks with her fingers and began to squeeze it, while she mentally asked the girl to concentrate. Then she said, "By the way, I found a dress in this season's collection at the Karandi boutique that would be perfect for Irene." Claudia bowed and said to the girl, "I want to definitely give you this dress. You will accept it, right?" After this, Claudia smiled and added, "Irene is so kind to me and to everyone around her." The girl wanted to scream at that moment. "Claudia, I will survive if only you connect your life with one of these three. But why are you constantly clinging to me?" She really wanted to say, "Do you really want me to accept the fate of the original story and die according to the role assigned to me?" as she patted her cheek. At this point, the Crown Prince spoke up. He sighed slightly and said, "Claudia, do you really want to spend your whole life with this?" While Irene hid behind Claudia, the prince added, "I hope I heard you wrong." After this, the young man pointed his finger in Irene's direction and said, "Otherwise, I won't be able to resist wringing the neck of your small and fragile bride." Irene's body broke out in a cold sweat. It seemed as if someone had just threatened to kill her. Claudia immediately rushed to her friend's defense. She shouted loudly, "Don't touch her, your highness!" She continued to shout at the prince and declared, "I will not sit idly by, even if it is your highness in front of me." Another person joined the conversation. He said, "So, before the Ember family, I dare say you have rather unusual preferences, Claudia." Then the duke said, "After all, she almost became my slave in payment for her father's debt. How amusing it all looks." Claudia immediately pounced on the duke and asked, "Your Grace, are you threatening Irene now?" To which he replied, "You're smart. Could this really be because of the power of love?" Irene's heart was pounding. She didn't understand what was happening, and she didn't want to be a part of it. Then she saw the third man's gaze. He said, "If you use divine power correctly, it seems you can even kill a person." Irene screamed loudly. Claudia rushed to calm her down, saying, "Don't worry, Irene. I'll protect you." After that, the girl felt someone put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Behave appropriately. I don't understand why you're trying to defend your right to possess Claudia." Claudia raised her head to him and said questioningly, "Brother?" The young man declared, "Claudia is not anyone's property. Please respect my sister's opinion. And besides, shouldn't we hear what Claudia herself thinks about this?" The girl said, "Well, of course, only Irene and my brother respect my opinion." The men standing there listened to Claudia, who continued, "I hate all three of you. Do you think it's enough to just say you like me?" She said, "You are domineering, intimidating, and you don't even want to consider my opinion." After this, Claudia screamed loudly, addressing the young men, "You are all like savages. Only Irene can possess me completely." After that, she hugged the girl standing next to her and said, "Irene will possess me for the rest of my life." After that, Claudia pulled Irene along with her and said, "Let's get out of here." On the way, she asked, "What kind of love is this they talk about? Is disrespecting your partner really love?" She began to cry quietly. Sitting away from the ballroom, Claudia said, "It's just possessiveness, just the desire to win and get that precious trophy. I wish they'd finally stop being so greedy and leave me alone. I couldn't love people like that, even if I died." When Irene asked Claudia if she hated them that much, she replied, "Yes, they're simply disgusting. I give you my love, so how dare you refuse?" That's their language and attitude. Irene kept her eyes fixed on her interlocutor. It seemed that extricating herself from this difficult situation would be very difficult. Claudia was the main character in this novella, and since the other three were the main male characters, Irene thought she'd have to end up with one of them. But how evil were they? Irene thought about this and realized that she was actually going to save her life, while destroying Claudia, who treated her so well. The girl was nice, and Irene turned to her and said, "I'm sorry I kept making you choose." Claudia looked back questioningly and said, "But Irene isn't the type to do things like that without good reason. You probably had your reasons, but if you're truly sorry, then so be it." After this, Claudia said to Irene, "Let me hug you now." Irene smiled back and said, "Okay." After this, the girls began to hug each other cheerfully, as if nothing bad had happened before. At first, Claudia screamed loudly, "I really love Irene," but at some point, as if remembering something, she suddenly cried out in horror, "Oh God!" After this, Claudia screamed even louder, "Now I too have committed a disgusting act. I didn't get Irene's permission." To which she asked again, "Did you only just realize this?" After that, Irene leaned over her friend and said, "It's okay, Claudia. If the situation called for it, you could do it that way." After that, she asked, "Could you please remain my friend for life?" Irene laughed out loud and replied, "I would be happy to be your friend." At that very moment, she thought, "God, am I really destined to die because of this decision of mine?" Claudia's brother was named Felix Chamberlain. He was her only older brother. He was the eldest son of the noble and influential Chamberlain family, and also the youngest undersecretary of the Ministry of Magic. According to Irene's book, he was a genius born with a huge amount of mana and an outstanding talent for magic. Felix has a reputation for being a sincere and kind person with great leadership qualities, and like many of the main character's older brothers, he also has a sister complex. So you could say that he was like a unicorn, a creature that essentially doesn't exist in reality, and now the girls were running as fast as they could to see exactly this unicorn. Felix sat on a bench near a rose bush and played with a twig with a cat. When the girl approached him, he said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to violate the rules of decency by unexpectedly intruding on you." The girl replied, "It's okay. Everything's fine. Irene had a peculiar affliction. If a person of the opposite sex was in front of her, her face would harden and her speech would become dry. This trait haunted her throughout her life. Because of this, men who spoke to her always asked the same thing. Felix asked the same thing. Are you angry? She thought, is that possible? She wasn't at all angry at beautiful people, and that's exactly what she said to the young man. While the man was pondering something, the girl added, long time no see. Are you training hardened resistance magic right now? This was important, because in the original story, Felix became the scapegoat for the main characters. That's why they decided to get their hands on Claudia at all costs, just as everything was reaching its climax. They isolated her and used a relic containing the magic of an ancient demon, capable of destroying the world. Felix was faced with a choice between saving the world and sacrificing himself. As a result, he took all the demon's power upon himself. He fell under the demon's control and destroyed his own family, Chamberlain. After the three main characters dealt with Felix, who had lost his value to them, they rescued Claudia, pretending to be her saviors. Irene wanted to prevent at least this tragedy. That's why she turned to Felix, stunned by her words, and said, please, don't tell anyone and continue studying resistance magic. The girl's face looked almost pleading. She couldn't explain anything, so she asked only for this. But Felix, smiling, happily agreed to fulfill her request and said, thank you for pointing out my shortcoming. No matter how skilled a person is, he always has something to learn. Irene thought it was rather rude of her, if you look at it that way. And at the same time, she thought this man was a true angel, so pure. Afterwards, Felix turned to her and said, what a relief! I didn't want to wake you while you were sleeping so soundly. The girl asked, puzzled, what? Then she exclaimed, feeling that there was a hidden meaning in it. Felix smiled and said, if I'm not mistaken, you just recently hired a new servant. The girl raised her voice again. What are you trying to say? You keep changing the subject. After this, Felix said in a mysterious voice, it seems your maid has been bribed. He asked if she knew she was being poisoned. The dose is above the lethal limit, so you will die soon. Irene was ready to explode with horror. She wanted to scream, but instead she quietly asked, how much time do I have left? When her interlocutor answered, a quarter of a day, the girl thought, so these madmen have already taken up the matter, and I'm going to die now. After this, Felix smiled and said, but you still have a whole quarter of the day at your disposal. If I weren't here, you wouldn't be here. Irene swallowed hard and asked, have assassins really come here? Felix replied, remain calm, I've already sent them back. She was very curious to know where exactly he had sent them, but Irene was terrified. It didn't matter now, she could die. However, Felix continued to smile and said, so don't stand so far away, come closer, I will heal you. Irene couldn't understand why he'd scared her so much. She quietly asked, what? Can you really heal? She took a few steps towards the young magician and said, thank you for your help. They stood opposite each other, and the young man said, Irene, you are too far away. I can only heal a person if I touch him with at least my hand. After that, he extended his hand to her, and she nodded and came closer. A moment later, Irene's hand found its way into Felix's. He gently touched her fingers. Felix said sadly, Claudia is just like you. She also doesn't like it when I look down at her like I'm a pole. Irene thought, when did she ever say something like that? Suddenly, Irene felt warmth, first in her palm, then in her hand, and then throughout her whole body. At the same time, the young man said that Claudia had been beautiful since childhood, like an angel, which is why she had been kidnapped several times. After this, Felix said that at some point, when people saw Claudia, they began to fall in love with her at first sight and court her. He usually handled things himself, but if that wasn't enough, they would resort to using their authority. Even when faced with such situations, he would still tell his sister he would sort things out. Felix then added that he always said the same thing. He'd figure it out, and Claudia had absolutely nothing to worry about. After that, Irene asked, is that really why everything fell apart? But the young man shook his head and replied, no, I should have told Claudia from the start not to hold back. It's my fault her self-esteem has plummeted so much. Felix continued, however, Claudia has changed a lot lately, and it's all because she stayed by your side. The girl replied, and I thought I was already dead to society. After this, the young man released her hand and said, Claudia looks very happy now. I haven't seen her so radiant since she was a child. Irene looked at her hand in shock, and hearing Felix's question, there, it's done. Does it hurt? Replied, ah, thank you very much. She listened attentively to the young man, who added, Irene is also completely defenseless, so I'm worried. I think I understand why Claudia was in such a hurry to bring you here. When the girl asked, and what's the reason? Felix, to her surprise, replied, because you're sweet. After this, the young man laughed loudly and said, by the way, would you allow me to kidnap you, young lady? And he extended his hand to Irene. As soon as Irene entered the room, a girl rushed towards her like a hurricane and embraced her tightly, exclaiming, Irene! After that, Claudia said, I've already heard the news. Who would have thought that His Highness's worthless rogues would act so quickly and try to poison you? She continued, they even dared to get to my Irene. I will find them right now and twist every bone, every joint in their body in the opposite direction. Claudia persisted. They've lost all sense of common sense. We need to deal with them now. Felix approached them and turning to his sister, said, Claudia, perhaps it would be better to first console Irene, who almost got into serious trouble. After all, she could have died. Claudia shuddered all over and then said, "Oh, right. What was that, me?" And then she asked, "Irene, you must have been very scared." Irene took Claudia's hands and said, "I've become an enemy to many. So I expected something like this, but I didn't think it would happen so quickly." Claudia's face looked sad. She said quietly, "Don't say that. This isn't your fault at all." Irene leaned against the wall and, smiling, said, "Of course, it's only their fault. Right now, I'm busy enjoying life every day, so there's no need to waste my feelings on unworthy people." Claudia immediately laughed and said, "Irene, you are so sweet." After this, the girls shook hands and began to discuss some of their girlish affairs. Then Claudia pulled Irene along with her and said, "I want to show you something, Irene. Come with me." Irene exclaimed joyfully, "Good!" and followed her. A kind and gentle Felix watched them go with a smile. A true culinary work of art awaited the girl, a huge cake standing in the middle of the room. There were many servants and maids in the room, who were setting the tables with various drinks and treats. There was also an amazing attraction there, a carousel, captivating with its beauty. When the girls entered, Irene was completely shocked by what she saw. Her gaze darted in all directions. Claudia clapped her hands loudly and cried out, "Gifts for Irene!" At the same time, Irene almost screamed in shock. She couldn't believe all this was being arranged for her. Seeing her reaction, Claudia became upset and asked, "Don't you like it? Maybe something is missing?" When Irene replied that there was too much of everything, Claudia perked up and said, "Then I prepared the walk-in closet separately. I decided that putting everything here would be too chaotic. Maybe we should start there?" At this point, Felix thoughtfully said, "Wouldn't it be better to make a river with an artificial waterfall and put a boat in the center?" He continued, "It looks nice, but it's a hassle. Perhaps we should build tracks for small trains, although first we need to order a high-speed magic train." Irene was completely confused by his words. She had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. She still couldn't get over the shock. She couldn't believe that all this was for her. But then she seemed to come to her senses, and smiling said, "Wait, I don't dislike it at all. I'm very happy. Thank you for all this." Claudia replied, "Actually, Irene, I know almost nothing about you. You know so much about me that I can rely on you completely, but you tell me almost nothing about yourself." Claudia seemed about to burst into tears. "I also want to know what you like, Irene." Irene looked at her, confused. She could have said a lot, but she decided to start with the simple. She said, "My best companion in life is money. I love money, and I also love to eat. Meals and snacks seem to have separate stomachs." With a slight smile, she continued, "And I like beautiful people. Just looking at their faces is already pleasant. I could admire them all day." Claudia listened to her with delight, and Irene added, "I also love to have fun, spend time with friends, and I love toys, and sleeping cuddled with something soft is the best thing in the world." After that, she said a little embarrassedly, "And as a child, I dreamed of becoming a lazy person with a lot of money." After all this, Irene plopped down on the floor right in front of Felix and Claudia. "Failure!" She told them everything. Then the girl said, "It's okay, unless I'm just a lazy person wasting my money." Seeing Irene's upset face, Claudia replied, "What kind of lazy woman are you? It's enough for me to have you around. Besides, since I'm a beauty with a ton of money, Irene's perfect type." After that, Claudia laughed out loud. "Your friend has absolutely no flaws. She's very sweet." Irene was ready to burst into tears. "Claudia, is there any need for these words?" Claudia replied, "Of course, you're right." Then Claudia asked, "Irene, when will you stop speaking to me so coldly?" Irene immediately threw herself on Claudia's neck and shouted, "Claudia, you are the best!" Looking at this, Felix remarked, "Nice things are valuable simply because they exist." Sometime later, Irene was talking on the phone. "So you're staying there?" "Uh-huh. Maybe for the rest of your life?" She turned around, pressing herself against the wall. "Sister, how old are you to run away from home?" He said nothing. "This isn't an escape. I'm simply leaving the estate, cutting off contact with the human world, and saying goodbye to it forever." Someone on the other end of the line said, "She's cutting me off." "Nonsense! Do you think you're the center of the universe? How did you even get into Chamberlain's house?" "No, actually, I assumed it would be like this." Irene said, "It's all because I'm nice. That's why I stay in this house." She continued, "Our father is the one who's crazy. He sold our family as collateral, including me." The girl added, "Since that's how it turned out, I'll take this opportunity to sever all ties. You should come too after you graduate. Claudia said you can even stay and live here." At that moment, footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Felix slowly approached the girl. He came closer, and someone on the other end of the line said, "I'll think about it." And the girl replied, "Okay, Felix also says he's always glad to see people like you." When the brother replied, "Well, my sister is capable. I'll call later," the girl only said, "Uh-huh." When Irene hung up, she turned to Felix. "Have you gone to bed yet?" He replied, "No, I was reading a book. Who were you just talking to?" Smiling slightly, Irene said it was Liam. To which Felix asked, Liam, so that's your little brother?" He smiled when the girl explained, "Yes, that's right. He was a very energetic and brave child from childhood. By the way, do you have any business with me?" Felix smiled. "Oh, that?" Irene was shocked when Felix said, "I'm talking about resistance magic. Don't worry, your mouth is forming a triangle when you're nervous." He continued, "Let me get straight to the point. May I ask why you asked me about this just recently?" Irene seemed ready. "You won't believe it, but a year ago I saw a similar prophecy." Felix coughed into his fist. I really didn't expect it, but if I were you, I would have done exactly the same. The young man walked into the library, and he asked, is this really a small sacrifice for a great goal? Since Irene says so, it sounds grandiose, and that's only in general terms. Irene shuddered and asked, would you do the same, even if no one remembers your sacrifice, even if not only your achievements, but your entire life are distorted? Felix replied, that's right, exactly. She thought, even if your choice means Claudia's death, a permanently festering wound. Felix was silent for a moment, as if considering her words. But then he smiled, and turning his head towards her, said, even if I have to make such a sacrifice, I hope that Claudia will live her life for me. Irene almost screamed. She knew it. That's why she'd asked him to practice resistance magic. She knew he was willing to sacrifice. Felix said, listen, the demon's power won't disappear just because I'm able to resist it. Irene was horrified. What do you mean it won't disappear? She had read the novella more than 20 times and had never encountered anything like it. Felix explained, if you have resistance, you can neutralize the spells carved by magic on ancient artifacts. But since demons divide and move their soul when they carve out your power, after accepting it, even with resistance, the demon will still half-occupy your body. Irene nervously tugged at the hem of her dress. What should we do then? Felix replied, it all depends on the demon's strength, but the general rule is that they are very difficult to deal with. She could not believe that her efforts could be in vain, and that Felix and Claudia would suffer along with them. While Irene thought that couldn't be true, Felix explained, it depends on the demon's strength, but the general trait is that they have no restraint whatsoever in their desires. When the girl asked Felix, is that all? He smiled slightly and said, but demons are still very dangerous. Irene became interested in the young man's story. Desires? So, what kind of desires exactly? She asked thoughtfully. Felix explained, it depends on the artifact, so I don't even know for sure yet. After all, desires are ingrained in their being, and they don't restrain their instincts. They sat and talked among themselves. Afterwards, Irene said, oh, it's all so complicated. Her expression changed, thinking, wait, could it be that I, too, have been possessed by a demon? After all, I love handsome men. I think money is the best thing in the world. I think delicious food is super. Then she asked, after all people experience at least once what I experience. Felix nodded mentally, explaining, the desires of people and the desires of demons often differ from each other. He continued, because demons can kill a person simply out of a momentary impulse, without feeling any desire to do so, but simply on a whim. Irene asked, aren't you saying that compared to the three who committed all sorts of madness in pursuit of Claudia, the demon's desire is even stronger? Maybe even worse? The young man did not answer immediately, thinking, haven't they themselves already been swallowed up by the devils? Instead, he turned to the girl and said, I don't think you quite understand. Afterwards, Irene said, why do you think I told you all this? I came here to prevent the tragedy in which, according to the prophecy, Felix will stand alone against everyone and die. I don't want you to be the only one who sacrifices his life and dies. And that's precisely my goal. The young man looked at her, and the girl continued, if you become a demon, I will hold you in my arms until hell itself. At this point, Felix said, would you like to listen to me with the same determination? He began to speak while the girl held his hand. I think I understand why God showed you the prophecy. When asked if he believed her, the young man replied, I do, because you, Irene. The girl asked, why do you believe? Felix answered, because I don't want anyone to hurt you anymore, Irene. When the girl asked him why he thought she could be hurt, the young man said, anything can happen, and no one is immune. They continued talking, looking each other straight in the eye. Irene asked, do you really want me to get hurt? Felix replied, no way, I don't want anything like that. Felix was surprised by the girl's words about finding a way for all three of them to be happy, and her request that they not go anywhere. He smiled faintly at this, but the girl replied, but then don't hold back. Before the artifact appears, you can simply get rid of this desire. Isn't that difficult? The young man simply grinned at her and said, I'll try my best to do the same. His face was very smiling as Irene said, don't provoke me, or I'll get angry. She looked sternly at the young man and asked, and what will you try to do? Felix replied, if I keep holding back, somehow, maybe, yes, I will succeed. And then he laughed out loud. Irene couldn't help herself. Why couldn't he understand and listen to her? She asked, how many times do I have to tell you this? If I keep trying, nothing will work. The next moment, a young man's soft hand touched her cheek and gently pulled her head towards him. With a gentle movement of his hand, Felix rested the girl's head on his knee. She couldn't think of anything to say and was silent for only a moment. She lay on his knee and listened to Felix, who asked, Irene, don't worry about anything and just rest. She couldn't understand what just rest meant. The girl noticed his strong thighs and thought, is he really a magician? Maybe he works out every night. So she said, Felix, I'm grateful to you, but my neck hurts. He asked, is it too high? Irene replied, I feel very uncomfortable. Not only is it high, but it's also a bit hard. Felix replied, oh, I beg your pardon. Finally, she calmed down and felt that his thigh was not so hard, and she closed her eyes slightly. The girl lay there thinking, why isn't Felix doing anything? Is he really planning to torture her like this? She felt uncomfortable at first, but thanks to Felix's gentle patting, she soon drifted off to sleep. She thought that Felix was always very caring and accommodating, and blinked her eyes a couple of times. But looking back, Irene eventually came to the conclusion that everything was once again working out exactly the way Felix wanted. At times like these, she was confused whether Felix was a kind and innocent lamb, or someone who was only wearing his mask. After that, Irene slept for a bit, and woke up to hear, "While I was sleeping, you two were doing something. This is too much." This was said by Claudia, who found her brother with her friend, and was now looking at them, not understanding what they were doing. Irene immediately began to comfort her sobbing friend, and she said, "No, Claudia, why are you crying?" To which she replied, "I also want to be a pillow for my friend." Irene hastened to reassure her, smiling and shouting, "If Chloe wants, I can offer my head any time. Besides, sleeping on Felix's lap was pretty painful." Felix asked her again, "Does it hurt then?" "That's annoying to hear. After all, you seem to be sleeping so well." Claudia asked him, "Brother, you're not working, are you?" He replied, "The sun just rose, so it's too early for work." Claudia, "And how are your lessons?" She replied, "Today there will only be daytime ones. Deputy Minister, please report to work quickly." Felix remarked, "Even if the Deputy Minister is late, no one will blame him. I am free to manage my own time." Claudia then said, "Mr. Deputy Minister, you are abusing your power." When he said that, unlike Claudia, who had skipped class yesterday, she exclaimed, "If you don't study hard, Irene might be disappointed in you." Irene hiccuped loudly in fear. After that, Felix patted his sister on the head and said, "Then see you later, Chloe." At that time, Irene thought, "This guy just turned the tables on me." She later said, "I like people who do their jobs diligently." Claudia was frightened and, grabbing Irene's hands, said, "Irene, you know I'm not that kind of person." Irene was forced to confirm, "Yes, I know that." Claudia burst into tears, stating, "I'll try my best, so please don't hate me. I really appreciate your friendship." Her friend replied, "Even if I die and come back to life, I will never hate you or be disappointed in you. I promise to be your close friend, and I will keep my word." Both girls, holding hands, began to dance slowly in a circle. At that moment, a slight cough was heard behind them. When both girls turned around, they saw a middle-aged man standing near the door. Claudia immediately asked, "Father, when did you arrive?" The man replied, "Long before you?" It was Hugo Chamberlain, and the girl hastened to say, "Really, Father? I didn't know you were here. You didn't even give a sign that you were coming." The man sighed heavily and added, "Your brother told me exactly the same thing." He put his finger to his lips and said, "Shh," as if he were afraid of waking someone. Hugo, Felix, and Claudia's father sighed heavily and asked who the unknown girl was. Claudia immediately introduced her. He turned to Lady Ember and said, "I would very much like to speak with you alone." Irene wondered, has this time really come? A conversation with the man who stole his son's heart? Though I don't know about that, and certainly stole his daughter's. They settled comfortably across from each other at a small table. When the girl said, "Excuse me," the man immediately asked why. Irene smiled and replied, "For taking away your precious daughter. And lately, there have been a lot of bad rumors about Claudia." The man looked slightly worried. Hugo said, "Lady, there's no need to apologize for this. Rather, I should be thanking you for finally allowing my daughter to open up." After that, he continued and said, "Besides, she was so happy when I said that there was no need to go to that boring evening." After this, Irene laughed out loud, and her interlocutor said, "It doesn't matter what others say. As long as my child smiles, that's the most important thing for me." The girl smiled, realizing that this man loved his daughter very much. She said, "Then tell me, what was it about you wanted to speak with me alone?" The conversation turned to His Highness the Crown Prince. "This man is looking for Claudia." Irene's companion's face literally darkened to a gray tint when he mentioned the prince. It seemed the topic was unpleasant for him. Lord Chamberlain sighed heavily and said, "I've refused the prince," coming up with various excuses. "But I've reached my limit. Perhaps he no longer wants to be a reasonable man. He's raging like an animal." Now the girl understood from whom Claudia had inherited this manner of speech. The man cleared his throat slightly and said, "Well, unfortunately, I can no longer resist His Highness." Irene replied, "I understand that. So, first of all, the prince needs to be calmed down somehow." Chamberlain replied, "Yes, I beg you. Claudia is simple and innocent, so she usually acts first and only thinks about the consequences later. That's why I wanted to speak with you alone, Lady Ember." The girl was shocked when her interlocutor said, "Please take care of Claudia." She replied, "Of course, I will definitely protect your daughter and do everything in my power." After that, he suddenly looked at the girl sitting in the room with him, stunned, and asked, "Will you protect me?" "Who? The lady?" It seemed he didn't believe anything like that, but it was too late to explain to her. The man grabbed his head with his hand and said, "Please, just watch her closely and stop her if she tries to go somewhere." Irene immediately said, "Okay," and promised to do everything she could to fulfill his order. The girls were outside, and one of them said, "Come to think of it, being stuck in the estate all the time must be suffocating. I was careless." Afterwards, they sat down in a cozy cafe, and Claudia continued, "Sorry, I didn't know you wanted to go out. You know I'm ready to fulfill any request you may have." Irene was stunned by her companion's words. When she said, "What would you like to try? I'll buy you anything you ask," she suddenly asked, "Really?" Claudia replied, "Of course I'm ready to do that." She picked up the menu and said, "Then from here to here?" She showed literally everything on the menu. The girl said to the waiter, "Bring me everything. I can have it. This is my long-standing dream." After that, Claudia laughed and said, Of course, we can order whatever we want. With the menu in hand, Irene cried out, "Hooray! I'm so happy! Finally, I can indulge in my sweet tooth." But the next moment, she closed the menu in horror. She noticed the prices there, and she immediately became upset, saying that the prices were so high that it gave me goosebumps. Claudia laughed, first asking, "Don't you like that it's too cheap here?" She seemed to be completely unimpressed. "Don't worry, this place isn't that bad. Order whatever you want." Irene felt absolutely amazing. She told her friend, "Then I need to prepare my heart a little." At this point, the girls began to hear rumors gleaming behind the words. They said, "My God, they say she rejected those distinguished men. So the rumors are true. That lady, I thought she was a maid." Irene thought how amazing the man who captured Lady Chamberlain's heart must be. But unfortunately, this girl looks more like a meringue. The whispers behind their backs continued. But Viscountess Emperor was quite popular. She knew perfectly well that she wasn't worth a dime on the marriage market, with nothing but debts to her name. So what other option did she have? Her only option was to get her hands on Lady Chamberlain. Irene and Claudia remained seated at the table. But at the same time, they heard what was being said about them at the neighboring tables. One of the gossipers said, "How did Lady Chamberlain ever get mixed up with such a crumpled meringue?" At the same time, at one of the neighboring tables, someone banged his fist and declared that, no matter how much her friend liked Lady Chamberlain, it was impossible to disgrace those gentlemen so much. Meanwhile, Claudia sat and reflected. For a while, the phrase, "she's not anyone's property," had been popular, and if she'd heard them say those words, she couldn't have dreamed of anything more. After the waiter approached the girls, Claudia said, "It's noisy in here." She said to the waiter leaning over her, "I'd like to enjoy some time alone with my companion." The young man replied, "I'm sorry, but I beg your understanding. That's not possible." Afterwards, the girl asked the stunned young man, "No? Can I rent this place for the whole day?" He replied, "What? Only those who book in advance." After this, Claudia smiled broadly at him and said, "In that case, I'm ready to buy the entire cafe. How much will be enough for you?" When the girls went outside, she asked Irene, "Why did you stop me? Why did you stop me from doing what I wanted?" Irene tried to calm her friend down, taking her hands and saying, "We can just go to a boutique right now." To which Claudia replied, "Really? It's okay?" Claudia smiled broadly and asked, "Can you say, buy everything I was looking at earlier again?" Claudia laughed and said, "Oh, how sweet. Maybe we should go out to eat then?" Irene immediately agreed. "Okay, we had lunch, so how about this?" Claudia asked, "Do you mind?" Irene replied, smiling at her, "Of course I don't mind." Afterwards, Claudia returned to her friend, carrying cotton candy in both hands. The girl thanked her. "Thank you, Claudia." Both girls immediately began to enjoy the cotton candy. Irene said, "It's so delicious. It just melts in your mouth." Suddenly they both stopped. Irene heard, "Oh God, in front of me is a man or an angel. Or maybe it's a fairy." Right in front of them was a seemingly homeless drunk. He said to the girls, "It's blinding." When he approached them, one of the girls thought, "What? What kind of worthless man reeks of alcohol a mile away?" At the same time, the man said, "Even your scared face is still so cute." Irene looked at her friend and thought, "Is Chloe really scared now?" The girl said, "What business do you have with me?" And she looked clearly worried. Looking at the girl talking to the drunkard, Irene thought, "It feels like a shield is formed between him and Chloe." While the drunkard said, "Let's take a closer look at the young lady's face, not that underdeveloped little thing." Claudia replied, "My face is indeed beautiful. Not that I forbid you to admire it, but still, I'm not going to give you such a pleasure." After this, Claudia's eyes sparkled, and she looked closely at the man's face, saying, "There's only one person in this world for whom I can look beautiful, so look away from me right now." Claudia looked into the man's face, and he replied, "Listen, madam, you express yourself in a rather rude manner." Claudia didn't stop talking, but continued, "Listen, do you even realize how much psychological trauma you're causing people with your mug?" Claudia said, "Do you think only you can look at beautiful things?" She didn't notice a man walking past in a long hooded cloak who seemed interested in the conversation going on next to him. A moment later, the man turned his head and said questioningly to Claudia, while the drunkard asked, "What do you think is wrong with my eyes?" Claudia was unstoppable. She said, "If you think Irene is a retarded little thing, then you're just an ordinary old man." At the same time, the man replied, "How shameless! Who do you think you were talking to?" And after that, he laughed loudly. The man looked at both girls and said, "Do you think you can get away with anything? I called you pretty a couple of times. That's not true at all." Fearing what might happen next, Irene screamed loudly in horror. But Claudia was determined, despite the fact that the old man had already begun to extend his stinking palm towards her. His fingers seemed about to reach the young girl's face. But a moment later, nothing happened. The hand that was reaching for the girl was stopped. Several armed men, dressed in cloaks and masks, gathered around them. They were assassins. Prince Lucas, who was standing very close to them, immediately prepared to draw his sword, intending to protect the girls. Meanwhile, Irene and Claudia calmly watched as the assassins surrounded the evil old man. The girls were safe. When the assassins surrounded the mischievous old man, he was on the verge of tears. He immediately fell silent and hung his head. He looked scared and sighed heavily, wondering what was going to happen to him now. When the man was grabbed by the forearm, he tried to break free and then shouted loudly, "Stop!" He kicked his arms and legs, trying to escape his fate, and shouted loudly, "Mercy!" But the assassins weren't about to let him go. Both girls watched as the troublesome drunk was carried away by armed men. At the same time, another person was watching all of this. Lucas thought, is it really over already? He felt awkward and looked around hesitantly. At this time, Claudia noticed this man next to them and asked, who is this? Lucas looked in that direction and heard her call him it. The girls were talking among themselves, and when Claudia asked why it was here, her companion replied, who knows? At that moment, Irene was confident that everything was going according to plan, just as she had planned. Irene had been pondering what she should do to ensure that all three suitors would eventually leave Claudia alone. She spent several days pondering this and finally remembered. An incredible idea came to her mind, and she joyfully exclaimed, here it is! In the parts where the main character should have appeared, you're completely unnecessary. She decided she had to make them realize their uselessness. She thought it was a great idea and started with Lucas. Now he asked, Claudia, why are you here? I was passing by and couldn't believe my eyes. Claudia looked at him and thought, this is not a smart, cheeky guy. Then she said, I couldn't believe my eyes either. The man approached her and asked, where have you been hiding all this time? I almost sent a search party to Chamberlain's domain. The girls stood silently, watching the young man approaching them. Lucas paused as Claudia replied, I was just having a wonderful time with my friend, and I wasn't hiding from anyone. And besides, you can't do that without a good reason, Your Highness. The girls looked at the prince, who said, ha! Who would dare stop me? You're partly to blame here. After all, you ignored my calls. Irene thought that he was certainly right. She frowned as she looked at the prince and thought that she would like to hit him with all her might right now. At the same time, Claudia did not remain silent and said, I don't even know why a man who has a fiancé would be so persistent in looking for me, and turned away from Kronprince. At the same time, Lucas shouted loudly, are you asking because you really don't know? I love you. I told you I only have feelings for you. He shouted in the girl's face, this is not a joke or a whim, and the bride is just a cover. When the prince cried out that his love was sincere, Irene closed her eyes. The man said, loving someone is no crime. Irene thought, how shameful. I wish I could just get out of here already. The prince said, listen, I'm in pain and agony. What is this if not love? Then he added, you've changed, Claudia. You've become different. After this, the man looked ominously towards Irene and said, has she really changed so much because of you? He asked the girl, what have you done to my bride, Claudia? Both girls looked into the prince's eyes. Claudia cried out, Your Highness! Irene said at the same time, he asked me, so I must answer. Irene thought Claudia hadn't changed at all. She'd simply found true love. When she told the prince this, he laughed loudly and asked, what nonsense are you talking about? He fell silent when asked, what does the Claudia you know look like? Probably a cowering girl, closing her heart because of her many wounds? Then the man asked, puzzled, what? The girl replied, everyone loves and respects her. So how could she have wounds? Irene explained, Claudia has always been a pure, innocent, and gentle girl, and she never contradicted you. And you still claim she hasn't changed? Afterwards, Irene asked, does brave Chue, who has found her happiness, really not appeal to you anymore? Then does that mean you love someone else, not Claudia? Lucas wasn't about to stand for it. He shouted loudly, are you saying I never really loved Claudia? Don't you dare tell me. Irene didn't stop. If you want to win Claudia's heart, you have to do what she wants. The man asked, why would I do that? At the same time, Irene still wanted to hit him hard, but she restrained herself and answered, because people who love more always end up losing. After this, Kronprince laughed loudly and said nothing. Lucas turned to his bride and said, Claudia, if you want anything, just tell me. After these words, the girl laughed loudly and replied, I want you to never look for me again. The man's face immediately darkened. He seemed to have gone wild, and his gaze immediately turned steely. His eye flashed predatorily to the side, and at that moment, the prince thought, this is all because of that damn Irene Amber. This can't be left like this. Irene hid behind Claudia. She said, I have committed a mortal sin. I only dared to speak directly to His Highness. Please do not be angry. Claudia turned to the prince. Your Highness, you are overdoing it with our Irene. If this conversation is over, could we please leave already? After the prince had left, Claudia asked Irene, okay, that's true, but where did those people come from? The girl replied, I hired them, and you didn't know that? Irene explained that it's just great when you're able to protect yourself without resorting to the help of others. After that, Claudia laughed and said, then maybe we should learn self-defense. But her friend replied that there was no need. In the future, for a pleasant stroll, she could go everywhere with assassins. No, even better, go everywhere with security. Behind them, following the girls, stood a disappointed and upset prince, who could not believe what had just happened. Irene glanced back sideways and silently said, Lucas, look at this. You just got screwed. Just give up and don't bother us anymore. Claudia and Irene were chatting happily as they walked along the street. It seemed like both of them were leading a rather carefree life. The 13th had finally arrived. Hell, it was the day that would soon be followed by their country's Foundation Day celebration. Sitting on the couch, Irene thought that according to the ceremony, families that received territories from the emperor were obliged to participate in this event, and since the Chamberlain family possessed enormous wealth, their presence at the ball would be simply mandatory. There's a strange law in the Loxistan Empire that states that no estate can be built that is larger than the imperial palace. The first head of the Chamberlain family didn't know how to manage their wealth. He asked, can't we build more? Then let's build several. So he built several buildings, slightly smaller than the imperial palace. These buildings were striking in their beauty, and there were a very large number of them. In addition, this man ran a hotel, which was also only slightly smaller than the imperial palace. Irene thought that this was precisely why she couldn't refuse to participate in the festive ball. At the same time, she was worried about how to get rid of the annoying crown prince. A moment later, a servant called the girl and said, "Lady Amber, you have a call from Mr. Liam." The girl replied, "Ah, very well." She went to the phone and wondered why this call from her little brother could be happening. Then Irene picked up the phone and asked, "Hello, is something wrong?" The brother replied, "Sister, don't be scared. Listen carefully." Irene was already all ears when she heard about her brother's call, and now there was such a strange warning. The girl asked, "What did you say?" Then she asked again, "Was our family invited to the ball too?" Her brother replied that he thought it was someone's joke and checked everything carefully, but the invitation actually did have the seal of the imperial family. The girl wondered what kind of intrigue the prince was weaving. She suddenly grabbed her head and declared, "It's okay, brother. I understand everything. See you later." She thought of Prince Lucas. Was this man really about to take action to deal with his rival? Irene also wondered, did he really think she'd give in so easily? After all, she was determined to force this particular man to admit defeat. Everything the girl did, she decided to do for the sake of a happy ending, and on this moonlit night, she thought only of that. Although it was quite light outside from the moon, everyone in the Chamberlain house was already asleep, and there was a complete deathly silence. Only one of its inhabitants was awake. Irene, dressed in a dark cloak with a hood, lightly opened the door to her room. The girl began to turn her head left and right to make sure that no one was there. But a moment later, she almost fainted when someone quietly, it seemed, called her name. Irene. Everything inside her literally went cold. Her body broke out in a cold sweat, and she grabbed the door. And then, right in front of her, stood Felix. He said, "If you go to bed earlier, you'll have time to grow up." Irene wondered if he was being serious now, since her growth had already stopped and she was not growing. After this, Felix looked into the girl's eyes and asked what had happened. She didn't answer. Then the young man smiled at Irene and asked where she was going at such a late hour. The girl immediately began searching for excuses. She said, "You see?" And then, suddenly falling silent, declared, don't you have an artifact that, like teleportation, could do a pum and transport me to another location?" The young man explained to her that teleportation magic should never be carved on artifacts. After Irene asked why, the young man said that if you set the coordinates incorrectly, there was a high chance you would end up in a void and fall, and then die. After this, he added that, in the worst case, it may happen that the body part does not follow the magic, and some magicians remain alive, cut into several pieces. He also said that if the coordinates weren't determined accurately, there were cases of people getting stuck in the wall. But Irene couldn't take it anymore and screamed, "Enough!" After that, she said, "I think it would be better to go by carriage. After all, a carriage is the best transportation." Felix laughed in response. "If you need to go somewhere, I'll take you there." He was surprised by Irene's words, which explained, "It's not worth it. I don't want anyone to find out about this place, so if I come with an escort, the meeting might not take place." He asked wordly if they were talking about meeting a man. The girl replied, "Not at all. I'm going to meet a woman." Felix seemed visibly more cheerful upon hearing her answer. He shouted loudly, "Oh, really?" and burst out laughing. Then the young man thought for a moment and said, "I'm just a little worried about whether you'll be safe and whether you'll be in any danger." The girl asked again, "What? Some kind of problem?" Felix replied, "No, I just felt a little limited." Then he asked her what she would say about security. When the girl asked if he was going to guard her himself, something strange happened. The glass in the frame of his glasses cracked. The man and the girl stood facing each other. Irene promised, "I'll be extremely careful, and I'll be back very quickly. You don't have to worry about anything." After this, the girl smiled broadly at him again and added, "I promise." Felix put his hand to his head and thought he couldn't do anything. He was completely confused, so he just laughed. But then the young man began pulling something out from the hem of his jacket. He said, "Then take this." A moment later, he placed some sparkling object on the girl's palm. When Irene, holding a glowing object in both palms, asked what it was, Felix explained, "It's a gem that will alert me to your location when you break it. If you encounter danger, use it." Irene laughed out loud and then said, "Thank you, Felix." The L'Occitane Empire also had a secret nightlife. There were two secret organizations. The City of Chaos, ruled by Duke Benjamin, was called Carlisle. Everything about it was simply sinister. Another secret society was Silentium. Unlike gloomy Carlisle, it was a fairly civilized place. It was to this place, Silentium, that the girl headed, with slow, confident steps. She knew they were excellent at keeping secrets here. Irene thought no one knew for sure about the existence of this organization, so there were many assumptions and theories circulating. But this didn't concern her, because she had read the novel. She walked faster and faster, remembering that before meeting Claudia, she had to search everywhere to survive. And of course, that's how she found this place. Taking hold of the door handle with both hands, she thought that, knowing the contents of the novel, she had decided to sell information about the future and buy the one that was not in the novel. As she walked inside, she thought she had made the most of her unique features and charm, and it was just great. As soon as she entered, she saw an elegantly dressed young lady sitting at the bar. Seeing her, Irene rushed towards the girl with a joyful cry of, "Martina!" The woman sitting there seemed delighted to see the guest. She called her by name, Irene. She was the most important person in the secret organization. After this, Martina slightly waved her index finger at her and said, "Come to me." Irene, shouting, "Little sister," threw herself on her neck and began to hug her. She looked into the woman's face and asked, "Did you change your lipstick color?" Martina replied, "Yes, that's right. I picked up some things from the new collection." Irene decided to flatter a little and said, "The lipstick suits you perfectly." Martina responded by immediately tugging at her cheeks and saying, "You're such a cutie. It seems like your cheeks have gotten even plumper since we last saw each other." The girl replied, "It just happened that way." She was ready to cry, but Martina said, "At least I have something to touch. It's so cool." It seemed a different kind of charm was at work here. After that, Martina called her over and said, "Irene, sit down and have a drink with me. Why do you call me so rarely lately?" Looking around at the barrels of alcohol, the girl replied, "It's just that now there are a lot of people who threaten my life." Martina asked, "Isn't it because you are now the girlfriend of a beautiful flower of high society named Claudia?" Irene explained, "Yes, it's because such an important person gives me so much love." Martina smiled when Irene began to tell how she and the crown prince had almost come to blows in the market square, and said, "I don't think I can come to your funeral, but maybe we can say goodbye here and now." In response, Irene merely frowned and asked if the woman sitting opposite her was joking. She replied, "I'm quite serious." After that, Martina said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not going to help you this time." Irene replied, "Yes, I understand. I still have a conscience." As someone else appeared at the door, Martina said, "I can only tell you one thing. Just recently, the Duke of Lemberg came to see me." Then she added that his appearance was not at all accidental, and he was asking specifically about Irene. Irene knew that the story called Zerev was a drama filled with cruelty, and there were a great many villains in it. Martina was also one of the villains, although she turned out to be a good friend of hers. This woman fell in love with Benjamin at first sight, and he took advantage of this in every possible way, often receiving help from her. To put it bluntly, Martina found herself trapped by him and had to provide him with whatever Benjamin demanded. He received a wide variety of information from her because the power of information sometimes exceeds physical strength. Irene took action even before Martina succumbed to Benjamin's wiles, and ultimately won. If asked how she did it, it would be easy to explain. All of this became possible because of Martina's unhappy childhood. She was simply bought and sold like a commodity. This girl was from a poor family, and eventually her relatives were forced to sell Martin into slavery. She experienced unspeakable hardship and loneliness as a child, but all this only strengthened her. Martina carefully concealed her weaknesses. She was afraid that someone would find out about her past. She always remained alone so that no one would know her innermost secrets. But Irene managed to befriend her. She simply listened to her confession, told one day while slightly hungover. Irene listened, clasped her hands, and felt sorry for the poor orphan who had found herself in such difficult life circumstances. After Irene expressed her sympathy, Martina laughed. "Apparently, sincerity can reach anyone." Martina said, "You're the first person who's ever listened so attentively to my story." As a result, Irene only came to see her occasionally, but Martina always greeted her warmly and was delighted by her every visit. Sometimes Irene even wondered if Martina treated her like a human being. Martina now said, "Benjamin asked for information about you." The girl immediately asked what information exactly he needed. Martina placed a cocktail glass on the table and explained, "Very personal and rather insignificant. What you like and don't like, what your hobbies are, and other such trivial matters." Irene immediately asked again if she had noticed anything strange in his behavior and questions. Martina thought for a moment and said, "The way he keeps contacting me without any particular purpose suggests he has ulterior motives. He's driving me crazy." After that, she squeezed the girl's cheek again and asked, "Why are you so happy?" Irene responded, "Oh, what are you saying?" and thought that sometimes Martina treated her like a precious child. She wondered if she would have felt the same way if the woman who had given birth to her had been sane. Finally, Martina asked, "So, what business do you have with me today?" Irene began to explain, "You probably know that I received an invitation to a ball at the imperial palace." When Martina asked again, "Are you talking about your grave?" Irene replied, "Although you are right, I think this is too much," and was ready to burst into tears. Irene said, "Well, that's why I need some information." Martina asked, "Irene, tell me what I say is the basis of the negotiations." Irene thought for a moment and replied, "If you want to get something, there must be something you can give in return, and nothing else." After that, Martina patted her on the head and said, "You're really smart. Then tell me, what can you give me?" The girl replied, "As always, I'm ready to share information with you." Martina smiled back at her, laughed slightly and said, "Okay." The clothing store was almost deserted. It was as if it were locked, and no one disturbed its silence. Out of breath and tired, Irene poked her head out from behind the dresses and asked, "Chloe, how long are you going to spend choosing your clothes?" Next to her, from a similar pile of dresses, Claudia's face appeared, and she said, "Irene, everything suits me, so I can't decide what to choose." When the girl asked Claudia if she was being overzealous in choosing her dress, Claudia replied, "Not at all." At the same time, Irene wondered what "not at all" meant when Claudia had chosen her dress in just a second. The store was in a real bustle. Irene lay tiredly on the sofa, while the salesperson and Claudia rushed around her with various outfits. Irene lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. She thought it would take all day at this rate. Why did she even need to dress up? This wouldn't do. She needed to use her powers. She decided that she needed to distract Claudia with something so that she would finally calm down. At this time, the saleswoman heard the girl say, "No matter what you put on me, it looks good on me." The woman immediately turned towards where the client's voice was coming from. She lay flat on the sofa and added, "I'm a model who will perfectly complement any outfit." Irene looked towards the salesperson and asked, "Am I right?" There was not a single emotion on the poor woman's face. She did not know what to answer and froze like a statue. After this, the girl slightly turned her head to the side, and Irene mentally demanded that she quickly confirm her words. She thought that a person who works for money is obliged to give exactly that answer. That's why the saleswoman said, "You're absolutely right." But to the girl's surprise, another voice rang out nearby, Felix's. He said, "No matter what clothes Miss Irene wears, she will always look sweet and charming, which is why Claudia can't decide." After this, the young man came closer, leaned against the chest of drawers and added, "I got bored and decided to come, but it seems I was a little hasty." Irene didn't understand why Felix was there, but his sister wasn't about to calm down, and said, "Not at all, Felix. You're just in time. Please calm your sister down." He replied, "Okay, Irene, I understand." After that, Felix, leaning over the girl, quietly laughed and began to watch Claudia, who was running around as if she were out of her mind. Finally, Felix approached Claudia with the dress in his hands and asked, "How do you like this dress?" She looked at him skeptically and replied, "It's peach-colored. Among the shades of pink, apricot, or coral would suit our Irene better." Irene was horrified by what was happening. She asked Felix to calm her sister down, but instead, he started a discussion about color with her. The stunned saleswoman watched all this. She didn't know how to answer the young man's question. "Anything suits Irene, right?" The woman smiled nervously and said, "Yes, that's true. Was she ever not beautiful?" Afterwards, Felix remarked, "By the way, the details in the dress you chose are quite exquisite. The hem is decorated with lace reminiscent of cherry blossoms. Whose design is that?" The woman replied, confused, "Mine." She visibly perked up when the young man promised to pay her a bonus. It was as if gold coins were ringing in her eyes. After that, the salesperson added, "Lady Amber comes in different shades, so I think peach would be great too." By this time, Irene was on the verge of tears. She realized that these three were unstoppable. The imperial palace greeted them with majestic severity under the moonlight. A luxuriously decorated carriage entered the palace grounds. A young man slowly emerged from it, holding onto the doorframe. He stopped and extended his hand towards the door, inviting his companion. His pretty sister jumped out of the carriage after him. Then Felix and Claudia turned their heads towards the entrance, as if inviting the third companion to come out. But she was in no hurry. Irene sat inside the carriage and said, "I'm not the main character at all." Her voice came from inside. "If you both continue to behave like this, I will become even more anxious." However, she then offered her hand to the young man when he said, "It's okay, we'll be there, so don't worry." Irene looked at the huge building in front of her and said, "Okay, I'll believe you." Then she added, "Finally, we're at the imperial palace." After this, Irene, accompanied by Felix and Claudia, slowly walked towards the palace. As soon as they approached, whispers and gossip immediately began around about the new guests. To calm her nerves, Irene involuntarily clutched the hem of her dress. Felix, walking alongside her, hastened to reassure her, "Don't listen to them." Then he added that their words were unworthy of Irene's ears. Claudia supported him and said, "These people with ugly souls live on the misfortunes of others." Then Claudia said, "They will be happy when they feel that you are responding to their words, so it is better not to give them food for conversation, because if you start to correspond to them, you will become as disgusting a person as they are." Irene looked at her friend walking next to her and thought, "Haven't I noticed before how wise this young lady is?" Then Irene became sad and said, "It can't be. It's simply impossible for Claudia to become disgusting to me," frowning slightly. Claudia immediately ran up to her, and as usual pulled her cheeks, saying, "Well, good." Irene thought, "Am I really experiencing some kind of déjà vu?" After that, finding herself in her room, Irene immediately plopped down on the huge bed provided to her. She thought Prince Lucas was a fool. After all, they came together, so why were they placed in different palaces? Thinking about this, Irene frowned and decided that perhaps there was some evil intrigue on the part of the prince. Then she picked up the small object and thought that the artifact Felix and Claudia had made out of worry might still be useful to her today. She glanced closely at the dial and remembered their words about it being able to communicate their location. Judging by the readings, they were now together. The girl sat up heavily on the bed, thinking that, although she had arrived only recently, she was already very tired. A moment later, Irene heard a quiet knock on the door of her room. She jumped up and, opening the door slightly, asked, "Who's there?" In front of her stood a young man, sitting casually on the windowsill opposite her room. He looked at her and said, "Hey, sweet young lady," with a strange glint in his eyes. The girl seemed to turn into a wooden post again and replied, "I think you're in the wrong room." She thought, "What the hell is this?" He knocked on the door, sat down, and started posing for some reason. After that, she said, "Well, see you later," and was about to return to her apartment. The young man immediately jumped up from the windowsill and said hastily, "I was not mistaken at all. I really did come to see you." Young lady, my name is Arsa Moore. She replied, I see, and my name is Irene Amber. The young man smiled broadly, and then, as if about to throw himself into her arms, said, I wanted to tell you something. But a moment later, the young man stopped abruptly, as if lost in thought. Then, putting his hand to his mouth, he coughed slightly. He said, Lady Amber, I thought I saw precious stones when I first saw your beautiful eyes. After this, the man knelt before the astonished girl and continued, So I decided to throw propriety to the wind and catch up with you. I figured that if I let Lady Amber go so easily, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. Irene looked at him and thought, Is he crazy? But the man continued, Perhaps you feel embarrassed to hear such words? Kneeling, he declared, But listen, I fell in love with you at first sight. Would you like to meet me? Looking at him, Irene thought, He's probably completely nuts. But suddenly, she felt a familiar feeling. She remembered the way other men looked at her and was horrified to remember their words. Oh my God, she's so impressive. The girl replied, Forgive me, but I believe only in our Lord Odysseus, and I intend to follow the state religion in Zukarizne. The man continued to kneel, holding out his hand to her. But Irene didn't react in any way and said that she wasn't going to talk to a stranger, especially at that time of day. The man's face darkened, and he asked again, puzzled, while Irene thought, What? What's wrong with him? Won't this pass? Suddenly, completely unexpectedly, Irene said, I won't buy it. He looked at her again, puzzled, and asked, What? And the girl replied, I have absolutely no money. I'm a beggar. After this, Irene turned decisively and, heading to her room, said, Sorry, you chose the wrong person. Goodbye. She remembered that this had happened to her often in her previous life in Seoul. But the young man didn't seem ready to give in. He suddenly stood up and blocked the girl's path to her room. When she again said that she had no money, the man began to cry and said, No, I think there was a misunderstanding between us because I am really in love with you. The girl stood there, shifting from foot to foot, and replied, Young man, I am grateful for your confession, but I ask you to forgive me. The man still did not calm down. Lady Amber, I understand that my feelings are a burden for you. After that, he grabbed the girl tightly by the wrist, and she screamed, What the hell? Don't touch me, it makes me uncomfortable. The young man's face changed strangely. He no longer looked like a tear-stained, uncertain youth, but became a serious man and asked, Well, won't you give me at least one chance? Still clutching her wrist tightly, he repeated, If you get to know me better, I'm sure you'll change your mind. The girl screamed, Let go, it hurts. After that, he still did not let go of Irene's hand and said, Please, please, Lady Amber. The girl tried to back away, thinking he was a real madman. She didn't know how to get rid of him, and screamed loudly again, I said, let me go! Since nothing happened, Irene could think of nothing better to do than to kick him with all her might right between the legs. The next moment, there was a loud cry, almost a squeal. She had hit the target right on target. After this, Irene ran down the corridor as fast as she could, trying to get away from this man as quickly as possible. She didn't even notice how she crashed into something soft with all her force. In front of her stood a man in a long, light robe, who seemed to be shaking slightly. The girl began to rise from the floor and said, Sorry. Then she recognized him and said in surprise, Felix? Sitting on the floor, Irene asked, Why are you here? Felix extended his hand to her and replied, I came because I was worried about you, but it looks like it was all for nothing. He helped her up, and to his question, Are you okay? The girl replied, If you mean my fall, then everything is fine. Felix was still holding her hand and noticed that her wrist was red. He smiled softly and asked, Did it hurt? Irene replied, No, don't worry, not really. Then she added, Wait, did you really see everything? She quickly began to explain, Actually, I'm not such a cruel person. At first, I was going to resolve everything with conversation, but that lackey, No, I'm sorry, Sir Moore. Felix, smiling slightly, listened to her and said, I was going to make sure that Rough Hand could never grab anyone again. It's a shame it's all over. You were very lenient with him. Irene was slightly embarrassed and blushed, and then said, Oh, come on. After that, Felix said to her, If I were you, I'd do a pie, and then another pie. The girl thought that she shouldn't say such terrible things with such a charming smile. After that, Felix took her hand and said, By the way, Claudia's just organizing a tea party. Maybe we should go there together? When the girl heard that there would be a grapefruit tart, she literally lost her composure. Felix confirmed, Of course, this dish will be there too, and laughed loudly. Afterwards, Irene and Felix headed to another part of the castle. On the way, he asked, By the way, can I tell Claudia what happened? She quickly replied, Don't tell her. If she finds out, she'll be very upset. The young people didn't even notice someone watching them from around the corner. After that incredible incident, Irene noticed that she seemed to be attacked by a huge number of fans. It was simply unbelievable. She was surrounded by too many men, and it was starting to worry her. Irene decided that no matter how stupid she was, it was impossible not to notice such changes. She concluded that it was all the work of that stubborn bastard named Lucas. She looked closely at the appearance of the men around her, and thought that perhaps the prince had even hired some agency for his purpose. She decided that this was the agency that was now sending her men, who also boasted about their wealth. But Irene was certain that no matter how hard the prince tried, he couldn't surpass the two people closest to her. She couldn't understand how anyone could trade the innately perfect chamberlains for even the man who now stood before her. The man turned to her and said, Lady Amber, why are you acting so unapproachable? How magnificent do you think you are to be so cocky? The girl calmly replied, If you have nothing to brag about, then I can't say that I don't like you. He chuckled. It seems living next to Chamberlain has made you think too highly of yourself, but one should always know one's place. Irene merely smirked in response. My place? Yes, I suppose you're right about that. I did forget it, but brother and sister Chamberlain reminded me well. She smiled broadly, raised her index finger, and continued, It seems that no matter how much they protect you, they still show you your place. They say that I am a very beautiful, sweet, and simply delightful girl. Then she added, Besides, thanks to them, I'm not interested in you at all. The guy frowned. Yes, I see you've forgotten your place, and you're completely nuts. At that moment, quick footsteps were heard nearby. Claudia was approaching them. Coming closer, she laughed loudly and said, I've been looking for you for so long. The young man looked at her in surprise. Lady Chamberlain? He tried to introduce himself. I don't know if you remember me. I'm the second son of the Count, but he didn't have time to finish, because Claudia turned to her friend. Irene, take this, handing her the bouquet. Irene asked in surprise, Flowers? Yes, I picked them especially for you, answered Claudia. Irene was quick to thank them. They're incredibly beautiful, but aren't Frisia's spring flowers? How did you manage to find them at this time of year? The answer made her shudder inwardly. Claudia said calmly, I picked them in the greenhouse of the imperial palace. Irene thought, Am I really allowed to accept them? Seeing the expression on her face, Claudia laughed. What's wrong? His Highness himself gave me permission to pick them. Then she looked closely at Irene and asked, By the way, why are you so red? Oh, it's just a bit hot here, she quickly answered. Ignoring the young man standing next to her, Claudia said, Then let's get back quickly. Then, as if remembering him, she turned and added, Are you still here? I thought you'd already left. Our Irene is very hot. Do you mind if we leave? You've finished our conversation, haven't you? The stunned young man muttered, Ah, no, we're still talking. Irene decided to remain modestly silent. Claudia looked at him intently and said coldly, But if our Irene gets sunstroke because of you, you will definitely take responsibility. The young man's face visibly paled, and Claudia, as if nothing had happened, exclaimed, Oh my God, look how sweaty you are! Take my handkerchief. Then Claudia called Irene to her, and taking her hand said, Don't pay attention to him. Let's go somewhere else. Upon seeing the handkerchief, Irene seemed very concerned. She immediately asked Claudia, Did you embroider that pattern on the handkerchief yourself? She looked at it and noticed a strange pattern. Could it really be a spider? Claudia frowned slightly, as if considering her friend's question. After this, a trembling and surprised Irene asked Claudia again, So, this is an embroidered sun? Claudia started crying. Irene thought, Did I miss again? Finally, Claudia laughed out loud and said, You got it. After that, the girls set off together. On the way, Irene said, Claudia, you only think about me. They continued their conversation. Claudia said, It's so hot today. Maybe we should play in the water. Irene immediately agreed to her proposal. Both girls settled down on the edge of the pool. Then Irene asked, You suggested playing in the water, right? That's what we're going to do now, right? Claudia replied, We're just swimming. Playing in the water should be done at a lake or somewhere else. Irene didn't let up. She said, Unlike the estate, there are a lot of prying eyes here. Until we get home, make do with the bathroom. Hearing this, her companion frowned slightly. Irene looked completely tired and broken. She said, By the way, you've had it tough too. You've done a fantastic job of controlling your temper. Then she added, You see, no matter how much you try to deny it, my dear, it's not just me who likes you. When Irene heard about her admirers, she hastened to explain everything to Claudia. Most likely, all these people were sent to me by His Highness. Claudia asked incredulously, Really? Then, when Irene confirmed this in all seriousness, Claudia said, You're wrong. I didn't think you'd be so popular. I shouldn't have dressed you up so cutely. At the same time, Irene thought, Why would she do that? After all, no one's interested in me. But Claudia didn't let up. She asked, But I'm still the best, aren't I? In response, her friend said, Claudia, that's out of the question. No one in the world can compare to you. After a while, Claudia said, It's time for us to play in the water, but it seems to be still cold. It will take a while. Then Irene asked again, Claudia, perhaps you could fill the bath? The girl was surprised. What? Are you asking me to get water? Is that even possible? Irene immediately said, Actually, I just wanted to see how you manipulate spirits. That's all. When Claudia said it was easy, Irene continued, I've never seen spirits before, so I really want to see it. After this, Claudia cleared her throat slightly and said, If Irene asks me, then I simply have no choice. Everyone knew that the Chamberlain family had a natural-born mage, Felix, but this family also had a possessor of a huge amount of mana, with the ability to control spirits. Claudia, a spirit caster. Thanks to her power, she could communicate with spirits, although she could not make contracts with them. Claudia could control spirits, but she was unable to fully interact with them. Irene was very eager to see how it actually happened, and in the end, Claudia gave in to her request and demonstrated her skill. Irene was simply amazed and started running around the bathroom exclaiming, Wow, amazing! Standing behind her, Claudia said, There's nothing special about it, really. But Irene didn't let up. What are you talking about? You're simply amazing, Claudia replied. What amazing? It wasn't difficult at all. It all happened thanks to a simple request, so the magic only works on low-level spirits. Afterwards, she explained that to use spirits of intermediate and higher levels, a contract must be made. When Irene asked how a contract was made, Claudia replied, "If you send a wish into the spirit world, a spirit can choose you." Irene wanted to know literally everything. She asked, "So why don't you send your wish? You don't hate the idea of becoming a spirit summoner, do you?" A slightly stunned Claudia said, "A wish? Yes. I tried to send it several times, but each time I tried, it ended in failure." She said, "Even though I did everything right when I sent out my wish, something kept getting in the way, and I couldn't do anything about it." Irene thought for a moment and finally came to the conclusion that this was definitely someone's doing. It was all down to a spirit of lies named Nihilus. He waited for Claudia's wish, then prevented them from entering the spirit world. Spirits in that world feed on emotions, thus increasing their power. Therefore, they deliberately create situations in which they can experience the emotions they desire. It was clear that if Claudia signed a contract with Nihilus, everything would end in a certain way for her, and the outcome would be disastrous. As a result, only one thing awaits poor Claudia. She will break down and cease to exist. All these thoughts flashed through Irene's mind like lightning. She remembered that in the original work, a contract had been made, so she asked, "Isn't it strange that the spirits, who obey you so well, interfere with your wishes?" The girls continued to sit by the edge of the pool. Claudia replied, "I thought it was strange too, but I can't see or hear spirits, so I don't know the reason." She continued, "When I first entered the academy, everyone said that I would be the first person in the Empire who could summon the Spirit King." She remembered how those around her had placed great hopes on her, but, as it turned out, it was in vain. They were disappointed. After that, everyone left Claudia alone, and she took it hard. With tears in her eyes, the girl admitted, "After that, I was barely able to finish the academy." A moment later, Irene immediately hugged her friend tightly, trying to support her. Hugging Claudia, Irene said, "Understand, I don't care whether you make a contract with the spirit or not. The main thing is that you're happy. I don't care about anything else." The two girls sat holding hands. Claudia thanked her friend, who responded, "But you see, Claudia, I'm constantly plagued by disturbing thoughts." She immediately asked, "Which ones?" Irene explained that the spirits of the human world definitely love Claudia, but the fact that they are preventing her from reaching the spirit world can only mean one thing. Claudia was shocked and asked cautiously, "Isn't this how the spirits try to protect me from danger? Are the spirits of the spirit world dangerous?" Irene began to explain, "There are exceptions everywhere. Even an angel, symbolizing kindness, can become a monster when angry." After that, she added, "Even among spirits, there are real idiots." Claudia was stunned and asked again, "So there's some kind of idiot spirit assigned to me?" Yawning slightly, Irene said, "The likelihood of that happening is quite high. That's why I'm worried that something might happen to you. What if you get hurt?" A frightened Claudia asked, "What can I do then?" Irene began to explain, as this was exactly the question she'd been waiting for. "As far as you know, Claudia, only low-level spirits inhabit the natural world. That means that spirit is at least above average. In that case, you need to make a contract with at least a high-level spirit, a spirit king, or someone of that level, so that they can't harm you. Then you will be safe, and no one will be able to harm you." After this, Irene lifted her chin proudly. Claudia asked again, "But how? If your hypothesis is correct, as soon as I enter the spirit world, this spirit will target me." Irene replied, "There are high-level spirits in the human world too." When Claudia said she'd never heard of this, Irene explained, "These are independent spirits. They don't belong to any one world. You could say they're outsiders to the spirit world." When the girl asked how Irene knew this, she calmly replied, "There is nothing that I don't know." She continued, "Independent spirits are not limited by anything, so even in the human world, you can make a contract with them." Claudia thought for a moment and asked, "So, I can sign a contract with him too?" Irene laughed and replied, "Of course. Once the country's founding celebrations are over, we'll ask Felix to go in search of such a spirit." She decided that, until then, she would continue to give Claudia happiness, allowing her to be herself. Sometime later, she received a terrible gift. Thanatos, in the language of flowers, meant death. It was a bouquet of Thanatos flowers that she had received from someone, along with the note she now held in her hands. It read, "You rejected the opportunity I gave you. This is your final warning." Irene's entire body shook, terrified by what was written and who the person who sent it was. She was simply speechless, but she had made up her mind. She'd already said it. No matter how hard he tried, she would never leave the Chamberlain family. And even that wouldn't be enough when Felix and Claudia stood before her. Irene thought for a moment. She'd never liked difficulties, but for these two, she was willing to do anything. Loud cheers echoed inside the vast palace. People shouted, "Long live the endless glory of the great empire of Loxistan." Everyone gathered in a huge hall, and a man spoke before them and declared, "I wish everyone a happy celebration of the founding of our empire." The girls in the audience were frankly bored. Irene thought, "Who's been giving this speech for 2 hours now? Hasn't he gotten bored himself?" A moment later, the girl perked up, seeing a monster flying up in front of her. A few seconds later, Irene jumped up from her seat, watching what was happening with delight. She was amazed. Could this really be magic? It looked incredible, and she immediately perked up. Irene turned to her friend and asked, "Claudia, have you seen this performance? Isn't it great?" Her friend seemed to have dozed off and only sleepily rubbed her eyes. When Claudia said, No, I don't think there's anything more boring and useless than the annual ceremony to commemorate the founding of a country, Irene thought. Will I really be like that one day? And frowned slightly. At that moment, Felix, standing nearby, said, Nothing in this world is useless. When you overcome difficulties for what you love, it gains value. As Claudia continued to doze, he added, If you avoid difficulties, even the things you enjoy will eventually become a burden. Then Felix rose from his seat, walked up to the sleeping girl, and quietly asked, Claudia, can you walk? She did not answer. Then Felix carefully picked her up in his arms and said to Irene, I will take her to the palace where we are staying, and then I will return. Irene looked after them and said, Okay, good luck, waving her hand slightly. She started looking around and thought, Okay, I need to get down to business and not waste a second. Suddenly, she found what she was looking for, and her gaze instantly stopped. Right in front of her stood a girl with long red hair, the only daughter of the Daphalazion family. Her name was Erica Daphalazion. The curious Irene had important business with this girl, so she decided to follow her quietly. But suddenly, her gaze caught on a man nearby, and Irene thought, Why is this damn guy here? The girl immediately tried to hide, pretending that she didn't know him at all. But the man noticed movement next to him and immediately turned his head towards Irene. A moment later, a loud shout was heard from the vaults of the room. It was that same man shouting. Irene immediately became sad. After all, she had asked him to pretend he didn't know her. The girl was upset and tried to hide. But this man had no intention of relenting. Her father was going to sell her, so what did he want now, shouting her name? When the man approached her and said, Irene, we need to talk. Come here for a minute, the girl replied. I don't know anyone like you. Why are you acting like this? The father came closer and said, I know that you are angry with me, but isn't it time for you to calm down a little? The girl stepped towards him and asked, Why would I be angry at some stranger? You are a strange person. She noticed that the look in her father's eyes, standing opposite her, had changed. His usual cruelty was evident in it. He grabbed his head and said, This is simply unbearable. Then he added, But why are you acting like this? Talk to your father somewhere quiet. Irene asked coldly, Why are you so interested in something you sold and made someone else's property, Viscount Amber? The man frowned. Does that mean you no longer consider yourself Amber? The girl replied, I really hope so. The father shook his head. Until you marry, this is impossible. The fact that I am your legal and biological father will remain unchanged. Irene realized that he had bullied her for the same reason a year ago, and now it was happening again. She said, If you're talking about the law, I have something to say too. When she reminded him that he hadn't fulfilled his parental responsibilities, the man snapped, Who's been raising you so far? You should be able to reciprocate the favor shown to you. The girl fell silent, hearing whispers around her. It looks like they're arguing. Oh my God, it's a father-daughter quarrel. She quietly asked, What do you want from me? My father replied, I have received a proposal from a very worthy man. They want to marry you off. At that moment, Irene lowered her head and said calmly, I understand. Let's discuss this in a quieter place. This suited him perfectly. He smiled. Good. How lucky I am to have such an obedient daughter. Coming closer, he added, I'm doing this only for you. Irene only bowed her head slightly, but her gaze was directed to the side. There stood a girl with long red hair, Erica de Felison. The father continued, You will live no worse than a princess. This is such a distinguished family that you will be surprised when you hear about it. At this time, Erica, holding a glass, headed for the exit. A few minutes later, Felix and Claudia Chamberlain appeared in the hall. Claudia immediately said indignantly, He's using his power to force his daughter into marriage. Felix gently asked her to calm down, and then asked Irene, Who is the potential spouse? Irene replied, Count Teeb, Claudia exclaimed in horror. But he's 20 years older than Irene. Are there really still such bastards in the world? Irene just laughed. I'm not planning on getting married anyway, so it's okay. I'll just take advantage of the situation. Claudia frowned. Use it? How exactly? At this point, she was already sure that the crown prince was behind this, and, in Irene's opinion, she had become noticeably smarter. Felix said, Sister, don't say such cruel things. Claudia snapped back. Why? What's so cruel? Are you on his side now? Felix smiled mysteriously. Listen, dogs are really cute. Both girls looked at him in bewilderment. He continued to smile, as if he hadn't said anything strange. A veritable hurricane of emotion seemed to be brewing around them, when Claudia suddenly exclaimed loudly, Then it's just trash! Non-recyclable trash! If you burn it, it could become something… After some time, Claudia finally calmed down, and looking at Felix asked, Brother, how can you remain so calm in such a difficult situation? The young man, after thinking, replied, Everyone knows that Count Tib is a noble count from the kingdom of Crutia. The young man then explained that this kingdom of Crutia is located beyond the mainland, so one has to get there by ship. He added that it is not so easy to get there from Loxistan, since you need to swim across a wide and deep sea. When the girls asked what this meant, Felix explained, Off the mainland, extraterritorial law applies, but at sea, I can use magic without fear of detection, and without any punishment. Felix smiled ominously and said, That means if someone's corpse were to drown by accident, no one would even notice. After this, the young man smiled broadly and said, Well, something like that. At this point, Irene thought, Is he really serious about all this? Claudia asked loudly, What about accepting Irene into our family as an adopted daughter? Her brother answered firmly, That won't work. Then Claudia said, Are you suggesting that we just fold our hands and watch as our Irene falls into the hands of the crown prince? A seemingly calm Felix replied, Viscount Amber can be bribed with money, so perhaps we should simply offer Irene's father twice the amount someone else offered him. At this time, Irene, who was listening to their conversation, asked them to stop arguing and said, Calm down and refuse to organize a criminal conspiracy. Felix and Claudia looked at the girl carefully when she said, I have a better idea. I'm going to figure this out myself. After that, she quietly headed out into the street, where at that time a girl with red hair named Erica was already walking between the flower bushes. Irene approached her, and making a slight curtsy, said, Forgive me for having approached you in such an unflattering light yesterday, Lady Deflation. Erica turned her head towards her and replied, Although this is not our first meeting, it seems that this is the first time we have greeted each other, Lady Amber. Irene was simply amazed. She asked the girl, Do you really know me? Erica simply pressed her lips together in response and said nothing. But after that, the lady spoke and said, You are known for being surrounded by love on all sides. Lady Chamberlain even picked flowers for you in the greenhouse of the imperial palace. She added, They were roses. Looking at you, it's clear how much they resemble you. Erica thought for a moment, and then heard the girl's answer, who said, I hear about this often. She said, These flowers are beautiful on the outside, but when you inhale their scent, you only smell a faint trace of grass. The scent may be somewhat unpleasant, but for a flower to be chosen and plucked by someone is the best fate. Irene looked into the girl's face and asked if she thought that perhaps this was the will of the flowers. Her interlocutor replied, I don't know what kind of will they flowers have. It's enough, in my opinion, to simply remain beautiful. The girls stood opposite each other. Erica said, Yesterday, I heard that you apparently received a marriage proposal. After she added that this was excellent, and yet the family would not be responsible for Irene forever. She replied, But if I do not want this, can one then say that my marriage is excellent? Erica turned her back on her and remarked, Listen, just as flowers have no will, so a lady should have no will either. She cannot choose her own destiny. The girl replied, I think it's sad to live my only life, giving up my desires. At first, Erica seemed confused by her answer, but after a while, she smiled slightly. When she asked Irene if she had charmed Lady Chamberlain in this way, the girl looked at her interlocutor in bewilderment and did not answer. Then Lady Erica asked, If you are guided by desire, could you please explain what it is you want? Continuing to follow Erica, Irene said, I will not submit to my father's greed under any circumstances, and will follow according to my own will. In response, she heard, Lady Amber, you have made a worthless choice, and it will only lead to suffering. Shocked by her words, Irene stopped and asked the girl, Do you really think so? She in turn also turned her head back, stopped, and said, What is truly worthless and painful is not to know yourself, and I really think so. Erica heard the following from her interlocutor. I'll become truly unhappy if I deny what I really want to do. The girl seemed struck by these words. After this, Irene continued. She said, If you help me, I will show you what the will of flowers is. Erica waved her fan slightly, then paused briefly. She said, We'll see. She was the only daughter of the Deflation family, one of the main villains, and also the crown prince's fiancé. In the novel, Erica constantly bullied poor Claudia. For example, one time she messed with the saddle, causing her to fall off the horse. One day, she also bribed a maid who pushed Claudia into the river. This girl spread rumors about Irene's current girlfriend in social circles, and much more. She used every possible means to taunt Claudia. Crown Prince Lucas knew all of this perfectly well, but only watched from the sidelines, which is why the main character of the novel became completely dependent on him. However, the prince only dealt with Erica when she decided to kill Claudia. No matter how you look at it, Erica played the same role as another girl. She was very similar to Martine, and also played the role of a villain, characters who were simply used at first and then thrown away. However, now Claudia has abandoned all the main characters and lives without leaving the estate, so there is no chance of her being bullied at all. The result is that Erica only acted this way towards Claudia because her vision was clouded by jealousy due to her love for Lucas. But Irene was sure that she also craved the place of empress. Her goal was the imperial throne and crown. If you think about whether this means that her goal was power, the answer is obvious. In fact, only her family desired this power, and not the girl. In fact, Erica herself was not interested in this. She became a beautiful doll that was used for the sake of family honor. For Erica, who grew up in similar conditions, it was simply unbearable, and one could say that she also suffered greatly in her own way. Irene, smiling, looked into the eyes of her interlocutor and said, If you help me, I promise to show you what the will of the saints is. It seems that these words were enough to awaken some interest in Erica. She looked carefully at the girl standing opposite her and agreed with her. The time had come for the imperial council. The crown prince himself sat at the head of the table, and his closest nobles gathered around him. One of them took the floor and said, Your Highness, I heard that you have promoted the engagement of the ambassador of the kingdom of Crutia, Count Tip, and the daughter of the Deflation family. The prince asked the Duke of Deflation, who had asked the question why he was so interested in it. The man, who had the same red hair as his daughter, said, No matter how small the kingdom of Crutia is, it has been on friendly terms with our empire until now. He said, At the very least, We must choose a daughter from a noble family of appropriate status as a bride. If this engagement is for the purpose of establishing friendly relations, would it not be better to select a lady of outstanding beauty? The prince glanced sideways at the man who had declared, Count Tip will not want a gift that is difficult to administer. The young man's gaze gleamed as someone remarked, Duke de Felashen's words were indeed sound. Sending a noblewoman from the best empire as a wife didn't seem the best option. I don't think His Highness can arbitrarily decide matters related to the aristocracy. The prince's face darkened. He thought, they were raising such pointless talk at their meeting. Yes, if the Duke of de Felashen was involved, then such a thing was possible. But then who had brought the Duke into this? He would very much like to know the answers to these questions. After this, the prince noticed movement behind him. It was another of his confidants, a duke named Benjamin. He, sitting on the sofa, spread his arms out to the sides in confusion and seemed to be asking with his eyes, What do you need? The Duke looked closely at the man who had entered and asked, Duke Lamberg, do you have anything to say about this? The young man replied, Since no one agrees with this decision, I personally intend to choose the beauty that Count Tip will like. The crown prince's face darkened, but he still forced himself to say, If that is your will, there is nothing that can be done. When everyone present at the meeting had left, and only the prince and the Duke remained, the crown prince approached Benjamin and grabbed him by the collar. The young man, surprised, looked at his master's face. He couldn't understand what was happening. Lucas's face looked simply terrifying. He clenched his teeth and stared straight into the Duke's eyes. When he began to justify himself and said, Your Highness, didn't I tell you to think carefully before taking action? The prince exclaimed, Shut up, you've ruined everything. After this, the villain asked His Highness, Where do you get such confidence that I am to blame for everything? The prince looked into the Duke's face and asked, Who else could it have been if not you? Who could have prompted Count de Felashen to such a decision? He said to the Duke, It's your hobby, after all, to interfere with what someone else is working hard on. The young man calmly replied, Thank you, of course, for valuing my abilities so highly. After this, he looked into the prince's face and added, But this case doesn't seem particularly interesting to me. And have you really been working so hard on it? The Duke said, I, like you, thought that she would enter the Chamberlain family as an adopted daughter, but it seems that things are taking a completely different turn. After this, the prince loudly slammed his fist on the table and asked, Why did they even adopt such a parasite? The people in that family are ready to bend over backwards if it concerns Claudia's wishes. Although they cherish their daughter, they're unlikely to adopt anyone else. The Duke began to gossip and said, The Count's foolish behavior has been causing gossip lately. If she asks to marry Lady Amber, he will find a country that allows same-sex marriage to satisfy his daughter Claudia's wishes. Hearing this, Crown Prince Lucas said, What disgusting jokes you make. When the Duke, bending over his master, asked, Do you think there is anything to joke about here? He answered gloomily, The Chamberlain family will lose their authority, and in that case, they will be laughed at for the rest of their lives. Leaning over the prince's ear, his interlocutor whispered, Count Chamberlain values his daughter's happiness so much that he seems willing to tolerate even this. When the prince asked, Is that Irene, or whatever her name is, a witch or what? The Duke replied, That's impossible. She's just an ordinary viscount's daughter. The crown prince thought for a moment and said, If you think about it, Claudia has changed beyond recognition lately, and it's because of that girl. The Duke's eye flashed, and he replied, You must already guess why de Felashen spoke in such a way. The crown prince joined the conversation and said, I think it's probably because of the crown princess's position. Otherwise, it's impossible to imagine why he would need it. Benjamin said, And perhaps you also know that this may be related to Lady de Felashen, who, just like her family, wants to ascend to the imperial throne. As the Duke lit a match from the ring on his finger, Lucas said, Is it really impossible? And his interlocutor asked, Your Highness, do you really think so? Benjamin said, Yes, Duke de Felashen would never have acted if it hadn't concerned his daughter, Erica. Besides, nothing is impossible. You have to consider all the possibilities. Lucas sighed darkly and said, I think sometimes hostility befalls those with such innate talents. He then asked, Isn't there a talent for groveling before others? To which His Highness received a detailed reply. The magnanimity with which you accept defeat, despair, and faith are outstanding talents. A single word that touches the soul and makes the heart beat faster can become a call to action. When the Duke said, It is easy to control people by stimulating their feelings, the Crown Prince replied, This is very similar to what you do. The Duke told the Prince, If there's a difference between Lady Amber and me, it's all in her sincerity. It's what they call a rough gem. When the Prince told his interlocutor that he was seriously upset, he replied, Of course, because I just found a rough stone. Seeing it, I want to shape it however I want, and then break it before it falls into the wrong hands. Then he burst out laughing. The prince was simply irritated by his words, and said again, What tastes you have, of course. When the Duke said, Please respect my tastes as I respect yours, the prince asked, Who are you to ask me, the crown prince, for respect? He heard the answer, Well, I know you don't have the opportunity to enjoy your hobbies. You need to get rid of all irritants. After a while, the Duke smiled mysteriously and said, You know, Your Highness, I have an interesting plan. Would you like to hear it? Then he asked, Have you given up on Claudia? His Highness replied, No, I haven't given up, because now we have a common goal in Lady Amber. He then asked, And what is this plan of yours? He began to explain, I'm going to touch a person's feelings. which would be shattered by just one light touch. As it was already getting dark, the lights had already been turned on inside Count Chamberlain's palace. Claudia walked down the corridor. Walking next to her, Irene said, "Please forgive me for not warning you in advance." Claudia still refused to calm down and said, "I couldn't imagine you two knew each other. From now on, Irene, please tell me first. I'm nervous." The girl replied, "Okay." But for a moment, Claudia seemed to lose the thread of the conversation and suddenly asked her interlocutor, "Irene, tell me, are you closer with her, with Erica, than with me?" Irene thought that she seemed to be starting to get jealous, and she hastened to reassure her interlocutor. Smiling broadly, she exclaimed, "Hey, that's simply impossible, because you are truly my person." At the same time, another member of the family moved closer to Irene and suddenly asked her again, "And what do you say about me?" Irene decided that she had to answer right away, and smiling broadly and laughing, she exclaimed, "Of course, Felix is my man too." Count Chamberlain, walking ahead of them, overheard all their conversation. He heard, "Irene, kiss me." "Kiss what? Irene's lips look so sweet right now." At this point, the old man thought, "Well, they're just like children. They even came up with nicknames for themselves." But still, he was pleased with his children's mood. At the same time, they seemed to be having fun and did not even notice the presence of another person. When the Duke said that they should go faster, everyone laughed joyfully, and Irene laughed the loudest of all. At that moment, as if out of nowhere, a girl with red hair appeared and, just as unexpectedly for everyone, said, "Lady Amber, I would like to talk to you." Irene was simply amazed when she said, "Tell me, don't you want to live with me?" Claudia's face immediately changed strangely. She felt as if she suddenly had a real rival. Irene was ready to scream loudly, but only through sheer force of will was she able to restrain herself. But at the same time, Claudia had absolutely no intention of doing this. She screamed loudly, "Irene doesn't want this at all!" Stopping in front of the girls, Erica said, "It's a pity. I would like to keep her next to me and hear more about the will of flowers." She said, "If a flower has value, it is not beautiful enough." Standing behind Claudia, Irene answered this question. She said, "It's okay if the flower isn't beautiful." Hearing this, Erica laughed loudly. "Ah, as expected, you fell into my trap." Irene was stunned. Did Erica really just smile at her? It was incredible. After this, Lady Deflation said, "Listen, Irene, if that's the case, can't I just call you by your first name?" Claudia answered for Irene, her eyes sparkling. "Actually, that's not right. Why are you talking about something only the two of you know, and then calling her by her first name so casually?" Irene was already prepared for a real brawl to break out. She wanted to stop everything and avoid this strange situation. Wasn't this a crazy scenario? Were the villain bullies the main character to get her? But eventually, things calmed down, and Erica asked, "Irene lives at the Chamberlain estate, right? Can I come over and have some fun with her sometimes?" Claudia immediately hugged her friend and said, "Don't come. You'll be thrown out anyway. I'm the mistress of the house, and I won't allow that." After this, Erica said, "Then perhaps I can invite her to my estate?" Still shouting, "Absolutely not. Do you think I'll let her go?" Claudia began to hug Irene tightly. Finally, Irene felt like she couldn't breathe. Erica screamed, "Even if you don't allow it, there are still plenty of other ways to bring her." She desperately wanted to scream, "Stop!" but she couldn't. After some time, Irene found herself in a completely different place, where a small but very cozy carousel was slowly spinning. The girl lay unconscious on one of the horses, circling in a circle, without opening her eyes. She finally opened her eyes and thought that if that was the case, then nothing special had happened after that, except that she seemed to have fainted from lack of air in Claudia's arms. Irene became wary and began to look around, deciding to find out if anything else had happened other than what she knew. She noticed the maids looking at her and wondered why they always looked at her like that lately. It was rather strange. Then she seemed to understand. These girls had been feeding her, putting her to bed, dressing her, and entertaining her for a long time, so they seemed to be attached to her. As soon as she waved her hand at them, she wondered why these maids looked so happy, as if they weren't tired of all this yet. At some point, she suddenly thought that everything looked as if she had become a pet of the Chamberlain estate, looked after by everyone around her. Irene thought about it and came to the conclusion that there was no difference at all between her and some small dog. The girl was brought out of her thoughts by Felix, who suddenly appeared, as if from nowhere, and said to Irene, "I have come." The girl turned to him and greeted him strangely. She said, "Welcome, master." When the young man heard this, he was literally taken aback, and Irene asked, "By the way, why did you come in so quickly? You didn't even take off your robe." The young man didn't know what to say. After this, he nevertheless informed Irene Amber that Duke Amber had recently contacted him and asked him for a personal meeting with Irene. The girl was surprised and puzzled. She asked, "The Duke? Me?" She was even a little scared. Felix explained that he hadn't made up his mind. He said, "I refused the Duke of Lemberg, but then I thought it would be better to tell you first, and then you should decide what to do." The young man said, "I heard from Claudia that the Duke of Lemberg rules the city of primordial chaos, Carlisle. In my opinion, he's not a very good man. One might even say he's not good at all." Felix continued, "As far as I know, you have no common ground, but perhaps you have met regarding your family debt." Irene thought for a moment and replied, "No, that wasn't the case. However, he definitely has some ulterior motive. He was looking at me intently at the reception, too." Felix said, Yes, it does look very suspicious. Irene turned her head towards him and said, What if I meet him just once? Whether it was a statement or a question, Felix said, Everything will be fine. Irene said, We're at a dead end anyway, and in that case, there's nothing left. Felix said, Then I'm ready to go to him with you. Irene started to get off the carousel and said, Okay, let's think about all this in great detail then. A moment later, Irene seemed to be very happy about something and cried out joyfully. At this time, Felix said that he heard from Claudia that Irene once hugged her. The young man looked seriously into the girl's face and said, You hugged my sister Claudia several times, but why don't you do it with me? The young man smiled at Irene and said, Hug me. Irene was simply stunned by his proposal. She couldn't understand what had suddenly happened in her chest. Her heart began to pound desperately. A moment later, completely against all rules, she threw herself into the young man's arms. Their faces were right next to each other. Felix said, I got it. The young man lifted his companion into his arms and stood there with her. He said, Irene, even if someone offers you a treat, you mustn't follow them. Irene suddenly became sad and said, you looked at me so strangely. For some reason I gave in. Felix smiled widely again, then laughed and said, Ah, looks like you noticed. Still standing with the girl in their arms, they continued talking. Irene asked, What is this? Felix replied, Nothing. The young man's next words took Irene completely by surprise. Felix asked, What about a kiss? Irene's face suddenly turned red. She blinked rapidly, and looking at the young man's face in surprise, asked, What? Then the girl began to break free from the young man's arms and said to him, If you, Felix, are going to continue to mock me, then let me go quickly. That's enough. A young man and a woman were moving along a dark corridor, talking. He said, I'm late in speaking, but the likelihood that the Duke of Lemberg orchestrated the assassination attempt and poisoning is quite high. She replied, Nothing strange, that's what I thought. He said, The Duke has remarkable intuition, so when everyone around him thought Claudia's words were a joke and laughed, he realized she was sincere. He probably wanted to deal with you quickly and accurately before it was too late. They stopped before the doors, and Felix said, To thaw sprouts before they grow, or to subdue them, is quite in the manner of a duke, the girl replied. In short, I must meet face to face with the man who tried to kill me. After that, Irene took hold of the door handle and said, Well, let's go. Felix said, Yes, perhaps. A man stood inside the room smoking a cigarette. He didn't even turn his head as his two guests entered. It was the Duke of Lemberg, who immediately turned his head in their direction and asked, Have you arrived already? Are you earlier than I expected? The entire room seemed to be covered in some strange substance. It looked very much like smoke. As soon as Irene entered the room, she thought, What is this strange smoke in the room? And began to cough heavily. A moment later, she noticed someone's hand in front of her and suddenly felt a breath of fresh air. Then Felix said, Your Grace. The young man turned to the owner of the house and said, I beg you to stop there. Irene looked at him in amazement and thought, Did Felix really just use magic? At the same time, the Duke of Lemberg put a match to the ring on his finger, and it suddenly burst into flames. With a lit match, he said, What should I do now? I've already lit the fire, and besides, there's nowhere to put it out. The eyes of Felix, who was standing next to the girl, suddenly sparkled strangely, but he frowned and remained silent. After this, the man standing next to Irene began to make some strange movements with his hand. A moment later, something incredible happened before their eyes, and Duke Lemberg and Irene witnessed Felix's magic in action. It was stunning. Then the young man asked, Perhaps this is enough? The Duke of Lemberg smiled and said, How grumpy you are! However, the world is full of effective medicinal herbs, so be careful. Then the master of the house said, Then perhaps we should sit down and talk? The girl replied, I heard you wanted to see me. I would like to know for what purpose. Nothing special. After this, the Duke of Lemberg smiled broadly, spread his arms out to the sides, and said, Lady Amber, I called you so that we could get along well. When the girl said, Perhaps you don't know what it means to get along well, the villain, still smiling, said, I know that very well. Irene coughed again and said, If you are sincere, please remove this strange aroma. The Duke looked at her strangely and said, Really? Other ladies usually like this scent. Lowering her head, Lady Amber said, You may appear beautiful at first glance, but you are not. The girl raised her head and added, But your mouth smells like shit. The Duke and his guests sat down at the table, and suddenly, there was a strange silent pause. Irene remained silent, and next to her, Felix seemed to be slightly trembling with his body. When the pause dragged on, Duke Lemberg suddenly laughed and said, What ignorant things you say. If you intend to try to offend me, it's in vain. He looked at the girl with his sparkling eyes and added, You don't have to be careful at all. I'm not going to kill you. Hearing these words, the girl literally froze. Then the Duke asked, Tell me, what should I do to please you, lady? Irene replied, Honestly, I don't even know if that's necessary. The Duke of Lemberg laughed again and said, There's no need to be embarrassed. He suddenly stopped laughing when Irene said, We need something like a 10-meter warning. If you could sit somewhere over there, I'd be very grateful. The girl suddenly felt for a moment that the young Duke's gaze became even more sinister and cold. At the same time, Felix, who was sitting next to her, quietly laughed and said, So that's how it is. Lemberg looked closely at his guest and said, Please forgive me if I've caused you any inconvenience, but I was trying to take care of the lady in my own way. The girl asked in response, What kind of care is that? Posthumous, perhaps? The Duke said to the surprised girl. It's just that even a lady should get used to this smell, she asked in shock. What do you mean? When the Duke replied, Who knows? Irene again seemed to freeze and mentally said, Behave yourself, you vile bastard. Irene said, Look, since you don't seem to have any intention of talking, I'll tell you first the purpose of my visit. The girl stood up from her seat and said loudly, You have to give up and stop clinging to Claudia. The Duke was surprised by her words. Confess confidently, after which you'll be confidently rejected. Perhaps then we'll meet again. Now it was Limburg's turn to say, I see. The owner of the house smirked slightly and thought, I don't need your advice at all, you nasty girl. Irene began to tremble and thought, Even if you don't need it, you should listen to this, you idiot. But out loud she said, Believe me, it will be much better for everyone. The Duke of Limburg replied, Yes, that is a pretty good proposal, but I don't like it at all. In response, his guest said, I didn't come here because I like it either. I'm here to express my opinion and give you another chance. When the Duke asked what that chance was, the girl replied, The chance of not meeting the worst possible end with Claudia. And he said, It seems my definition of worst and yours are somewhat different. The worst thing for you is that I won't be able to win Claudia's heart. I guess so. Well, yes. The Duke replied, Of course, winning her heart would be nice, but I've decided not to wish for much. I just hope nothing worse happens. When the Duke of Limburg was asked what the worst meant to him, he replied, It means losing Claudia forever. After this, the girl asked, Do you really want to take her body? The Duke of Limburg, smiling broadly, replied, You understand perfectly well. If I have Claudia's body, then her soul will one day follow. Felix, it seems, couldn't bear all this talk and spoke up loudly. Duke, you're making statements that simply can't be ignored, as if nothing had happened. After that, he said sternly, If someone is going to take possession of someone against her will, I will not sit idly by, no matter who my opponent is in this case. Felix rose from his seat and declared, If you, Duke, have nothing more to say, then we will take our leave. The Duke of Limburg, still in his chair, said, Is everything really that unpleasant for you? Felix was simply irritated and angry. He said, What kind of questions are you asking? Don't call us again for something like this. Still sitting imperturbably in his chair, the Duke replied, You know, I don't remember ever inviting you here. Felix extended his hand, still sitting on Irene's couch, and said, I also wish you wouldn't call Irene anymore. Irene, let's go. The girl replied, Oh, yes. After that, she extended her hand toward the young man. He said, You weren't particularly noticeable, so even if I had the chance, I wouldn't have guessed. The Duke of Limburg said to them, I was sincere when I said that I wanted to become closer to the young lady, but unfortunately, I will have to leave a man like you. The girl looked in his direction and, not understanding, asked, What do you mean, someone like me? Grinning a predatory grin, Duke Limburg said, You are a precious stone that will radiate a different color depending on how it is cut. It would be interesting to find you even a little sooner. Still sitting in his chair, the villain said, While I enjoy gambling in my own way, I don't get involved in things I have no chance of winning. Even knowing it wouldn't work out, I still called you because of my stubbornness and curiosity. He continued to say, My warning and last invitation are only the last chance for the lady. It is very surprising that I did not know about your existence all this time. He, sitting in a chair, looked at his guests and said, I don't remember ordinary things that have no value, but it is very difficult to forget what I have already seen once. Irene was struck by his words. Lady, didn't you look at me with a sad look before when I lit a cigarette? The Duke of Limburg continued, You know, you've changed a lot in the last few years. It seems very strange. He laughed loudly and said, Lady Amber, it's as if you've become a completely different person. It's very confusing. After this, the master of the house scratched his chin and said, turning to the girl, Or, it seems quite likely to me, your taste has simply changed lately. Irene looked at the owner of the house with apprehension and said, You are mistaken. Then Duke Limburg said, And I thought that my eyes could see hidden desires, but now I can see nothing in your eyes except disgust and anger. Irene literally shuddered when the Duke of Limburg said he wanted to tear her eyes out. She couldn't utter a single word in response. A moment later, something strange happened. A bolt of greenish lightning seemed to flash next to the Duke of Limburg. But the Duke didn't even flinch. He wasn't frightened, merely glanced slightly to the side, where the sofa's upholstery had literally ripped apart next to him. Felix said loudly, Your Grace, you must answer for all your actions, and even your words someday. At this point, the agitated man looked frightening and very unusual. He was now using magic and loudly said, I just told you that we are leaving your house and returning to ours. Looking at the sofa, the owner of the house said casually, It seems that my sofa has become quite worn out lately. Irene, sitting on the sofa, literally shuddered when the Duke of Limburg turned to her and said, Lady Irene, she said in fear. What? Felix remained silent as Limburg said, Look at this young man. Those are the eyes of a hypocrite who hides his deepest desires. In reality, he's just as much of a monster as I am. People should do as they please, right? When the Duke said he had lived like this his entire life, Irene replied, I have secret desires. Are there people anywhere who don't? Irene heard the Duke say, I've heard about your secret desires before. You adore money. It's nice to see a man honest in his desires. Leaning over the girl, the master of the house stood up and said, Actually, no matter how wealthy the Chamberlains are, they're not as rich as I am. Look at me, not at how much you like me. Limburg said, Perhaps your first motive was indeed money, but it's still worth taking a closer look at me and considering whether I am of interest to you. Felix remained silent when the owner of the house said, even if the chamberlains, under whose care you are, ever go bankrupt, I will still have the money until the very end. When Lemberg told the girl that she would regret it in that case, she smiled at him and said, that's not true at all. I won't be upset at all. After these words of hers, the Duke of Lemberg fell silent, and for a long time could not utter a single word. But then the young man took his head in his hand and said, I understand. Only with my own hands will I tear off the shell from the nobility of this hypocrite. Irene jumped up from her seat and stood in front of the Duke of Lemberg and said, try it. The girl shouted loudly, I am determined to accept anything. I'm not afraid of any of your threats, and am ready to resist. After this, the conversation ended, and Irene, accompanied by Felix, went out into the street and slowly walked towards Chamberlain's house. She noticed that Felix looked strange and, turning her head towards him, asked if he was okay. The young man, upon hearing his name, immediately, as usual, smiled broadly at her and answered, yes. The girl suddenly felt as if someone was about to burn her eyes out. It was quite a painful sensation. She even turned away and asked, aren't you angry? Felix put his hand on her shoulder and said, Irene, not at all. You've done a great job. From now on, do business exactly as you did today. When the young man placed his hand on her head, the girl asked, but shouldn't you have weighed the pros and cons and come to at least some kind of compromise with the Duke? Felix replied, no, it's better to become a demon than to compromise with someone like the Duke. Principles are far more important than momentary peace and security. A couple of days later, Irene noticed a procession of people carrying boxes and bags heading her way. Chamberlain's brother and sister were leading the procession. This even startled the girl a little. Seeing these people, Irene was literally horrified and cried out loudly, what is this? She didn't understand what was happening. The pandemonium seemed ready to engulf her too. After a while, everyone said, take her in, and literally buried the girl under boxes and bags. She couldn't move a single part of her body. Irene raised her head and asked, what does this all mean? What is this? Even the words came with great difficulty. Then a huge cake appeared in front of her eyes, and everyone joyfully and excitedly shouted, happy birthday! Irene, confused, looked at them and repeated, birthday? They answered, yes. After this, the girl smiled broadly at everyone, and first thanked them joyfully. She was overwhelmed with joy and a strange, ever-expanding sense of celebration. Claudia cried out with equal joy, saying, Irene, you are so sweet! She was just as happy as the birthday girl herself. The girl immediately began to talk a lot. These are the shoes that I thought would suit Irene, and also this hat, and the set consisting of an evening dress and a handbag too. Claudia didn't stop talking. She said, as soon as I saw it, I immediately ordered it for Irene. We also decided to hire a personal designer for our Irene. When Irene took the dress in her hands, the girl immediately asked, do you like it? It seemed to Irene that Claudia was even more pleased with all these gifts than she was. Irene replied, of course, I like all of this very much. And she truly did. She wasn't lying to her friend at all. But then the girl's gaze fell on the price tag on one of the dresses, and she was literally frozen with horror. It was beyond her comprehension. She barely heard Claudia say, for this occasion, I wanted to create my own brand for Irene. The ill-fated price tag was still in her mind's eye. When Claudia told me I'd even come up with a name for the brand, and it sounded like Renee, Irene begged, please refrain from doing that. It was obvious she'd simply dropped the first letter of her name. It was quite awkward. Irene said, there are already enough birthday presents. Look at this instead. But her friend suddenly burst into tears. What? Why? Irene unfolded a map in front of her, labeled Comely. She asked again, what's Comely? This is the first time I've seen this area. Irene replied, it's an island in the south of the empire. She then added that all the places marked on the map were suspected of harboring independent spirits, and asked, haven't you heard of this island? Felix said, I've only heard the general outline. Thousands of years ago, when the underworld opened up, this island was used as a passageway, and it was overflowing with evil spirits. Claudia added, I've heard that laws don't apply there. It's a special region, where other countries can't even interfere. The three of them sat in front of the map Irene had brought, and she said, that's true, but they say that no one comes to Comely Island now. Claudia was surprised. Why doesn't he come? Irene explained, if people lived there, traders would come there to supply materials and transport goods, but no one moves in or out. The land there is depleted, so self-sufficiency is impossible. Irene felt like a true professor. When asked if all the people on the island had died, she replied, Kamali Island is a special area of the Panela Trading Group. However, at some point, the trading group banned all outsiders from entering. But that's not— Claudia seemed moved by her words. She said, so, it seems like someone might live there. Whether that was a good idea remains to be seen. Irene exclaimed loudly and excitedly, there's 100% chance that there is someone on this earth, and it could be an independent spirit. She pointed out on the map the place where she believed this independent spirit might reside. She had almost no doubt about it. They continued to sit over the map the girl had brought and study it in great detail. Irene said, judging by the image that emerges, the spirit must be unusual. The difficulty is how to reach the island, where no one else can go. The problem was quite insoluble. At that moment, both brother and sister simultaneously asked, so what's the problem then, if this island could just be bought? Irene heard this and immediately smiled happily. It seemed the family she found herself in had no problems at all. At this point, Irene immediately laughed too and said, "That's the best and surest way. But wait, if you're talking about rest, what about the spirit?" Claudia continued to have fun. She joyfully cried out, "We'll deal with the spirit somehow as we go." Irene couldn't believe it. Was this island really going to be hers, with a gift to boot? After that, they sat down at the map again, and Irene said, "Okay, it's a long way to Kamali Island. I wonder how far you can get with the help of magic." She was surprised by the young man's answer. If we want to hide the fact that we are heading to that island, it would be better not to use magic. She immediately asked again, "Why?" Felix replied, "All magic used by the Ministry of Magic's wizards is recorded, so it cannot go unnoticed. This is all done to prevent the abuse of magic. The Ministry of Magic trains gifted children intensively, so everyone there is exceptionally good. They even implant artifacts containing detection magic and air current magic into their hands." When Irene asked him again, "Wait, what do you mean by implanted?" Felix explained, "It's necessary so that we can understand what kind of magic is being used by a particular mage." "What does air current magic mean?" Irene asked. The man replied, "So as not to require detonation if necessary, this magic acts just like explosives." Irene was simply astonished. She asked, "And they implant this in their hands?" Felix replied, "Mages can't use their magic without hands, so they're controlled this way." He continued, "Besides, even if we use a simple teleport, the coordinates will be recorded, and the information will reach His Majesty, which would be completely inopportune." Meanwhile, Claudia, sitting next to them, seemed absent and not participating in the conversation. Felix said, "But there's still no need to worry. Even if there are recordings left, there seems to be a trick we can use." He showed them how to do it. After he snapped his fingers, the statue next to them literally split in half, and its upper half fell with a crash onto the lawn. Seeing this, Irene trembled and exclaimed in horror. His skills literally stunned the impressed girl. She then, shaking, demonstrated the purpose of implanting artifacts. Felix, "But not everyone is capable of something like that. Not many people possess such skills," Felix said. Both girls looked at the young man, and one of them asked, "So, only Felix can do this?" Claudia took her hand and said, "I need to be afraid. I will protect you." But it seemed Irene wasn't about to be afraid. She asked Felix if there was any way to remove these artifacts. The young man first scratched his chin thoughtfully, and then, smiling, said, "There is such a way." Claudia was walking along, holding a delicious dessert in her hand. At that moment, her companion asked, "Could you tell me how you communicate with men?" To my surprise, Irene replied that she simply talked to them. When asked if she had a special way of communicating with men, she replied that she needed to think about it. Sitting by the pool, where Irene was currently splashing, they began to talk. Irene, who was in the water, asked, "How do you usually start a conversation with the opposite sex?" Claudia replied, "It just sort of happens." Then she paused and said, "But despite everything, you're still casual with my brother, aren't you?" It seemed that something began to dawn on Claudia, and she, horrified by her own thought, jumped up and exclaimed loudly, "Irene, please answer. Is it really true that you have found someone you like?" Irene answered, "No, it's just that he seems like a good person to me." But Claudia was horrified. She repeated, "Seemed good? Good? That can't be right." She couldn't believe she had any rival. At this point, both girls experienced another shock when someone approached them and asked, "Who is this? Who is this claiming our Irene?" It was the most inopportune moment. Felix was walking straight toward both girls. He said, "It upsets me to address Irene like that." Then he turned to his sister and said, "Mother is calling you." Claudia frowned and looked angrily at her brother, who had just arrived. Then she leaned over her friend and said, "We'll discuss all this again soon." "We definitely will." Irene smiled and said, "Yes, okay." After this, the girl ran quickly towards the palace, where her mother was already waiting for her. Irene smiled at the young man and asked, "Felix, are you back?" He replied, "Yes, I'm back." And then she suddenly remembered and said, "Ah, right, about the Pinello Trading Group." These people held a whole demonstration, demanding that the island be transferred to their ownership. In the end, Irene immediately grabbed the piece of paper, and Felix said, "It was all too easy. It seems their goal was money from the very beginning." Irene was ready to grab her head, because according to the young man, it was so difficult to create a fake trading group and hire people to avoid the eyes of the imperial family. She thought, when the girl asked Felix why they had created Getyu if they knew that everything would turn out this way, he explained that Getyu's goal was not only to buy Kamali Island. After this, Irene laughed loudly and exclaimed, "Well, yes, of course." Then Felix began to help the girl out of the pool, giving her his hand and asked, "So who is this person anyway?" She asked again, "Who? What person?" Irene let go of his hand and looked him in the face, her gaze fixed on his. She had no desire to deceive the young man who treated her so well. When Felix asked again, "The second prince?" the girl said, "Wait," and suddenly fell silent, still looking into his face. At some point, their faces came closer, and the young man quietly asked, "Irene, what do you mean by wanting to get closer to the second prince?" His face changed. He lost his former lightheartedness and seemed to darken. It seemed he was uncomfortable with the very idea that the girl could be interested in someone else. Realizing she'd made a mistake, Irene quickly justified herself. I just wanted to win him over to our side. She thought her answer would satisfy the young man. Hearing this, Felix smiled and, seemingly satisfied with her answer, said, I see. His smile grew wider and wider. Afterwards, he stroked Irene's head and added, I won't stop you, but it's dangerous. You shouldn't be so reckless. She replied, Okay. Then Felix said, Oh, right. Could you spare me a little time after you finish swimming? Irene exclaimed cheerfully, Of course, with pleasure. At the same time, she thought, I wonder what he wants. The girl was intrigued by the young man's proposal as never before. Some time later, she was already sitting with Felix in the Chamberlain family's vast library, next to its head. This was the surprise she had been promised. She quietly whispered in his ear, Explain what's going on here? Everything turned out to be a complete surprise for the girl. In response, Felix merely chuckled softly, and, covering his mouth with his hand so his father wouldn't hear, said, I thought you had a plan. That was true, but she couldn't have known that the old count needed to be let in on it. Then he added, After this, the man that Irene replied, Won't it hurt her even more that we're keeping it from her? She felt that her remark had some merit. The count that Felix, he turned to Irene and asked, Can you tell me everything? She replied, Yes, of course. After this, Lord Chamberlain, he then, Irene noticed that his words had changed from His Highness to Crown Prince. She asked, When exactly did his attitude toward Claudia change? The count replied, Most likely after the country's founding celebrations. After that, Irene quietly laughed. She seemed to be beginning to understand where this was all heading. She thought that after this, the man said, And I'll add one more thing. The demonic bow-shaped relic I saw in the prophecy is the most powerful and dangerous thing in the world. It is currently kept in the great temple. The name of the demon who sealed his power within this relic was terrifying enough to utter even now. His name was Laraj. After these words, the young man thought for a moment and asked his father if he knew what kind of demon it was. For a moment the young man was silent, as if he knew the answer himself, but did not dare to voice it. Laraj is a demon of battle and victory. He is one of the most powerful demons to ever exist, the count continued. However, Felix only smiled slightly and said, Everything will be fine. However, of everyone present in the library at that moment, it seemed he was the only one who believed this. These words only angered the old Count Chamberlain. He asked sharply, All right, are you saying you're willing to sacrifice yourself? The man jumped up from his seat when his son replied, A sacrifice? I think I can handle it. The count shouted, Don't talk such nonsense. That means you're going to accept the demon's power. Are you out of your mind? Felix continued to sit calmly on the sofa by the table. He replied, Unfortunately, there's no other option. The count cried out, No! Even if the demon doesn't consume you, if you're caught, you'll face the holy judgment. It doesn't matter whether you fall victim to the demon or not. You'll be declared a traitor and a devil worshipper. He continued to shout over Felix's head, Not just you, but our entire family will be in danger. We must find another way. The young man calmly replied, No, we cannot allow it to become known that any of us have received the prophecy. Old Count Chamberlain was in utter despair. Turning his back on them, he asked, Then what should we do? Felix said, What these three don't know is that I've been developing a resistance to magic lately. It might help. I've made some progress in magic lately, but that remains a closely guarded secret. When his father asked, So what? The young man confidently replied, I'm ready to pass this test and try to master this power. Shortly after this conversation, Irene knocked on the door. After receiving permission, she carefully opened it and peered inside. Countess Chamberlain was sitting at the table with her daughter. The woman exclaimed, Oh my God, Irene! The girl smiled and said, Hello, Ms. Olivia. May I ask if you had a good day? It was Olivia Chamberlain, the Earl's wife, who, due to frequent illness, rarely left her room. Even in the novel, she was mentioned only as the ailing mother and barely appeared in the plot. The woman smiled softly and said, I didn't see you today, so it was quite a sad day. When the girl heard her friendly words, she shuddered with joy and exclaimed, Oh, really? Claudia also exclaimed her name, screaming with joy. The woman said, Now I've seen you, and the day has truly become a good one. Then Claudia asked if everything was okay, and also inquired if her brother was okay. She seemed worried about him, as her friend had come herself. Irene replied, Well, she didn't want to upset either the mother or daughter sitting across from her, but she had no choice but to confess everything. When the girl said, Let's just say Felix is getting it right now, the woman looked at her questioningly and asked, What? Claudia looked worried. She said, But father has never raised a hand to us in his life. The girl's mother said, That bastard, how dare he? She seemed very upset. Then the upset gave way to outright anger. Afterwards, Olivia jumped up from her chair and shouted loudly, I'll show him! The girls were taken aback by the sickly woman's determination. Irene smiled and asked, Well, please don't be too strict. She wanted to avoid any kind of investigation or scandal. The night was very moonlit and clear. The entire sky was covered with stars. The wind dispersed the last few clouds. Irene was sitting in the same library next to Felix, and looking at him, said, God, your beautiful face. It was even painful for her to look at the young man. His cheek turned slightly blue, and the girl asked Felix, Tell me, why did you have to tell all this to your father? He remained silent. When the young man smiled slightly, Irene indignantly asked, Tell me, what's funny about this? When the girl touched Felix's cheek with her hand, he yelped and then asked, Are you mad at me? Irene exclaimed loudly. Of course I'm angry. How can you say that? After this, the girl looked at him sadly and asked, How can you say that you are not afraid, even in the face of death? Irene's lips twisted. She felt like she was about to burst into tears. She couldn't even imagine what the young man would have to endure. Then she bowed her head, turned away from him, and, so that he would not see her tears, said, How annoying! As usual, Felix smiled at her, laughed, and said, Sorry, but Irene, listen. I didn't say that I was going to die. When the girl cautiously asked, What? The young man replied, Listen, you can consider me dead. This statement further perplexed the upset girl. After that, he began to explain. To be precise, I put it exactly like this. You can consider me dead, but that does not mean that I will die. Irene shouted loudly in his face, But it's the same thing! She couldn't understand what exactly he meant. Felix sat there as if nothing had happened, still smiling. He asked, Isn't this different? And laughed loudly again. He was stunned by Irene's words. Listen, how can I consider you dead as you ask? It's simply unbearable. The young man listened to his interlocutor declare, You will lose the status, reputation, and fame you've achieved. This means that, even without doing anything wrong, you will live your entire life as a corpse, constantly hiding and become a living ghost. Felix laughed again and said, Yeah, something like that. When the girl asked, Can I hit you again? He smiled and said, You can, if it makes you feel better. Then Felix looked into his interlocutor's face and said, Listen, you don't have to worry too much. My status, reputation, and fame have no value to me because they're different for everyone. I don't consider this a sacrifice. Then he stroked the girl's head and said, I don't put any effort into anything that doesn't bring me value. I'm more rational and selfish than it seems from the outside. Irene was stunned by his confession. She asked, Then explain what value you're pursuing. What are you doing all this for? Felix smiled at her and asked, Listen, don't you know this? With your insight, you should have figured it all out long ago. Propping her chin on her hand, Irene said, Felix, you're right, but I still think we need to find another way. The young man asked, Which one? The girl thought for a moment and said, What about attacking them first? Killing these three before they can do anything? Felix said, That's impossible. She smiled and said, Yes, I know it's impossible. You shouldn't make that face, but I still wanted to suggest it. After that, the girl opened the case and said, Let me apply the medicine to you instead. I think a little medical attention wouldn't hurt. She smeared some cream on her finger and reached for Felix. Then she said, Wait a minute, you can probably heal yourself, right? Felix chuckled and replied, I thought that this would help my father recover faster. So I decided to tell him everything, and his beatings were just a side effect. After this, Irene stopped the movement of her hand and said, Well, since you were prepared to be beaten, then you can treat yourself. But he still pressed his head closer to Irene's head and asked, Couldn't you still treat me? She was discouraged by his behavior. Felix smiled and said, Oh, your mouth is like a triangle again. Tell me, why are you nervous? Irene was ready to burst into tears again. She felt so sorry for the young man. Her heart began to beat faster and harder in her chest, and she said, Be quiet. After this, she finally agreed to treat the young man and poked the cream into his bruised cheek, causing Felix to immediately gasp. She began to smear the cream over his face without taking her gaze off him and remarked, Ugh, that'll ruin such a pretty face. Then Irene asked, Are you uncomfortable? Perhaps you should get more comfortable. You can straighten your back if you want. Felix replied, It's okay. And then he said, I'd like to tell you something. I think there are some things I should tell you. Looking the girl in the face, Felix said, You know, I'm fine. I told you I can handle myself better than anyone. Looking at the young man, Irene replied, You shouldn't smile like that. The girl didn't see any reason to be amused. He replied, Haha, you're so strict. That ominous evening and night, there was a full moon, and the sky was surprisingly dark. The landscape seemed to convey the tragedy of the events to come. Even the weather seemed to be against what was about to happen. The wind blew, and in some places the sky was even blood red. She woke up and pulled the blanket over herself. It seemed she was very thirsty. After this, Claudia found a glowing candle near the bed and took hold of the candlestick with her hand. She noticed a bloody body right at her feet. Everything around it was simply covered in dark, crimson blood. When she looked further, she saw another dead figure. Horror simply paralyzed the frightened girl's entire body, breath, and voice. She looked around and asked, Is there anyone alive here? Looking at the head, she said, Father! She could not believe that he showed no signs of life. After this, the girl noticed the figure of her mother, who had been killed by someone, and she screamed loudly, Mother! In an instant, the two people closest to her left her. After that, she got out of bed, found the courage to gather her strength, and walked out the open door, noticing someone standing in front of her. When she looked straight ahead, she noticed something strangely familiar about him, and was surprised to decide that this someone somehow reminded her of her own brother. It was some kind of monster, who uttered only a few words. Its speech barely resembled human speech, more like the sounds made by some animal. The man turned to her, and when she said, Brother, he held someone's head in his hand and said, Kill your family members without leaving a trace. The monster, covered in blood from head to toe, grinned a vile smile and said, Everyone! Claudia was scared and asked, Who are you? She couldn't believe that her own brother could do something like that to their parents. After this, Irene suddenly woke up and sat up in her bed. Her whole body was shaking, and her cheeks were stained with tears. She couldn't come to her senses. She was terribly frightened by what she had seen. The girl began to rub her eyes and thought, what kind of dream was that? What could all this mean? Then she heard a knock on the door of the room. She started a little, and the maid said, Lady Amber, if you are awake, go and have breakfast. Irene sat on the edge of her bed and said, yes, okay. She was still haunted by the dream she had just had. Like a zombie, she began to dress, slipping her robe over her shoulders. Everything was jumbled in her head, and she didn't know whether this was real or just a terrible dream. After that, the girl approached the door and grabbed the handle. But just as she was about to open the door, Irene thought about something. She thought about how realistic everything had seemed in her dream. It was simply terrifying. Could all this really have happened in the future? She wondered if Felix had truly been possessed by a spirit. Had she really dreamed of him killing his family, his father and mother? When she came to the dining room, Claudia immediately asked, Irene, did you sleep well? She replied, yes, and you? Of course, yes. Irene also asked, where are Felix and your parents now? As the girl picked up her breakfast from the table, Claudia replied, Dad and brother left early, and Mom is still sleeping. She also said, listen, maybe we should buy a cruise ship. We can travel the world on it with the whole family. When Irene said, that would be nice, Claudia said, how wonderful it would be if we all lived on an island together. It would be a real paradise. Irene looked at her, and when Claudia asked, what's wrong? You seem a little strange. She replied that everything was fine. Irene turned her head towards Claudia and said, I don't really want to talk about this morning, but I think I should. Claudia looked closely at her friend as she said, Claudia, don't be afraid, and please listen to me. The Duke of Chamberlain's palace looked ominous at this time of night, and then it started to rain, which made things even worse. The young man held the letter he'd opened in his hand. When he read it, he decided that was the way it was, because there was nothing he could do to change it. Slightly crumpling the piece of paper in his hand, Felix declared, the time has finally come. He looked excited. Irene, standing next to him, asked the young man, are you really going to go? Do you really have to do this? As usual, he stroked her head with his palm and replied, yes, but it's okay. There's no need to worry so much. But she couldn't react calmly to this. After this, the man got dressed and, leaving the room, said in the doorway, see you soon, Irene. The rain intensified. A thunderstorm began, and the sky rumbled loudly, as if foreshadowing real trouble. In a house that looked absolutely terrifying, someone said, well, tell me, isn't it hard for you? His voice sounded with malicious pleasure. There sat a bloodied Felix, who was asked, tell me, why do you endure so steadfastly? Even I feel pain when I look at you. The man continued, you'll soon be consumed by the spirit anyway, so all your efforts are in vain. A spirit-poisoned relic, which these villains had apparently stolen from the temple, protruded from Felix's shoulder. Felix didn't answer, but only looked angrily into the eyes of his enemy, who seemed unable to remain silent. Standing opposite him, smiling slyly, was none other than Duke Lemberg, who had struck him with a spirit-poisoned arrow, and now a powerful spirit would inevitably find itself within him. As Felix bowed slightly, the Duke said, this is simply a stunning sight. How I love something like this. The next moment, someone put a hand on the Duke's shoulder and said, hey! Beside him stood Crown Prince Lucas, who said to the Duke, you're wasting your time on useless things, as always. Lemberg replied, please don't exaggerate my only hobby. Lucas replied, well, you may continue. I'll go, and you finish your terrible hobby and join me. I have no interest in contemplating anything like that. When the Duke asked the prince if he wanted to spruce himself up before meeting Claudia, Felix clenched his fist tightly and groaned with all his might, and the prince replied, please shut up. After this, the Duke of Lemberg took a few steps towards the young man sitting near the wall and said, well, then let's continue. But he didn't have time to do anything, as he groaned loudly in pain. It wasn't in vain that the young man had been gathering his last strength into his fist. When the Duke bent over his leg, he saw that it had been badly damaged by the fist of the still, as it turned out, strong Felix. Felix looked at the result of his work and laughed loudly. Well, his suffering will not go unanswered. In response, the Duke of Lemberg, with only a slight smile, said, yes, you are more temperamental than I thought, and on top of that, you use magic. After this, he turned to another man participating and said, Sir Constantine, it seems like my leg is about to fall off. Could you, as a saint, heal it? After this, the Duke of Lemberg laughed loudly. His laughter was like a devilish joy. Continuing to prop up the wall, Constantine replied, I don't want to. Looking at Felix, who was sitting against the wall and seemed to be losing consciousness, Lemberg said, I don't think our alliance is working. This won't work. But with the last of his strength, Felix laughed loudly and said, did you really just realize this? Constantine confirmed his words. Yes, something like this was impossible from the very beginning. After that, he added, this is probably the first and last time I'm helping you. I don't intend to participate in anything like this again. To this, the Duke of Lemberg declared, is that so? I intend not to stop until I have Claudia, one way or another. Then he added, if you want to end it here, you can leave. I'm not going to stop you. Constantine's eyes lit up and he said, thanks to you, from today on, my principles are completely destroyed. How impudent, and how disappointed I am. The Duke of Lemberg laughed loudly and replied, you decided to join us yourself, so what is all this anger about? A moment later, the Duke of Lemberg lit a match and said, there's nothing to be done about it. A few seconds later, he walked up to the seated Felix, blew tobacco smoke into his face, and said, "I forgive you for turning my leg into a useless rag." Felix tried to clench his fist with his bloody hand, but he couldn't. But still, a moment later, he swung and delivered a rather powerful blow. Unfortunately for him, Lemberg managed to jump back, avoid the crushing blow, and was not harmed in any way. Felix screamed loudly, coughing up blood. He was disappointed and regretted that he had perhaps wasted his last strength. Duke Lemberg said, "Calm down. If you continue using magic, you'll likely die of shock soon. If I were you, I wouldn't be so reckless." He grabbed Felix's face and added, "I know a great way to help you numb the pain, although you might not like it." After that, he put the cigarette in his mouth. "Now you should take a deep breath in and out." Then Lemberg laughed. "You're just a real good guy. I like you much better like this." He continued, sitting next to me. "If you inhale the smoke, the pain will disappear for a while. Not for long, of course, but enough to leave a will to your family, or loved one, right?" Felix was silent. Lemberg continued, "And you can also say hello to the one who captures your heart." Standing before him, the Duke said, "You probably realize that if you commit suicide, you will be consumed by a demon. Wouldn't it be better to talk first and then die peacefully?" Taking a box of cigarettes, he added, "I think you should get used to this." Sitting down next to me again, he said, "Even though you may die sooner, please understand me and forgive me for not looking that far ahead." After that, he took off the ring and put it on Felix's finger. "I wonder if that lady will tell me the same thing again as last time?" The Duke's face looked pleased. "What did she say then?" "Oh yes, that my breath smells like shit." Rising and leaning on his healthy leg, he said, "Well, I'll go." As he was leaving, he waved his hand. "Perhaps we'll meet again, if it works out, sir." Then he turned to Constantine. "Let's go." Both men headed towards the exit, ignoring Felix sitting behind them. The next moment, Constantine turned around. Lemberg asked, "Sir Constantine, aren't you coming?" He turned back abruptly and replied, "I'm coming." Felix remained sitting, leaning against the bookcase, with the poisoned relic in his shoulder. His vision still remained clear, but gradually he began to see objects worse. Then he found it difficult to see, and he closed his eye for a moment. But suddenly, as if he had received new strength, he smiled ominously with his bloody mouth and quietly laughed. "Oh, damn." Everything around was on fire. The flames spread wider and higher. Everything was burning around. On the floor lay a pair of cracked bloody glasses that had once belonged to a nice young man named Felix. A glowing red gem lay on the floor amidst huge pools of blood. Its shine grew stronger and stronger. Some time later, the house where all these events took place, and the wounded man inside, were engulfed in a veritable fire, growing ever wider and more furious. It seemed no one was destined to survive. Felix rose to his feet and lightly squeezed his palm, from which thick, dark red blood was dripping. He felt strange, but at the same time, he couldn't say that he was completely dead. Felix laughed loudly. A voice inside him said, "What a strange, refreshing feeling." It sounded frightening. It felt like someone was speaking right inside him, or right next to him. The voice said again, "Where should I go now?" After this, Felix stood up abruptly and walked away. At this time, Irene was sleeping peacefully in her bed, hugging a soft toy. She snored quietly and did not hear anything around her. But suddenly, Irene woke up and started rubbing her eyes. She couldn't understand why, but she felt like there was someone else in the room. Looking up, she saw a man next to her, whose clothes and body were spattered with blood. The next moment, a hand reached out to her, also covered in blood. Irene couldn't move. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she couldn't even scream. He stood before her, holding out his hand. There was something familiar about him. She whispered, "Felix?" And at that very moment, a voice rang out in Felix's head. "Why are you hesitating? I know all your deepest desires." Felix couldn't understand where the voice was coming from. Irene repeated again in a trembling voice, "Felix!" To her surprise, nothing terrible happened. The bloodied man slowly approached and gently stroked her head. Then, with a weak smile on his face, he said, "I'm back." To make sure it wasn't a dream, Irene pinched her cheek painfully. The pain was real. She whispered, "This isn't a dream. This is the real Felix." She looked at him, recognizing and not recognizing him at the same time. Irene said in confusion, "Wait, what's wrong with you? Where's all this blood coming from?" She reached out to him in a panic. "Are you okay?" Felix winced slightly and replied, Irene, it's okay. Please stop touching me." Irene exclaimed, "Excuse me, but you need immediate treatment. Can you move? I'll help you." At that moment, the voice in Felix's head echoed again. "You could give her hellish pleasure right now? How stupid of you." Felix mentally replied, "I'd be grateful if you'd shut up." A picture of the past seemed to emerge before his eyes. The same building, before the fire. Felix sat by the bookcase, wounded by an arrow. And then, for the first time, he heard a voice. "I can't believe it!" Felix clenched his fist. The voice continued, "You barely lived past 20 years." Felix tensed. The voice said, "But it's strange that your magic is still with you. I haven't seen anything like this in a long time. Maybe ever." Felix clutched his head, trying to figure out the source of the sound. A voice asked, "What is it, Archimand?" Felix lit a cigarette, ignoring him. But the voice persisted. "For a mere man, that's impressive. You seem very strong." Felix was silent. The voice became more insistent. "Hey, can you hear me? Are you going to answer?" In response, Felix grabbed the arrow protruding from his shoulder. Felix gathered his last strength, and with a cry pulled the bloody arrow out of his body, and the voice spoke again. Listen, if you give me half of your body and soul, I will help you gain enormous power, such that you, a small man, cannot even imagine. Felix remained silent, and the voice asked, Well, doesn't that sound tempting? I think you should agree. The young man completely ignored everything he heard, but inside him, the words sounded, Hey you, stop being silent, don't ignore me. What are you planning? The young man didn't even intend to answer. That was his decision. When Felix decided to adjust his glasses on his nose, a voice said, Well, nothing can be done. A moment later, the puzzled young man saw what had happened, and a voice asked, So, how do you like my power? Impressive. Do you like it? Felix held the cracked glasses in his hands. This was the work of the spirit, who declared, And this is not the limit of my powers. Now do you realize what you're giving up? Come on, answer me. Felix tried to get to his feet, and the spirit asked him, Are you ignoring me again? In response, the young man only laughed loudly. He took a few steps towards the door, and the spirit exclaimed, Hey, you Archimand! As Felix looked out the window, the spirit said, You can't go your entire life without resistance. It seems you've been cultivating magic resistance your entire life. Your attempts will be futile. While Felix was thinking about something, a voice said, Okay, I get it. Half is too much, right? Then what about a third? After a while, maybe a quarter? Finally, Felix broke the silence and said, Listen, stop chatting. You're giving me a headache. The spirit replied, Oh, he finally answered. The young man took a few steps around the room and then spoke loudly to the spirit, deciding to call him by his name, Laraj. He heard a voice. That's right. Since you've already guessed who I am, this conversation will be short. I have the power to give you whatever you ask for. I'm ready to bestow upon you the laurels of victory. Felix replied, I only want one thing, for you to sleep quietly inside me and be silent for at least a little while. The spirit said, Well, that's a strange answer. Did you really let me in on purpose? Felix replied, Yes, that's all true. He laughed and said, How did I end up trapped in the body of a lunatic like you? Felix didn't answer him, but started looking for something in his trouser pockets. He then reached forward with his hand and threw something, after which he said, Please be careful with the coarse language inside me. I don't like it. It turned out that the abandoned object was some strange stuffed toy, which immediately plopped into a pool of blood, and the spirit said, Ha! Listen carefully to me, Archimand. The toy became covered in blood, and Felix immediately turned away. But a moment later, in the place where the toy had been, the body of a bloody young man appeared. The spirit's voice spoke again. Do you know what spell was cast on the arrow? You were probably brainwashed by it before they displaced me, so you couldn't know it. Felix remained silent and watched as the body took on clear outlines right before his eyes. The spirit said, You're in this situation because you once saved a girl who's not even related to you. Aren't you offended? Felix immediately recalled this moment from his life. There was nothing unpleasant in this memory. He remembered how he fell into the abyss after that, but even that did not cause him pain. All these memories flashed through the young man's mind like lightning, and he said, I acted then only in accordance with my convictions. As the young man watched the body of his dead twin, the spirit said, You're so kind that you even erased those memories from her. But what kind of angel are you? And besides, you look like an angel too. After this, the seated young man asked, Do you have any extra clothes? The spirit replied, Where would I get them from? And Felix said, You are simply useless. As the young man turned toward the door, the spirit asked again, What did you tell me there? Wait, what are you doing now? I'll tell you again, don't ignore me. After Felix dropped a sparkling gemstone on the floor, the spirit screamed, You seem completely insane. Don't you want revenge on them? Bloody revenge for those who did this to you? Felix replied to the spirit inside him that he would deal with revenge himself and would not borrow the demon's power for this. After this, the young man lit a fire on the ring on his hand. From this blazing fire, a flame flared up around him, and the flames spread further and further. The spirit said, Revenge is needed for the fact that you cannot use magic now. You have lost this ability of yours. The young man stood before a body that looked exactly like him and said, In any case, you will not get from me what you want. The young man, who looked very much like Felix, said, What a refreshing feeling. And the spirit within said, You're definitely crazy. This is exactly what Felix told his interlocutor now. He raised his index finger and told her, This is what happened. Irene was absolutely furious. She screamed, Why are you so unperturbed when this has happened to you? No longer able to smile, Felix managed some semblance of a smile and said, Sorry. Then the young man rested his chin on his hand and thought, But still, this is really very dangerous, because inside him, there's a spirit named Laraj. Looking at the girl sitting next to him, Felix thought, This is a demon of battles and victories, but he is still very dangerous. Felix didn't respond when he heard the girl call his name. He listened to a voice inside himself that asked, So, can't you hold back anymore? Then Felix turned his gaze to Irene, who was beaming in front of him, and now asked, Felix, tell me, is everything really okay? But at that moment, his thoughts were occupied with something entirely different. He heard the demon say that he was also the spirit of love and hidden desires. The spirit said, You want those eyes looking at you to look only at you, don't you? Irene did not take her eyes off Felix, who was sitting opposite her, and who now seemed to be somewhere very far away. As the young man placed his hand on the girl's shoulder, the spirit within him spoke, I see you want her to beg you endlessly and beg with tears. Tell me, is that what you want? The young man's gaze was cold and detached. He tried his best to resist the voice inside him. Irene was both frightened and worried. She couldn't understand what was happening. Felix clutched the bedspread tightly, unable to resist this merciless spirit. After this, the young man put his hand on the girl's shoulder again and said the name Irene. Still looking fixedly into her face, Felix said, "Irene, please leave my room." Irene was shocked by his request, and what he said after it. "Leave my room. Now I'm a danger to you." When the girl asked if this was because of the demonic relic, Felix turned his head away from her and did not answer. He continued to stare into the distance, and she repeated his name again. "Felix." The girl took the young man's hand in hers and said, "I don't care at all how you've changed because of the demonic relic." Smiling, Irene continued, "I told you before that you are you, so I am ready to go through hell with you." The young man's gaze did not change when his interlocutor said, "Your safe return brings me incredible joy." The girl said, "It's okay," just as Felix tried to pull his hand away from hers. He was trying to tell her he wasn't himself anymore. Felix managed to break free, and sitting next to the girl, he waved his hand slightly. Irene asked, "Why are you avoiding?" But she didn't receive an answer to this question. Lowering his head, Felix said, realizing that I'm becoming dangerous to the girl, "You're tired, so forgive me for waking you. Please go and sleep." Irene immediately asked Felix, "What are you talking about? Do you think I'll be able to sleep in this situation?" He replied, "Thank you for the treatment. We'll talk about the rest later." Irene was close to tears. She didn't understand what was happening. Then she said, "But you're so badly hurt. I can't leave you like this." After this, Felix even turned away, unable to look at his interlocutor. When she asked, "Can I at least keep an eye on you?" he said nothing. Irene didn't know what else to ask him. She was ready to burst into tears and beg him to listen to her. But all her pleas remained unanswered. The young man said, "Irene, please, I beg you, leave here." At that moment, she burst into tears. Irene headed for the exit, and on the way, decided to insist on her own way. So the girl said, "Okay, then we'll talk about everything tomorrow." But, closing the door behind her, the girl still couldn't resist another remark and said, "I decided that, just in case, I'll tell my family doctor about all this." When Felix's door closed and the lock clicked, the young man remained sitting on the edge of his bed. He couldn't move, and the only thought running through his head was what he was going to do next. After this, the young man, bandaged by his recent guest, plopped down on the bed and settled into a rather uncomfortable position. At that moment, the spirit's voice asked him, "Are you not a man?" Felix replied, "Do you therefore consider me a beast?" The spirit continued, "Listen, I've lived for thousands of years, but I've never met a person like you. I've never seen anything like this before. You're so good at containing your demonic urges, even though you're not really a full-fledged demon." Felix whispered back, "I think that's perfectly natural, so stop with your disgusting persuasion. It won't get you anywhere anyway." Just as Felix was about to fall asleep, the spirit asked, "You're a virgin, right?" He replied, "That's right, and I'm tired, so could you please be quiet?" Then there was silence until the morning. As soon as the sun peeked out the window and illuminated the bedroom, Felix heard a voice in his head that seemed to be shouting, "Twitter, tweet, tweet! Hey, human, come on, get up! It's time to wake up!" Felix grabbed his head and asked, "What's this? Why this early in the morning?" As he began to rub his eyes, the spirit said, "Come on, get up." I said, "Get up. I've got a great idea. It's about a girl." Felix got out of bed and lightly scratched his shoulder. He began to think, and a voice in his head suggested, "Let's win this girl over." Felix replied, "What? Are you talking about this again?" The spirit still did not calm down and said, "You know, it doesn't matter whether you are a virgin or not, because you have me, the power of the demon Laraj, the demon of love and pleasure, who will help you with this." Felix looked at his body, at his hands, and answered the demon, "I can manage without your help. There's no need for it." To this, the young man heard the spirit's response, "Hear me out completely, you impudent little man. I was born in this body only a few thousand years ago, but I have existed for hundreds of billions of years, and I possess the corresponding skill." But the young man had no intention of listening to the voice in his head. He decided it was completely unnecessary right now, and he had no need for it. Felix then rose from his bed, and on the way, answered the demon, "I prefer to remain on the same wavelength with a person. I won't lay a finger on a partner without their consent, and I doubt that's even a subject for discussion." Laraj said, "So you think I'm just going to give in? Are you going to use your face? With a face like that, you could seduce her and make her fall in love with you. Seduce her, I'm telling you." Felix was starting to get irritated by this voice. He stopped by the mirror, and looking into it, replied, "Laraj, you are a demon of love and pleasure. So tell me, where is the love in such proposals of yours?" While the young man looked at his reflection in the mirror, the demon said, "True love begins with physical contact, and then everything will follow suit. The main thing is to start with seducing her." For a moment, the young man felt a slight pain. He grimaced, looking into the mirror, and at that moment, the demon said, "Sorry." A moment later, Felix said, "Surprisingly, I feel pretty good right now." And then he began tearing the bandages and plasters from his body, which fell to the floor with a rustling sound. At that moment, the spirit said, "And this quick recovery is also the power of the demon." When the young man looked at his reflection, he was surprised to notice that his body had changed significantly. He now seemed like a completely different person. The spirit said, "The longer you keep me inside you, the stronger the effect on your body will be, after which you and I will simply merge. Let's see how long you can last like this." but Felix seemed completely oblivious. When the young man examined his body, he said in surprise, "Just think, not a single scratch." Then he grabbed a shirt lying nearby and lifting it from the chair, said, "You know, Laraj, you're very annoying. You seem bored." To this, the demon replied, "Are you an idiot? You're the one who locked me inside here." As he pulled his shirt on, Felix realized he was getting pretty fed up with this conversation. He sighed, "Look at all the noise you're making." The young man then buttoned his shirt and said, "I'm going out now, so please don't talk to me." The spirit inside him agreed. "Okay." The young man opened the door of his room, which creaked quietly. After this, Felix began to look around, and, to his surprise, saw something that surprised him greatly. Irene sat on a chair next to his room, apparently asleep and snoring softly. She was dressed exactly as she had been the night before during their last conversation. The young man gazed at Irene's face. It looked peaceful and calm, yet it seemed the dream had been heavy. She twitched nervously from time to time. But, hearing some noise nearby, she suddenly shuddered and opened her eyes, after which she said in a puzzled tone, "Eh?" Felix leaned over her and asked, "Irene, why are you sleeping here? Why did you do that? You'd better go to your room." She, not expecting him to appear, only quietly said, "Felix?" At that moment, the young man's expression changed dramatically, and he sternly added, "And be sure to lock the door behind you." After making sure he was okay, Irene smiled broadly and quickly said, "Don't worry, everything's fine. I'm already awake, and besides, I've slept for quite a while." She began to examine him closely. It seemed to her that Felix had changed significantly since yesterday, not only in appearance, but also in his behavior. It was as if he were the same man before her, yet at the same time completely different. She wondered if it was because he was missing his glasses. He also seemed to be acting colder, smiling less, and seemed to be avoiding her. At some point, her gaze fell on the unbuttoned collar of his shirt, and she noticed that his body had changed too. It was strange. She looked more closely and suddenly realized with surprise another thing. He began to seem incredibly attractive to her. Irene immediately felt embarrassed and mentally scolded herself. "What am I even thinking about? There's a wounded man in front of me." Taking a step closer, she gently touched him and asked, "But you're okay. Why do you look so unharmed?" Felix calmly replied, "I think I've recovered thanks to the demon's power within me. Please don't touch me." She apologized, explaining she was simply surprised, and began putting on her shoes. However, as soon as she stood up, she wobbled. Her body hadn't fully awakened yet. She had already begun to fall, quietly exhaling, "Ah." But at that very moment, Felix suddenly grabbed her wrist and held her. The grip was so strong that Irene felt as if her hand was being clamped in an iron vise. Pain shot through her, as if her bones were about to crack. Noticing her expression, Felix immediately let go of her hand and looked at her in amazement. Irene clutched her wrist, trying to stop the pain. Felix asked, "Are you okay?" She replied, yes." Looking down at her wrist, where dark marks were already appearing, she quietly asked, "Tell me, is this also the power of a demon?" Felix looked down and answered briefly, "Yes." To lighten the mood, Irene quickly laughed and said, "Felix, please don't worry. I was just surprised." But he was already starting to move on. She looked after him and asked, "Please don't go so far." Felix stopped on the other side of the wide corridor without turning around and answered briefly, "Okay." After a short silence, Irene tried to speak again. "You know, some people keep little hamsters as pets. It looks strange, but they become attached to each other." She smiled slightly and added, "I think it's enough to just not step on them and stroke them gently. Then they'll be fine." She looked at him, as if trying to say something more than just words. Felix was upset by her words, and he seemed confused by what had just happened, so he stammered, "Let's start with the treatment." He looked at Irene, who was standing with her back to him, and added, "I think it might be a fracture, so I want to call a doctor." The girl replied, "Thank you." Felix decided to calm her down, and apparently calm himself down as well, and declared, "I'm going to do my best not to hurt anyone again." After this, Irene turned her head back to the young man, and cheerfully, loudly exclaimed, "It's okay. The doctor will cure an injury like this in a moment." Then the girl thought for a moment and decided that perhaps constantly saying everything was fine was a bad habit. She frowned slightly and turning to Felix said, "The doctor's visit concerns you too." But the young man's mood returned. Felix leaned his hand on the staircase railing, lowered his head, and said, "You know, Irene, that's not the problem. Don't make me mistakenly assume you'll always be okay." Then the young man raised his head, looked intently into the eyes of his interlocutor, and said in a hard, quiet voice, "One day I will inflict a serious wound on you." Irene was simply stunned by this phrase. She blinked rapidly, unable to utter anything. But after some time, she came to her senses, and quietly chuckling, answered, "Listen, it's not for me to tell a man with a shoulder pierced by an arrow about this." Felix answered her, "It's none of your business." Then the young man continued, "Irene, you too are a completely innocent victim. You want to protect me from harm, even if it means sacrificing yourself, and I want the same." Felix didn't stop talking. He said, "Just as you can't hold water in your hands, so there are wounds that can't be healed." Irene listened to him and said, "That's all true, but it seems you're not taking all the circumstances into account, and besides, you need to pay attention to my wishes as well." After that, the girl tried to smile and said, "If it's you, I won't mind any action, no matter what you do to me." As if frightened by his own thoughts, the young man suddenly fell silent. His gaze froze, and he seemed to blush slightly. After this, Felix covered his burning face with his hands and said to Irene, "If you only knew what I'm thinking, you wouldn't be having so much fun." Then, opening his eyes slightly, he looked at the girl and added, "If you knew what I was thinking, you certainly wouldn't have said that. You'd be scared." While Irene looked at him in surprise, Felix said, "Listen, this is simply unbearable. I'm still holding back with all my might." Irene closed her eyes and wondered what this secret desire was that he couldn't bring himself to speak of. Did he really want to kill her? Then the girl's eyes widened, and she looked at Felix again. She suddenly wondered if the demon had turned him into a monster. But on closer inspection, she noticed that this was not the case. Rather, he looked as if he was barely holding back tears. The girl noticed with surprise that something was wrong with Felix. He suddenly dropped to one knee, and a small pool of blood began to form at his feet. When she rushed towards him, he, covering his mouth with his hand, said, "Don't worry, everything is fine. My body is just rejecting the relic." Irene asked again, "Is it dangerous?" He quickly stopped her. "Don't come near me. Everything's fine." Then he coughed up blood several more times. Felix sat on his knees in front of her, coughed, wiped the blood with his bloody palm, and continued to cough quietly again. Irene shuddered, and it even seemed to her that the hair on her head stood on end when the young man suddenly jumped up and looked in her direction. After this, Felix, without saying a single word, quickly turned around and walked towards his room. The girl looked at the door as it slammed behind him and wondered what had happened. Why had Felix left her so suddenly without saying a word? But a few seconds later, the door swung open again, and Felix appeared in the doorway, holding something in his hand. The young man pulled a huge, sharp sword from its sheath and said, "Irene, if I do anything inappropriate, you will have to pierce me with this sword." The girl exclaimed loudly, "What?" Her eyes sparkled nervously. She did not understand what he wanted from her. At that moment, Felix put the sword back into its sheath and said, "This weapon will now belong to you." Irene was forced to take the sword and asked, "Who should I pierce? You?" Felix replied, "Me. Then I will come to my senses and stop being a demon." After this, the young man said, "Then perhaps now we should go see the family." They moved toward the dining room, and Irene held the heavy sword in her hands the entire time. A demon's voice echoed in Felix's head. "Hey, I thought you were the only one with secret desires, but I think you should take a closer look at her, since she seems to like you too." Then the voice continued, "You were sure she didn't like you, right? I have a feeling this is all just because you're a real idiot." At this point, Felix couldn't take it anymore and shouted loudly, "Stop it already! Enough! My patience has reached its limits." He jerked nervously and shouted again, "Enough!" Hearing his words, Irene became very scared, started crying and said, "Huh? Me? Did I do something wrong?" Felix realized his mistake and hastened to reassure her. "No, it's just that some piece of debris keeps telling me something." While the girl was trying to understand what he was talking about, the young man quietly added, "Disgrace me again, and I won't let it go." Irene looked at Felix, not understanding who he was talking to, but the spirit inside him chuckled. "Ha, yes, I get it, I get it." As they walked down the corridor, Irene said, "Secretly, I'm very glad you pretended to be dead." She continued, as if thinking out loud, "But under this pretext, those 3 intruders could do some mischief, so we should be careful." Then the girl stopped, raised her index finger, and said, "There is good news. You, Felix, no longer have an artifact in your shoulder, which means that now you can no longer be limited by magic." But her mouth dropped open in surprise when she heard the answer. Felix said, "Unfortunately, Irene, I can't use my magic anymore." He turned to her and, feigning impotence, added, "Every time I use mana, Laraj tries to penetrate deeper." Irene flinched and exclaimed, "What did you just say?" Then he raised his finger and said, "Tell me, would you understand if I said that I feel as if my life force is being eaten away from the inside?" Irene wanted to answer that she understood. All people have mana, but the amount varies from person to person. Some possess a tiny fraction of it, while others are destined to have much more. This is determined at birth, and it is very difficult to change. Felix continued, "You could say that while the average person has about a glass of mana, I have an entire estate, although I'm grateful to fate for the opportunity." He added, "That's why I survived when Laraj entered me. Despite losing a large amount of mana, it was this energy that helped me resist the demon." Felix then said, "A normal person has low resistance, so they would lose all their mana and die. It's constantly being used up and replenished, but right now, I feel like the outlet for replenishing it is blocked." After that, he smiled, looked at Irene and said, "But nevertheless, I will not die. I can still resist the spirit inside me." The young people continued down the corridor. Felix said, "It's enough that I simply won't use magic." Irene replied, I see," but she wasn't at all happy about it. Felix looked at his palm and said, "If I use magic, it only makes things worse. I can't do anything about it." He explained, "Whenever I try to use my magic, it feels like fragments of my soul are being influenced by a demon. It's very difficult." As they approached the door, the young man added, "Unfortunately, my strength is at its limit. I'm doing almost everything I can to control my instincts." Stopping in front of the door, he turned his head towards the girl and said, "But if I suddenly lose my mind, you must not hesitate for a second and be sure to pierce me with a sword." Irene looked worriedly at the young man standing next to her, who asked, "Should we go already?" She replied, "Yes." Felix swung the door open and stepped boldly into the room. Irene followed him slowly. They were both already waiting inside. The rest of the family was in the room at that moment. Father stood behind the back of his mother's chair, and in front of him, with her back to the newcomers, stood Claudia. Then the girl turned around abruptly and said excitedly, "Brother, is that you?" Her voice trembled with the excitement that filled the soul of the worried girl. The young man turned to his sister and said, "Yes, it's me." Then quick footsteps were heard, and the girl ran as fast as she could towards her brother, who had opened his arms. Claudia pressed her whole body against Felix. Relieved that he was completely unharmed, she seemed even ready to feel his body to make sure he was safe and sound. After this, she slapped the young man across the cheek with all her might, leaving a red mark on it. Without lowering her hand, Claudia looked into Felix's face, as if asking if this was enough. Standing behind Felix, Irene gasped quietly and opened her mouth in horror, not understanding what could have happened. The young people's parents were equally stunned. Both mother and father flinched at the slap. It was a complete surprise to everyone. Then Claudia delivered another blow to her brother's face with her palm. You'd think she wasn't going to stop. Everyone in the scene froze in their places. Claudia seemed to calm down after slapping her brother in the face a couple of times, but he didn't say a word in response. But Irene could not remain silent and screamed loudly, asking Claudia what she was doing. Felix stood before his sister, who said, "Rumors are spreading that you've died. A funeral will have to be held soon," Claudia said, looking into her brother's face. "Your reputation is so good that now people even organize their own funeral after your death." The girl's face looked upset and tear-stained. She kept her eyes on Felix and asked, "Tell me, should I congratulate you on this?" The girl burst into tears. She cried and asked again through her tears why he hadn't told her anything. "I understand it could have been worse, and that you made every effort, but you could have felt sorry for me." Claudia, choking with emotion, continued, "Just look at the situation you're in right now. I'm so angry at myself, at you, at everyone. I'm going crazy." Felix looked at her and replied, "Claudia, calm down. This isn't your fault." She continued to cry, and plopping down on the floor said, I know, but the fact that I couldn't help you in any way just depresses me. I can't come to terms with it." Felix knelt down next to his sister and began to calm her down. It wasn't easy. Irene, who was standing next to them, also began to fidget, shifting from foot to foot and not letting go of the ill-fated sword. But then suddenly, the girl joyfully raised her index finger, smiled, and shouted, "That's exactly why I prepared." The entire Chamberlain family perked up and immediately turned their heads to Irene, waiting to hear what she had to say. They prepared to listen attentively. Irene said, "I think now is a very good time to go on a summer trip to some deserted island." Then came the day when the body of the young Earl of Chamberlain was to be buried. He now lay inside a closed coffin. The family of the deceased gathered in the church. His mother, sister, and father were there, and Irene joined them. At this moment, the girl was under a thin veil and was trying to give her face a mournful and sad look. She knew she couldn't let those three know Felix was alive. The first of them, in her opinion, was completely insane. The second, on the contrary, was distinguished by his intelligence. Irene considered him a very insightful person, if not more. She had doubts about the third one. She hadn't had time to get to know him properly, but she was still wary of him. All these thoughts raced through Irene's head. She pondered what to do. She needed to be prepared for any eventuality. After this, Irene turned her attention to Claudia, who was standing next to her, and asked, "Claudia, are you good at pretending to be crying?" She replied, I don't even know. I'll try now." After this, the girl began to sob quietly, then burst into tears, sincerely repeating the same word, "Brother." She looked very unhappy. Irene smiled and thought that wouldn't do. Claudia would likely be found out quickly, so she said, "Look, maybe you should be indignant instead of crying." Then she added, "Claudia, you are very angry at Felix for taking everything upon himself and sacrificing himself, and you are also angry at your own powerlessness." When she reminded Claudia that she had known nothing about her brother's intentions until the very end, the girl replied, "Well, if my brother really died, I don't even know whether I would have behaved this way or not." Irene said, "There's no law that says a person has to feel sad. Pretend your brother really is dead, and you'll never see him again." Then she glanced at Felix's portrait. After that, the girls cheered up a bit. When Claudia said, "Thank you, Irene. I think I understand a little," she replied, "Well, thank goodness." Solemn music played in the church. Everything was prepared for the young count's funeral. And at that moment, Claudia said, "If only Felix could see this. Could he have imagined that the imperial palace, the estate, the funeral parlor, would look like this?" Then she added, "Imagine, all these places, and even the road to the grave, all of this will be covered with flowers from people who came to honor the memory of this deceased young man." At that moment, both Claudia and Irene were forced to turn around abruptly when someone behind them said, "He's definitely watching this from heaven." When they saw the speaker, to their surprise, they recognized him as His Highness the Crown Prince, who had also come to the funeral. Then another man came up and said, "Yes, so many people are mourning his passing. His path will not be boring." He added, "Earl Chamberlain lived a noble life and surrounded everyone with love, so God will surely show him favor." After this, the Duke of Limburg looked into the face of another man and asked, "Am I right, Sir Constantine?" The third man approached, looking stern and taciturn. He replied to the Duke, "Please refrain from such remarks." A moment later, the Crown Prince clutched his head and said, "Ha! Why did you even drag him after me? I have a very important conversation with Claudia, so get lost. The Duke of Lemberg rushed up to the prince and, laughing, said, I don't want to. Meanwhile, Irene, who had been watching everything, thought, he really does look like a scapegoat. The Duke began to whisper something in the Crown Prince's ear. I see what you are thinking, so I cannot stand aside. The Crown Prince turned to the Duke, threw his hand off his shoulder, and shouted loudly, slapping his arm, Get your hands off me! Maybe you'll stop interfering and leave me alone. I'm getting on my nerves. Lucas said, Duke, you shouldn't get ahead of yourself. It's very mean of you to act secretly behind our backs. He added, I don't want you around. The Duke of Lemberg laughed again, and looking at the angry prince, replied, Then today I'll just observe. After this, the prince turned to another young man who was accompanying him and said, Sir Constantine, perhaps you will at least leave? He replied, I don't want to. The Crown Prince was furious. He shouted loudly, These devils! They won't even listen to me! Irene continued to watch them. She thought the Crown Prince looked like a scapegoat, but it was still somewhat unexpected. She stared at the three people, thinking that these idiots had only come to the funeral in formal attire. Even Benjamin was without his usual cigarette. At the same time, the girl was gripped by terror. She remembered who Felix's killers were. Goosebumps ran down her spine at the thought that they had come here as murderers. But the next moment, the girl sharply turned her head to the side and fixed her gaze on someone who was still present at the funeral ceremony. She didn't have time to do anything, because Claudia moved forward with quick steps and seemed to hit someone quite hard with her fist. Everyone was stunned by what the deceased sister had done. Claudia clenched her fist and struck Crown Prince Lucas square in the face with all her might. The young man's cheek burned, and blood spurted from his lips. He was literally knocked off his feet by the girl who suddenly appeared before him. The guards accompanying the prince immediately shouted loudly, Your Highness! Addressing the injured young man. The girl's father and mother were equally stunned. They exclaimed, Oh my God, my daughter, this is treason! The Crown Prince fell to the floor, clutching his face as he tried to recover from the crushing blow. Guards were already running behind him, asking the prince, Are you okay? We'll call a doctor right away. Claudia was simply terrifying in her anger. She screamed, How dare you show your insolent mug here! She clenched her fists and seemed ready to fight again. The prince clutched his aching face and, turning to the guards, said that he was fine, and then named the girl's name, Claudia. After this, the young man raised his head and, not paying attention to the blood pouring from his nose, looked, smiling, into the girl's face and said, Claudia, now you're looking at me. Still sitting on the ground, at the feet of his offender, the Crown Prince said, That's why I asked for a meeting just the two of us. My Claudia, as always, is very kind. You've given me a wonderful excuse. Now no one will blame me, even if I throw you in jail right now. Claudia looked unperturbed. She stared fixedly at the Crown Prince, then said, Did you really think I wouldn't find out who exactly killed my brother? The Crown Prince looked at her and said, So what? It seemed as if what was happening brought him some kind of incomprehensible, devilishly sinister joy. The girl continued, If you knew, but did it anyway, I will assume you consent to my contempt and hatred, directed specifically at you. The young woman's face looked detached and determined. She said, Lucas, I will never, ever forgive you for what you did. Her answer didn't seem to upset the Crown Prince in the least. Smiling, the young man said, Well, so be it. I'll gladly accept it. The Crown Prince's gaze flashed. He looked at the girl and said to her, Whether you forgive me or not makes absolutely no difference, but you must remember this day well. Irene was struck by the young man's words. He said, Claudia, you have to understand who's next. Another person present understood this too. After this, the prince turned his gaze to Irene, and apparently addressing her, said, Now be very careful. Walk now and look around. That's my advice to you. Irene was already certain that she would be the next victim, and that person. For some reason, she felt as if many eyes were on her right now. The girl also noticed a third, silent young man, named Constantine, staring at her. He too kept his gaze fixed on her, and there was a hint of menace in his gaze. Irene thought he was the scariest of the three villains. He didn't say anything, just stared. She felt very uncomfortable. Then she noticed Claudia, who had closed her eyes, and thought that while the acting was great, it seemed she was overdoing it. Did she really think these three would just put up with all this? Irene just wanted to scream. She started to sob a little, then burst into tears, and it seemed to her that this wasn't just an act, but genuine emotion. Meanwhile, Claudia felt very lighthearted. The two girls stopped directly in front of the three men. She thought these savages were now determined to come up with something else, but there was no other choice but to simply confront them. At that moment, Irene was struck by a strange thought. Someone was constantly watching her. It was like a sixth sense that never left the girl. She noticed that someone simply couldn't take their eyes off her. She looked in that direction and saw Constantine, who was staring at her, and she wondered why he kept staring at her like that. So she asked, Is there something you want to tell me? Constantine turned his head slightly to the side and replied, No, I was just thinking about something. Then he added, I thought killing you would be as easy as wringing a child's neck. His eyes gleamed predatorily, and he added, It would be better for me not to commit such senseless murders. I think we can wait a little while with this. Irene was ready to scream in horror. Why was he constantly talking to her about murder? She began to shake nervously. After he said, You've already accepted the consequences of your choice, she immediately turned her head toward the speaker. It seems no one will ignore her today. The person who said this was none other than the Duke of Lemberg. He also said, "It's a shame we couldn't show them at their worst." Looking at both girls, Duke Lemberg continued, "Since you are determined to accept anything, let me tell you that Felix Chamberlain could not hide at least one thing." After a pause, he added, "It was a passion for you. The one who is being buried today was clearly not indifferent to you, and experienced not friendly feelings at all, but real lust." Irene was simply stunned by the Duke's words. She couldn't believe it was true. Perhaps that was why Felix had been acting so strange lately. Irene reflected, passion is simply an impulsive desire, a physical lust for the opposite sex. All of this is called passion. She decided to answer this impudent man, and turned to the Duke of Lemberg, saying that she wanted to ask him something. After this, Irene loudly exclaimed, "Do you feel better now that you are slandering an innocent person who has died, who moreover cannot answer you in any way?" The Duke's face changed as she said, "Even if people say something with their human mouths, it is not always human speech." The Duke of Lemberg came to his senses and replied, "You're still as rude as ever. Do you think I'm making this up? It's not like that at all," he added. When Claudia replied to him, "I would understand if your words had any common sense," the Duke said, "I'm even beginning to sympathize with Felix." He laughed quietly and said to Irene, "It's amazing how you somehow make me feel this way, which has never happened to me before." Waving his hand toward the coffin, the Duke said, "You know, it must have been a shame for him to die without telling you how he felt, and now that I'm telling you how he felt, you don't believe me? But since the person concerned has left us, there's no way to verify it." Claudia asked Irene again, "Do you think it's worth it?" When she replied with disgust, "Claudia, could you give the Duke of Lemberg a good thrashing too?" When Claudia clenched her fist, Irene remarked with disgust, "Sorry, I was joking." After this, Claudia grabbed his hand, turned to the side and said, addressing the prince and his male companions, "Behave with dignity. Irene, the funeral will begin soon. Let's find the parents." The prince tried to object to her. "Claudia, I came to express my sincere condolences." But she didn't even listen to him and quickly walked away from him. He blindly shouted out only a name, "Claudia!" The young man's face was furious. He shouted loudly, "Damn it! That's why I told you all to get lost! Duke Lemberg, this is all your fault!" Then he saw the Duke heading somewhere and asked again, "What? Where the hell are you going?" The prince immediately rushed after the Duke and asked, "Explain to me what you are going to do now." The Duke of Lemberg approached the coffin and said, "They say that he was so badly burned that confirming his identity has caused some difficulty." Leaning over the coffin and smiling, the Duke said, "Trying to save a young man from the Ministry of Magic. Ah, poor Felix Chamberlain." Prince Lucas and Constantine watched as the Duke, standing over Felix's coffin, muttered something under his breath. He said, "Ah, how unfortunate. Today we will mourn you with all our hearts." At that moment, the words were heard, "Those who exalt themselves will be brought down to earth, and those who lower themselves will be raised to heaven. Clearer than water, warmer than sunlight, fresher than the wind, clearer and purer than the autumn sky." Such was Felix Chamberlain. As he was losing consciousness, and his eyes were turning blacker than the darkness itself, these were the very words that came out of his mouth. "No matter what methods and techniques you use, I still haven't completely cast aside my regrets. There will come a day when justice and beliefs will be trampled upon, but it no longer matters, because I died for them. What steps would a man take who declared he must be reborn after his death? Even a girl named Irene didn't know." Someone began to whine, saying that the deputy minister had left us at such a young age. The girl turned her head back to see the man who had just spoken those words. She also heard the speaker say, "What was I talking about? I thought he would live a long life, but God must have treasured him so much that he took him to himself sooner." She suddenly realized she had found what she had been searching for. She saw a man who resembled the crown prince, yet it was not him. It was his brother, the second prince, Cedric. Irene wondered if she could handle it, since he was a man. No, even though he was a man, it was enough to just start. There was probably nothing difficult or impossible about it. She'll win him over by pretending she's a girl. Irene suddenly thought, "I can definitely do this. I'm a real genius at picking up lines." The girl pulled one glove off her hand and began adjusting the sleeve of her robe. Now was exactly the moment she'd been hoping for. After this, Irene approached the crying young man, looked into his face and asked, "Tell me, could you talk to me secretly somewhere in a deserted place?" The young man looked pleadingly at the stranger who approached him and said nothing. But then a slight smile appeared on his face and he said, "Unexpected." Then Prince Cedric began to walk forward, with Irene following behind him. The prince said, "This is the first time something like this has happened to me at a funeral." The young man walked on without stopping. He said, "I'm certainly not such a noble man, but still, it seems there's someone more skillful than me." He leaned his back against the column, and turning to Irene said, "It seems to me that you are not a good girl either." When the girl asked, puzzled, "What?" Prince Cedric raised his head and said to her, "I think it's a little inappropriate to have an affair on a day like this." Irene was simply stunned by his words. It seemed Prince Cedric had misinterpreted her words entirely. Well, she'd have to disappoint him. While she was thinking about what he had just said, Irene was wondering what to say to him, considering he had added, "You are a very bad girl." Then Prince Cedric said, "I offer my deepest condolences. We had no particular connection with the deceased, but I heard a lot about him. You must have been deeply saddened by the loss of such a man." Cedric then added, "I don't understand why he had to die. A huge number of people are truly mourning the loss of Felix Chamberlain." The girl listened attentively to the man standing opposite her. who said, "Just look, there are only insects swarming around, wasting oxygen." The young man's face turned sad as he said, "Come to think of it, he once released an insect that I was going to catch." Looking at the prince's gloomy expression, Irene couldn't figure out what this meant. Had he been bitten by a bug? What was this strange mood? But the girl's answer stunned the young prince even more. Irene said, "I think Felix believed that even a tiny insect has a reason to live." She smiled broadly at her interlocutor and added, "You and I don't know what kind of life this insect has." After this, Irene said to the prince, "Felix's death is sad, but I think it is the only possible outcome of his convictions." The young man standing across from her seemed to have begun to see the light. He looked at her closely, as if realizing his initial conclusions had been wrong. Claudia laughed softly to herself. This had become a habit. She thought, I didn't suggest meeting just to say such things, but she still felt compelled to do it. After this, she was literally struck by the words of Prince Cedric, who said, "I heard that you have a talent for dealing with people. They're already talking about it everywhere." Cedric, laughing slightly, said, "You speak very beautifully, but still I don't understand why we need this conversation." After this, the young man began to move towards her and said, "Listen, I could agree to what you need without such a long speech." He grabbed Irene by the head, pulled her a little closer to him and said, "You could have got what you need without all these long speeches." She tore herself from his embrace, now without her veil, and cried out loudly, "Why do you suddenly think you know what I want?" Then she pushed his gloved hand away. Prince Cedric replied, "Listen, it's obvious. You want my love now. It may not be sincere, but I'll let you feel it all right." Then the prince touched the girl's face and said, "And besides, I will be pleased, since your face is so sweet." Irene could only say, "What?" After this, the prince touched the girl's lips with his finger, and lightly pressing on her lower lip, said, "And I also really like these little lips." He moved his face so close that his nose almost touched the girl's eye, and said, "I just want to swallow you. I think you'll like it too." But the next moment, Irene pushed Prince Cedric away from her with all her might with both hands, and shouted loudly, "Get away!" She grabbed the wrist of her other hand with her palm, and looking angrily into the young man's face, said, "Don't touch me as you please. You have completely misinterpreted my intentions." The prince asked again, "Then why this meeting?" When the girl told him, "I didn't invite you here for that reason at all." Stepping slightly away from the prince, Irene said, "I needed you in a completely different sense." Prince Cedric raised both his hands in front of him, questioningly, and asked in confusion, "You need me, but why then?" He was struck again by the girl's words when she said, "I just saw an opportunity." Cedric asked, "An opportunity?" Irene began to explain to him, "Prince, it seems to me that you are behaving like a moth, flying to a flame, but not rushing into the fire for fear of a senseless death." The young man's face twisted into a grimace, and Cedric said, "Don't throw around such careless words." Irene said, "I can offer you another life that might have meaning. I need you." Prince Cedric asked, "It seems to me, judging by your words, that you intend to use me in some way." Irene replied, "I will make you useful, so if you wish to continue wasting your life as you are now, then give it to me." Cedric asked, "What nonsense? Who would even think of such a thing?" Irene smiled slightly and looked at the prince. "Of course, just take one step, and you won't be able to leave again." The girl held a piece of paper in her hand. She said, "If you still decide to agree with me, just come here." She continued to hold the piece of paper in front of the frozen, astonished Prince Cedric's face. After some thought, the young man reached out to the piece of paper, pulled it out, and said, "I'll take this." The girl replied that it was a good decision. The second prince, Cedric, was different from his older brother. In the novel, he occupied a position of secondary importance after the main characters. When Claudia, captured by the main three villains, was wasting away, unable to watch and endure it, he freed the girl from the imperial palace. He accompanied Claudia during her escape and decided to run away with her. However, in the novella, a simply terrible end awaited him, which was also witnessed by the girl he saved, at least for a while. Prince Lucas decided to punish him severely for his misdeed. He looked at Claudia and asked her, "Were you really planning to entrust your fate to this worthless man?" After these words, Lucas committed a terrible crime in front of the astonished eyes of Claudia. Claudia witnessed with her own eyes how Lucas ripped out his brother's heart. Thus, the pessimistic and carefree Prince Cedric saved Claudia, but not because he liked her. He simply wanted to do it. He wandered endlessly in search of the meaning of life and couldn't find it. He dreamed of one day shining brightly, and his only chance to shine was Claudia, caught off guard by the villains. Cedric simply needed an incentive to get fired up and take action. Now the young man had picked up a piece of paper, and so Irene thought she might finally be able to win him over to her side. The girl was sure that the prince, who led a carefree life, unable to find any use for himself, would never be able to refuse her offer. After the meeting ended, Irene ran as fast as she could toward the entrance to the temple. She thought it was already too late, and she might be late. Suddenly, she stopped as the person standing in front of her asked her, "Tell me, are you the daughter of the Ember family?" The girl was absolutely terrified. This man really scared her, and she sighed heavily and said, "Yes, that's right." A man with fiery red hair and a beard to match said, "You girl, you're always running around everywhere." It was Duke Defilation, Eric's father. Irene immediately lowered her head and said, "Sorry for making you wait when you were already—" The man didn't let her finish, interrupting her mid-sentence and saying, "Erica asked me. She said it was the first time in her life she wanted anything, And what will you do to her in return? The Duke shouted loudly. Irene realized he was talking about something that had happened earlier, so she replied, I was just telling your daughter about a different way of looking at the world. The man narrowed his predatory gaze, looked intently at his interlocutor, as if she were some kind of mouse, and said, Do you mean a different view of self-will? Irene wasn't going to be embarrassed, and answered loudly, It's not so much about willfulness, but about freedom, because everyone should have freedom of choice, even if you might regret it later. The Duke replied, The choice is my prerogative, and there can be no regrets, and even more so, you have no right to interfere in the life of my family. She was on the verge of tears when the Duke laughed loudly and said, Well, you've made a fuss, as if you knew better. Irene replied, A lady also believes she has the right to choose how she lives. The Duke of Defilashin fell silent when Irene said, If I were your daughter, I would fight to the very end, even if I ended up losing and dying. After this, the Duke turned his head to the side and said, You know, it was reprehensible of you to fill my daughter's head with this nonsense, but I think I will not do anything to you. After that, he said, But I just hope that you will stay with the Chamberlain family for a long, short time. After this, the Duke walked away, and Irene remained standing in place, unable to even take the slightest step. Then the girl sat down on the floor and began to cry quietly. She felt both hurt and scared at the same time. After a while, she turned her head to the side when someone called her name. Claudia ran up to Irene and cried out loudly, Irene, where have you been? I've been looking for you for so long. Are you so tired that you just sat down to rest? Still reeling from her last encounters and conversations, Irene was unable to utter a word. It was as if she had fallen into a short-lived trance. But then Irene quietly laughed and replied to Claudia, I'm sorry I made you worry. I've been dealing with strange people all day today, and it's been really tough. Then the girl continued, But all this is nonsense. After I saw my friend Claudia, I immediately felt stronger. Claudia immediately laughed back and said, Oh, really? Then let's go get something tasty. She held the map of Kamoli Island in her hands and wondered whether their journey to this lost island would be successful. She thought that Get You members should have contacted them by now. Why hadn't there been any news yet? This smelled like great danger. Irene sighed heavily and, ready to burst into tears, said, What should we do now? Her thoughts were interrupted by Claudia coming up and saying, If you keep looking at this map, will any solution come to you? Irene was forced to put the card down and told the girl that that wasn't true. Claudia remarked, Then stop it. Let's pack our things together. Irene turned her head toward her and exclaimed joyfully, Good! Come to think of it, the trip was a 3-person affair. After all, Count, as the head of the family, needs to defend his position, and Lady Olivia will be physically strained during the trip. Claudia had to agree with her and said, Still, it's good that we have a reason to leave, at least for a little while. The girls immediately imagined this trip. This was their first trip together. It looked very tempting and exciting. The two girls immediately began chatting cheerfully about the upcoming trip, their joy uninhibited, saying, How wonderful this will all be. At that moment, Irene remarked, But we're not going there to have fun. Claudia replied, And yet, I'm really looking forward to it. That's true. I packed everyone's clothes and took artifacts for self-defense. One of the girls added, And I didn't forget to take the potions with me either. Irene paused and said, To keep our identity a secret, we have to constantly change our appearance. How much do we need to take with us? After this, the girl took a large flask in her hands and said, As far as I know, there are an incredible number of different types of magic potions. She added, What if you try to create some of these magical substances yourself? At that time, the girls were not in the Count's palace, but in a special secret estate of the Chamberlain family. When asked, Aren't you bored? Irene replied, On the contrary, it's possible to live here. It's so quiet and calm that it helps you concentrate. Then she asked her interlocutor, But wouldn't it be better if you had at least one servant? For example, me? Felix immediately burst out laughing and said, What a joke you have. I don't need servants. To which the girl replied, I wasn't joking at all. Irene laughed loudly, and her heart began to pound louder in her chest as she said, Well, I came to tell you something. Felix opened the case Irene handed him in surprise and asked, What is this? There were a huge number of test tubes inside, and his interlocutor told Felix that his face was very noticeable, so she decided that he should disguise himself as best he could. The young man took one of the test tubes, looked at it, and said, I am indeed a dead man with a rather recognizable face. After this, Felix pulled the cork out of one of the test tubes, and a little smoke came out. He then brought the test tube to his nose and began to sniff its contents. After this, the young man brought the vessel to his mouth, preparing to swallow its contents. Meanwhile, Irene sat there, distraught, her heart pounding. She felt as if the professor were currently checking her assignment. Irene thought something bad was about to happen when Felix asked sternly, Who did this? She didn't know what to do. It seemed like she'd made some kind of mess. Irene didn't know what to think anymore. She sighed in disappointment and asked her interlocutor, Is it really that bad with him? Felix looked at her carefully, smiled, and said, No, quite the opposite. For a first time, this is absolutely amazing. Still lowering her head, Irene heard him praise her. She said, This is the final product after 10 failed attempts. The young man praised her again. He said, You know, for 10 tries, you did pretty well for a beginner. Suddenly, Irene burst out laughing and asked again, You're not lying to me? Is this true? Felix smiled at her and said, However, Drinking this potion will cause serious side effects, so you yourself are strictly forbidden from trying it. The girl considered whether she should be scolded or praised. Felix had to choose one. Then he asked, "Tell me, how did you come up with the idea to make the potion?" Irene replied, "I suddenly thought about it yesterday, so I decided to give it a try. It just seemed like something I needed to do." When Felix said, "So, you achieved this result in just one day, and you've never studied before?" Irene replied, "Well, of course. How could a girl who never even attended the academy learn how to make potions?" Felix covered his mouth in embarrassment and said, "Irene, I'm sorry. I think I accidentally said something unnecessary." Irene laughed and replied, "I'm not particularly interested in it, so it's no big deal." In fact, she had finished high school and even attended university, but she decided not to talk about it. She said, "I've lived hard so far, so I have no regrets." Felix replied, "Of course I understand. The path you take will always be the right one." Irene laughed and was delighted when Felix said, "I'm not very good at praising talent, but you certainly have one." She replied, "Oh, no need. You don't have to say all that." Although in reality, she was incredibly happy. The young man looked her in the face and said, "Irene, these are not empty words. To have created such a thing, being self-taught, is truly a tremendous talent." Laughing and sighing, Irene replied, "Then what, should I do a little more?" Felix replied to her, "If you wish, I can teach you something from time to time." When the girl said he shouldn't do it because he was so busy, Felix replied, "I'm busy because I want to be of some use to you. Don't deprive me of this joy." A moment later, Irene replied, "You must be tired, but thank you for the offer." She felt as if the beauty of Felix's decline grew stronger with each passing moment. At one point, she looked at him and noticed something very strange. She couldn't believe her eyes. Irene's attentive gaze didn't miss the fact that Felix's shirt had become too tight, and the fabric had even split in one place. She wondered if this, too, was the demon's power. She remembered something she'd once heard a friend say. They say that if you fall in love with a guy with a good body, you'll want to play his body like a harp every day. Irene was confused by her thoughts. Her face flushed. She felt hot, and she covered her cheeks with her palms. Felix looked at her and asked, "What happened to you so suddenly?" At that moment, Irene thought that it seemed like she was the one possessed by the demon. Night fell, and the house grew quiet. Both Felix and Irene went to bed. Felix felt rather uneasy in his sleep. He kept tossing and turning, as if he couldn't settle down. He suddenly felt unwell, as if he had a fever. He was hot, and sweat was pouring down his forehead and eyes. The young man's eyes were closed. He was thinking about how, although his healing was rapid, his fatigue somehow continued to accumulate. Felix felt like his body had become heavy, as if someone was sitting on him, and he couldn't even move. At one point, it really seemed to him that some almost naked stranger, dressed in a light, transparent robe, had climbed onto his feet. Felix opened his eyes slightly, wanting to make sure he wasn't imagining things, and then quietly said, "Ah!" He decided to reach out to the girl, who was visibly trembling at that moment. He couldn't even move his hand, so he let it fall limply. But his next attempt succeeded, and he touched one of Irene's cheeks with his palm, whose eyes sparkled at that moment, but it seemed the sparkle was not from tears, but from passion. Felix looked at the girl with satisfaction and laughed quietly. He saw Irene's face right in front of him. He looked at it, smiling, and lightly stroked her cheek. At the same time, she rested her palm on his bare chest. It all seemed like some kind of unreal dream. He couldn't believe it all. It felt like his dreams had just come true. Felix looked into Irene's face and asked her, "How did you manage to cope with the transformation so well?" He touched his finger to the girl's lips and said, "But I think it's time for you to stop here." Suddenly, he thought about the spirit trapped inside his body. He asked the girl, "What's the point of this anyway?" She sat motionless on his lower back. When she didn't answer his question about the purpose of all this, he turned to Irene and asked her to leave. A moment later, the girl didn't respond to his request, but began to caress the young man's body with her soft, pleasant palm. It seemed to him that her hand was visibly shaking. After this, Irene burst into tears and addressed him by name. "Felix!" She looked very attractive in her light nightwear. The young man couldn't take his eyes off her attractive face and half-naked body for a moment. It seemed as if everything around him had disappeared, and they were alone in a vast world. A moment later, he abruptly flipped the girl over and was now on top of her, his hands lightly resting on her shoulders. Irene lay motionless beneath his body, and he repeated, "I told you to stop." The girl in front of the young man smirked, then laughed loudly, and, in the voice of the spirit Laraj, answered him, "Ugh, how rude you are!" The demon's voice echoed in Felix's head again, saying, "But in reality, you've always wanted this. You could hold her in your arms every day and give her your love." He replied to the spirit, "It seems you didn't hear me. I asked you." Then he said, "Tell me, if I decide to pierce my heart with the sacred sword." He continued, "What will it be like if I decide to do this? Will we both die together?" He asked Laraj what he would say about the vessel that was his body being destroyed by suicide. He continued to look at the silent, motionless girl, who was still lying beneath him. A moment later, the girl laughed loudly and said in a demonic voice, "What a hypocrite you are!" Felix listened to his inner voice. It said, "You want to be alone with her. Admit it to yourself. You're pretending to be kind and innocent, but you're seething with passion." After she left, you inhaled her scent for a long time, and even blushed. The spirit continued, "Your outer appearance is completely at odds with your inner self. You look even more terrifying than a demon, Even I, frankly, find it a little frightening. After this, the young man began to shake the girl by the shoulder with his trembling hand, trying to bring her back to her senses. A spirit inside him said, "If you want to know why I'm doing this, I can explain everything to you." Felix listened to the voice that said, "Irene is right here, right now." And at that moment, the young man's eyes suddenly opened. Felix looked around the room and thought, "Phew, of course it was just a dream. Maybe I'll dream something like that." But a moment later, a gentle hand with a wet napkin touched his head, pressed it to his forehead, and Irene said, "I knew it." Sitting not far from him, smiling, was Irene, holding a wet bandage in her hand. She said, "You must have had a nightmare. You look absolutely awful, I must say." Felix laughed back and said, "Don't worry, I'm perfectly fine." He thought, "What's that faint, intoxicating smell?" The young man asked the girl, "Tell me, do you still have the sword I gave you?" He seemed to reach out to her with his hand. When the girl approached him and asked again, "What?" he immediately pulled her towards him, looked closely into her face, and said, "But I warned you." The young man's heart, like Irene's, began to beat quickly and loudly in his chest at the moment when their lips were about to close. Their faces were very close to each other, and at that moment, the girl asked Felix again, "Should I take your temperature?" She stood next to the exhausted Felix's bed and stared intently into his face. He was unable to move. After that, Irene sat up a little and said, "You know, your forehead is really burning. You look pretty sick, so lie still." She knew this would happen, so she'd brought a wet towel beforehand. The young man sighed heavily and then plopped down on the bed again, closing his eyes. Irene looked at Felix and thought that he looked like a trapped prince who had fallen asleep in his ice castle. He looked completely broken and helpless. At this time, Felix, without turning his head, opened his eyes and asked, "Irene, tell me, if I die, will you be very sad for me?" Irene immediately exclaimed loudly, "What are you suddenly asking about? You even survived that dangerous situation, and if you die here, I'll never forgive you." She clutched the wet towel so tightly in her hands that she seemed ready to tear it to shreds, which could only indicate how great her rage was. Afterwards, Irene placed a bandage on Felix's forehead, who said, "Right now, I feel like I'm going to die. But if you're going to be sad, then I probably shouldn't die." Irene was shocked by his words and did not know what to answer, only quietly said, "Felix." Irene walked into the room with a huge stack of papers in her hands and said, "Take this." He asked in response, "What is this?" As if nothing had happened, Felix stood at the table littered with books and said, "These are the books in my research that I have been doing since childhood." Still holding the papers, Irene replied, "Oh, I'm very grateful to you." Felix continued, "Even though they're just collecting dust, let them lie here for now." Then the young man looked at her and asked, "Tell me, did you sleep at all?" Irene replied, "Of course I slept well." After this, Felix said, "Sorry. Even though I suggested it myself, I don't think I'll be able to personally teach you now. This is all quite burdensome." Irene looked at him with concern and asked, "Did something happen to you?" Covering his mouth with his hand, the young man replied, "Sorry, but I'd like to avoid meeting you alone right now, if possible. I hope you understand." Stunned by his words, Irene couldn't respond beyond a quiet, "Okay?" She nervously clutched the papers in her hands. A huge train pulled up to the platform, hissing its brakes. He stopped, and the girl exclaimed, "Look how magnificent it looks. This is a train designed by the Union of Magicians and Alchemists." Irene was amazed. Claudia said, "Looking at it, I realize it looks even better than I expected. It's a good thing I borrowed it for the day." After this, the girl laughed and, turning to her friend, asked, "What? Maybe I should buy it?" Her friend winked at Claudia and replied, "Why? Please, control yourself. We'll need the money later." But Claudia wouldn't calm down. She exclaimed, "But I like him so much. I can't help it." In response, Irene said, "Claudia, you are too excited. You need to calm down." Seemingly slightly upset by his words, Claudia nevertheless agreed and said, "Okay." Irene laughed loudly and declared, "We'll only ride it a couple of times, so is there any need to buy it? I think wastefulness is not a good thing." After some time, the locomotive hissed again, and a huge cloud of white smoke flew out of its chimney. When all the passengers had already taken their seats, the train began to move rapidly. Claudia kept her gaze fixed on the window, taking in the scenery beyond. She said, "I feel like we're going on a real adventure or expedition." At the same time, Irene sat calmly in her place and watched her companion. Claudia exclaimed excitedly, "There are no hotels, no tourist agencies, no well-known local goods. Even the train and boat are uncomfortable." Irene laughed and replied, "I don't think there's anything good about that, but you seem to be very pleased." Claudia replied, "Of course. This is my first trip to such a remote place where there isn't even a tourist brochure." Irene smiled and said, "You seem very happy, Claudia, and I'm happy about it too." After these words, Claudia laughed even louder and added, "If you're happy, then I should be even happier. That's just wonderful." But then she became a little sad and said, "But first, I need to make up for the sleep I've been missing." Her interlocutor replied, "Okay, then get a good night's sleep." After that, Claudia went out and went to rest. Irene heard someone call her name at that moment and replied, "Yes?" The person who approached me turned out to be Felix, holding a book. He asked, "Irene, perhaps you ate something sweet, like a lollipop?" The girl replied, "No, do I smell sweet?" Felix slammed the book shut and said, "No, it doesn't smell, but I'll still move to another car." Irene looked at him in bewilderment and asked, "Why did you suddenly decide to do this?" Not hearing an answer, she watched with alarm as Felix walked away. Then the girl jumped up from her seat and grabbed him by the sleeve. She tried with all her might to detain the young man. She held him back and asked, "Tell me, could you stay here?" Felix turned to her and silently began to push her hand away. He said, "It's too close." Then he added, "Such closeness brings me only heavy and anxious feelings. It's very difficult for me to bear." Irene stared at him, pondering his words. She tried to find the reason for the young man's strange behavior. Felix sighed heavily and grabbed his head with his hand, trying to find the words. Finally he said, "Irene, look, maybe we should have an explanation." He shifted hesitantly from foot to foot. He looked at the girl's face in front of him and thought, "I probably need to say this, but it's so hard." Someone's words floated into her mind. "A passion for you." She recalled that mock funeral and the Duke's words about Felix. Perhaps that person knew something she hadn't noticed. The words echoed in her head again, and she thought, "Does Felix really desire me? And if it's true, would I be uncomfortable with it?" She briefly imagined Felix gently touching her cheek, and then his lips touching hers. The sensation felt not at all unpleasant. But the next second, Irene was confused by her thoughts. She blushed. Her eyes sparkled, because she realized she wasn't at all opposed to such a kiss. Felix tried to remove her hand again and asked, "Why don't you listen to me?" He finally freed himself, turned his back to her and said, "Please don't make me scare you with my power. I really wouldn't want to do that." Irene watched the young man walk away in amazement. She still couldn't shake the impression evoked by her recent thoughts. She watched his back and wondered why he hadn't wanted to stay close. It was as if her very company weighed on him or frightened him, especially the prospect of being alone with her. Suddenly, the girl jumped up from her seat and ran quickly after Felix. She cried out loudly, "Don't go!" Her voice was simply pleading. Felix walked up to the door and pulled the handle down, preparing to exit. He was in a hurry to get out of this car and into the next one. But the girl caught up with him, and he was forced to turn around when Irene asked, "Tell me, why don't you take responsibility?" She grabbed his wrist again and pulled him toward her. It was unknown where such incredible strength had come from in such a frail-looking girl. Felix looked at her in surprise and asked, "What do you mean?" He looked confused and surprised. The girl did not answer right away, was silent for a while, and then, with shining eyes and flushed cheeks, said, "Felix, you have tamed me, so now you must bear responsibility for it." The young man tried to pull his trembling hand away, but she added, "Please stroke me the same way you did before." Irene, almost in tears, looked into his face, placed his palm on her head and said, "If you touch me now, I won't break. Please try." Felix's hand was shaking as he touched her head and quietly said, "Irene." His face at that moment was excruciatingly painful to look at. A moment later, the girl screamed in fear. She was terrified of what might happen next, as the man raised his rather impressive fist over her head. At that moment, Felix clenched his fist and slammed it into the wall with all his might. He screamed, "Irene! If you don't want to see me lose my mind, please stop." Irene looked at the impact site. Felix said, "What good soundproofing this car has. Something like that happened to the wall, and no one even came. No matter what I do, no one will know." Irene heard the crack of the wall being broken, but remained calm. She asked, "Tell me, could you just be a little more gentle?" Felix covered his face with his hand and laughed quietly. The whole situation seemed rather ridiculous. Then he put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Well, do whatever you want. Looks like I've lost." Irene asked quietly, "I'd like to know something. Tell me, is this desire you're talking about? My murder? Is this what you warned me about?" Turning slightly away, Felix replied, "No, that's impossible." He answered her question quickly and confidently, without a moment's hesitation. Then the girl continued, "So you want to break my arms and legs, gouge out my eyes, tear off my nails, peel off my skin, rip out my heart, and hang it?" Felix was stunned. He exclaimed, "How could I do such a thing?" He even shuddered at his own words. He seemed terrified to even imagine what his interlocutor had described so vividly. After this, Irene laughed and said, "So you don't have any problems?" This turn of events only made the girl happy. Felix thought for a moment and replied, "Irene, I could break you, and I don't want that at all. I would never want to hurt you." The girl threw up her hands and, smiling broadly, said, "Don't worry, I'm strong. You won't break me so easily." Felix replied, "You say that even after seeing the wall. You are an amazing person. I am simply amazed by your courage." The girl approached him and said, "My body may be softer than a wall, but even if you squeeze me hard, I won't break. If I'm not afraid of this at all, then you should be at least a little braver." She grabbed his hand and pulled him close. Laughing, Irene said, "You know that yourself," and pulled him closer. He didn't dare resist this powerful pressure. Then she pressed her whole body against Felix and hugged him around the waist. She pressed herself against him with all her strength so that he wouldn't suddenly try to break free from her embrace. Irene pressed her forehead against his chest and whispered, "So, please stroke me." Felix reached out a trembling hand to her head. It seemed to require enormous effort and incredible strength. After a moment, his hand calmed slightly, and he gently stroked her hair. His movement seemed awkward, but he didn't dare stop stroking. As he was already holding her close, Irene quietly asked, "Well, how is it?" Felix didn't answer right away. It was enough for her that the young man remained close to her. After a few seconds, he said, "Yes, it's hotter than a fever. Much hotter, and it burns like a hot fire. Running his hand through her hair, he added, "And that is much sweeter than death." The young man understood this better than anyone. A moment later, Felix heard the voice inside him again. The demon addressed him and said, "Wow, you're even more brazen than I thought. Well, that was completely unexpected." After this, Laraj burst out laughing and added, "Well, at the rate you're going now, it's only a matter of a very short time." Still laughing, the demon continued, "I know you will inevitably soon taste hellish pleasure. You are moving in the right direction, and will soon find yourself where I predicted." Felix replied, "You're just a part of me, and you don't even know what love is. If the love people experience were just pleasure, a demon like you simply wouldn't exist." His interlocutor chuckled. "There's still so much you don't know. You have so much more to learn than you've ever learned in your entire short life." Then the voice, full of cold confidence, said, "Listen, there is no being greater than a demon, and you have yet to understand this." Felix calmly retorted, "I'm sure a demon can't exist without a human. As soon as a human dies, the spirit within him dies too." The demon was silent for a moment, then asked, "Then explain, what is human love? I don't understand it, but I want to understand." Felix replied, "Demon and angel, heaven and hell, they are opposites. Just like pleasure and anger, happiness and suffering, sorrow and joy. You are not given to understand this." He continued, "No matter how hard you try to express your feelings, it will never be enough. There are so many more of them than can be explained in words. Until you experience it yourself, you won't understand." After a brief pause, he added, "Love often leaves regrets behind, and I walk hand in hand with them." Then Felix quietly said, "To become a perfect demon, you must first become human and experience all of this for yourself." He gave a weak smile. "If you want, I'll give you freedom when this long war is over, but you'll have to earn it. I'm not going to give you anything." The demon replied coldly, "I have lived for billions of years, and I know. Man is just a defective product that could not become a perfect being." He continued, "And your so-called love is nothing. It's just a way to fill a void. A demon doesn't need love. He's already perfect." After this, Laraj declared, "All this means only one thing. Soon I will be free. I will become strong and ruthless. I will need no one." The voice grew colder. "Human, you must understand. I will consume you and become a perfect demon. You will not be able to resist me. Your body will become mine, and I will wait for it." However, the demon didn't understand something. He felt a strange pain inside him all the time, pulsating, incessant. Finally, he asked, "Why? You weren't even hurt. Then why are you feeling pain?" And after a moment, he added irritably, "It hurts like hell for me too. Stop feeling this. What the hell is this? You damn idiot." At last, their train journey came to an end, and the travelers arrived at the seacoast, where a large, simply magnificent sailing ship awaited them, its sails fluttering in the strong wind. A loud cry rang out. Irene, standing in front of everyone, asked again, "What?" Then added, "Will it really be difficult for you to send our ship to the island?" She was completely at a loss, and spread her arms in bewilderment. The captain of the ship stood right in front of the young people and asked, "You said yourself that you were heading to Kamoli Island, didn't you?" The girl replied, "Yes, that's true, and we chartered your ship precisely for this purpose." The old captain took a drag on his wooden pipe, blew out the smoke, and said, "It's not that it's difficult. It would be more accurate to say that I can't get near this damned island. If you don't wish to die, you'd better give up on this idea." The young men looked at him with alarm. Irene repeated questioningly, "Death?" Everyone was stunned and upset by this news. Their hopes were dashed by the harsh reality. They'd already imagined setting sail on this ship. And now, looking at it, they objected, "But why can't we go? There's no storm in sight now. The waves are calm. The sea is quiet." The captain replied, "As soon as we approached the island, the ship began to sink, as if something were pulling it down. Everyone heading there perished." Felix frowned and said, "Yeah, that's pretty damn weird." Then he asked, "Why didn't you ask the capital for help? Surely the problem could have been solved then." The captain replied, "Because Kamoli Island has been privately owned for a long time. We only found out about this recently." He continued, "People from the Penella Trading Group claimed the sea belonged to them too, and wouldn't let us anywhere near it. About a month ago, the island was suddenly sold, and the people were taken away. Only then did the truth come out." He sighed heavily. "We had no way to report this to the capital, but we know the people on the island did something, and it was after that it became a huge danger to all travelers." Afterwards, the captain explained that many people had recently died while passing by Kamoli Island. It had become a veritable curse, and according to him, the people there had likely angered God. Claudia and Irene sat on the edge of the pier and began to look at the sea surface, enjoying the sea air. Before them lay an island, their final destination, which, as it turned out, was not at all easy to reach. Irene was beside herself with rage. She stood up, then sat down again, then leaned over, then suddenly stood up. Then she said, "The captain reported that the men were killed. The Get You members were most likely wiped out as well. If they hadn't contacted me, everything would have been fine." Sitting next to her, Claudia looked at her friend in bewilderment and opened the box she was holding in her hands. Irene still couldn't calm down. Clenching her fists, she growled angrily, sometimes at herself, sometimes at the gods who had prevented her from reaching the cursed island. Suddenly, the girl burst into tears. Her heart began to beat faster, and she said, "Can I still call myself human after this? It seems so many people have died because of me." She couldn't finish her sentence. Irene immediately shoved a sandwich into her mouth, blocking her words. Tears streamed down Irene's cheeks, and she sobbed softly. Holding the sandwich in her hand, she said, "I have no right to eat this." Claudia laughed softly, took a bite of her sandwich, and replied, "No, we're all trying to survive. If we don't eat, we won't survive." Irene couldn't stop thinking about how to get to the island. She asked thoughtfully, "What should we do now?" Claudia, as usual, smiled broadly and said, "We could just buy a boat and get there ourselves. I don't understand what the problem is." After this, Claudia looked at her brother, who was standing nearby on the embankment and surrounded by some people, and said, "Besides, there is no need to be upset because we still have people whom we hired in advance." It was true. As before, they had been recommended by a friend of Irene's, so they were trustworthy. Besides, they even promised to erase their memories after the job was done. Irene laughed loudly and declared, "It looks like things aren't so bad after all. We can still do something about it." The girls continued talking, and at some point Irene said, "But I'm still a little worried because I don't know how things will turn out." Then she looked at her interlocutor and added, "And despite everything, I'm incredibly glad to be moving so far away after such a long time." Her friend asked, "Really?" Laughing, Claudia replied, "I used to feel uncomfortable around strangers. They'd always stare at me, but thanks to magic that blurs appearances and traces of presence, I began to feel free." At this time, Felix was talking to the people around him. Claudia, noticing him, said, "Brother is probably very happy with this trip too. He's glad he can finally get some fresh air instead of hiding in our secret estate." Irene also looked at the young man. He seemed to have regained his former ease and no longer seemed so withdrawn. He began to smile more often. She looked closely at Felix and thought he was becoming himself again. Then Irene laughed and said, "That reassures me." The girls didn't notice several birds approaching them with their wings spread wide. With loud cries, they flew straight toward the unsuspecting girls. When Irene spotted the approaching bird, she screamed and stared at the seagull. It swept past her with such speed that her hair was disheveled. Irene didn't immediately realize that her hand holding the sandwich was suddenly empty. The piece of food had mysteriously vanished, along with the appearance of the winged thief. Looking at her palm, Irene screamed in horror, "My food!" The sandwich was gone. The winged rascal had stolen her breakfast. Irene immediately jumped up and, furious, rushed after the seagull. "Stop, thief!" She rushed along the shore, determined to get her food back at any cost. Left behind, Claudia screamed, dropping the sandwich box. "Irene, where are you going?" The girl had already run out onto the beach, rushing along the water's edge at the speed of the wind, and had no intention of stopping. But suddenly, her foot hit a sandy hole, and Irene fell face first into the sand. She groaned softly as she found herself buried in the sand. The girl raised her head and began to sob, whispering, "Please, give me back my sandwich." Her face, mouth, and eyes were covered in sand, but most of all, she was worried about the lost food. But suddenly, Irene stopped crying. Looking around, she noticed something that instantly brought her back to her senses. A motionless body lay nearby. Not far from her, a boy lay sprawled out, his arms and legs lifelessly spread out. Irene immediately rushed to his side. She knelt down next to him and began shaking him, asking, "Hey, are you alive?" There was no answer. A few seconds later, the boy began coughing, first once, then again, and seawater burst from his mouth. It seemed he was drowning and had swallowed it. The boy Irene found was still coughing loudly, but fortunately, he was alive. He then rolled over onto his stomach, braced himself on the sand with his hands, and began coughing again. When the girl asked worriedly, "Are you okay?" the boy, having recovered somewhat, replied, "Ah, long time no see." Then he suddenly burst out laughing and added, "And who are you?" Irene raised her index finger, laughed, and said, "It's been a while, really." She thought it best not to upset the boy, and to play along with him a little until he finally came to his senses. Irene immediately rushed towards the boy, as if she recognized him, and addressed him by name. "Andrew, is it really you? How are you feeling?" The boy was taken aback by her forcefulness, and, still not understanding what was happening, replied, "Actually, my name is Anthony." He struggled to rise from his knees, leaning on his hands. After this, Irene sat down next to him on the sand, and quietly said, "So you're alive." Her interlocutor, still breathing heavily and almost crying, answered, "Well, yes, it seems I managed to survive after all." Anthony looked terrified. A clump of seaweed was tangled around his head. He began to speak. "I really thought I was going to die. It was terrible. I didn't believe I could survive." Irene reached out and carefully removed the seaweed from his head, then said, "Anthony, please don't die." The boy, trying to crack a joke through his fatigue, replied, "Then you'll have to double the pay for such risky work. That way, I'll definitely not die. The thought of the reward will keep me going." A few minutes later, a voice called out above them, "Is this someone you know?" Irene immediately turned around and said, "Felix!" The boy looked at the approaching man in confusion. Felix quickly explained, "Irene, you suddenly ran away and scared everyone, so I followed you." Then he looked at the boy and asked, "Is he hurt?" Felix examined the teenager carefully and noticed details that hadn't escaped his attention. He needed urgent help. Anthony's face had a bluish tint. His lips were chapped, as if from a high fever, but more likely perhaps from dehydration. Felix sat down next to him and handed him a flask of water. "Have a drink." The boy nodded. "Thank you." Anthony drank water greedily as if he couldn't stop. Looking at him, Irene thought, he was so thirsty. And I didn't even realize it. She felt genuinely sorry for him. Suddenly, Irene remembered their acquaintance and said, pointing to the boy, "Felix, meet Andrew." The boy immediately stopped drinking, wiped his lips, and said indignantly, "I'm not Andrew. My name is Anthony. Why do you always call me by a different name?" Felix and Irene exchanged worried glances. The girl asked, "Will you be able to walk?" And then thought, "He doesn't look like he has any strength at all." Felix said calmly, "Right now, all he can do is breathe." Then he said, "It can't be helped," and turned to the boy. "Climb on my back." Anthony asked in surprise, "Are you an angel?" At that moment, the boy looked towards the sea. He was only worried about one thing: what had become of his companions? He said quietly, "I really hope that they are still alive." When Irene asked again, "Who are you talking about?" he replied, "We need to save them before it's too late." She frowned. "Save who?" Anthony started to explain, but Felix interrupted him. "Wait, I think I hear a sound from the island." All three turned toward the island. Flames blazed above it, thick clouds of smoke rising into the sky. It looked ominous and dangerous. Felix frowned and said, "It sounds like a scream." They froze, staring at the island. Anthony wondered if his companions could be saved, and if they were alive, and Irene and Felix wondered if they should continue this dangerous journey. Finally, the young people were able to continue their somewhat delayed journey. Their ship left the harbor, and with a favorable wind, cut through the sea toward the island. Someone on deck remarked, "The weather's fine, and the breeze is wonderful." Anthony, standing by the rail, exclaimed, "At this rate, we'll be reaching Comley Island in no time." A nearby sailor, Nick, said, "It looks dangerous, but you even seem happy. That surprises me." Anthony chuckled. "Isn't it obvious? Just finish the job and I'll get a ton of money. A huge ton." He laughed out loud. But suddenly, they both froze. They turned their heads toward the island and stared intently into the distance. Very strange things began to happen. Anthony looked at his palm and frowned. "That's weird. Where did the wind go?" It vanished as if with a flick of the wrist. That shouldn't have happened. One of the sailors picked up the compass and frowned. The needle was spinning wildly, as if something was driving it crazy. Something was wrong. The sails remained full, which was odd given the lack of wind, but the ship didn't move an inch. It stood frozen in the middle of the strait, and the water around it became eerily still. Anthony became visibly nervous. Later, during lunch, he began telling Irene what had happened. Right after that, everything turned upside down. No one understood what had happened. He had a mouthful of food, but he continued talking without stopping. When I came to, I found myself in some kind of castle, completely unfamiliar. Irene frowned and said, "But they said that ships sink when they approach the island." Anthony shrugged, continuing to eat. "I don't remember that, but my clothes were wet, so I did end up in water." He paused for a moment and added, "I still remember, as if my mind was clouded, as if I had been bewitched, and then I woke up in some strange forest." Irene listened attentively, trying to make sense of his words. The story seemed confusing. She asked, "What happened next?" Anthony took a sip of compote and continued, "The people on the island, they're not themselves. Alive, but like they've gone crazy. And also, you can't eat the food there." He put down his glass and thought, "I held out for a few days, but then I realized that if I didn't eat, I'd die. So I ran to the sea. I think that's how I saved myself. As for the rest, I don't know." Felix and Irene stared at him silently, each trying to process what they just heard. Anthony quietly added, "This place is very strange and scary." Irene leaned towards Felix and whispered, "If this is the work of a spirit, then he is clearly not a simple madman, right?" Felix replied just as quietly, "We'll have to tell the others about this anyway." A moment later, Irene's head dropped wearily onto the table. Her thoughts were in disarray. All or nothing. If it's as he says, what difference does it make, whether it's a spirit or something else? While she was thinking, Anthony looked at her in surprise and said, "You can't lie on the table." Irene lifted her heavy, aching head from the table and, hiccuping slightly, said, "Why am I surrounded by crazy people? Maybe it's because I'm crazy too?" Anthony looked at her, shrugged, and replied, "It certainly seems that way." They continued arguing. Irene decided he was a hopeless idiot. Anthony was indignant. "What? And who tried to talk to me while I was eating?" He finally added, "The risk is too great. We better leave." Despite a long discussion, they still couldn't reach a consensus. Meanwhile, Claudia was preoccupied with something completely different, finding herself far from the capital for the first time. She was curiously exploring the world around her. Grabbing an umbrella, she strolled leisurely through the city, trying not to miss a single detail. Hearing that their journey to the island could be ruined, Claudia turned to the others. "Explain to me, if I retreat now, when will I have another chance? We need to find the spirit before those three do. There's no guarantee it won't become a threat to us later." Irene was stunned by her words. Claudia continued, "I'd rather dedicate my entire life to this than give up and remain helpless. I have to see this through." Looking into her determined eyes, Irene realized she didn't know this girl very well. She hadn't expected to see such firmness in her. The girl saw a completely new, unexpected side of her. Irene laughed and said, "Okay, then we need to start preparing as soon as possible." She was sure that if it was Claudia, she could handle it. After brief but meticulous preparations, everything was ready. The ship left the harbor and headed for the island. The wind urged the well-built vessel, and it boldly cut through the oncoming waves with its bow. One of the sailors raised a finger moistened with saliva and joyfully announced, "Thank God for a fair wind." The sailor at the helm was surprised to hear a question from behind him. Everything's fine, right?" He turned around and asked again, "What are you talking about? About life?" Irene and Claudia stood behind them. The helmsman replied, "I've heard a lot from clients. You're not the first. We're mercenaries. We can't afford to doubt." He added, "If the memory-erasing magic fails, we'll be in serious trouble." The young adventurer's answer puzzled both girls. The other mercenaries supported him. One of the girls said, "We're always prepared to die. If it gets dangerous, we'll just leave." No one present contradicted her. The helmsman spoke again. "Excuse me for interrupting, but it seems the island's buildings are already visible." Irene immediately ran up and looked into the distance. "Really?" A view of the island opened up before them. What had once seemed like a simple rock now revealed itself to be a place with unusual buildings, but they looked surprisingly well kept. Felix looked closely and said, "This is an ancient architectural style. They don't build like that anymore. It was used by builders centuries ago." He added, "The pattern on the roofs is connected to an ancient faith, but that doesn't mean it's just that. There's a secret here." Irene asked worriedly, "Are you saying that time could turn back?" At that moment, the ship suddenly began to rock. The deck beneath her feet began to shake. The girl felt the vibrations growing stronger. Irene staggered, almost falling. Strong arms caught her. Felix's face appeared before her. He asked, "Are you okay?" Irene's eyes lit up. She seemed embarrassed. The situation had frightened her. She stuttered slightly as she replied, "Yes, yes." Felix looked just as disconcerted, his face flushed, his eyes glittering. He seemed frightened by the intimacy that had occurred between him and Irene. After this, the young man abruptly turned his back to the girl and uttered just one word, "Sorry." Irene did the same. The girl, her face flushed, turned her back to the young man and hurried to reassure him. She said, "Don't worry, everything's fine." But then, after her confusion had subsided a bit, she decided to find out what it was. Irene said, "By the way, what could have happened? Is this really the strength of the spirit?" She thought, "It doesn't look at all like their ship could have collided with anything underwater." One of the girls, a magician and psychic they'd specially invited, declared, "Judging by how restless the spirits are, there must definitely be a strong spirit near the island." She held a bright, glowing sphere in her hands. The girl asked the psychic, "Tell me, doesn't this mean that we are seeing something like an illusion created by the power of the spirit trapped on this island?" One of the girls they hired replied, "No, this is not magic, so I am not able to know the exact nature of this phenomenon, but at least I can say that this is not an illusion. This is a real, incredible magical power." When the same girl said that she was going to move to the island now, using teleportation magic, and look around there, Felix told her, "You can't do this under any circumstances. The space is swirled around the island by an immaterial force, which will not allow us to invade the island." When someone asked the young man what it meant to say that space was twisted, Felix began to explain, "I can't find anything to describe this phenomenon except the word twisted. We can consider this space to be of a completely different dimension, and we can't just get there." One of the young men, with arrows visible behind him, said, "What if I try shooting a bow now?" He immediately drew out an arrow and pulled the string of his bow, preparing to shoot. A moment later, the young man released the bowstring, and the arrow flew out of him. But something incredible happened. The arrow seemed to encounter some invisible obstacle in its path and immediately broke in half. Irene was simply stunned by what she saw. Could there really be some insurmountable, invisible barrier between them and the ill-fated island? It was unbelievable, and it seemed their entire undertaking had been futile. The girl accompanying the young men asked Felix, "Tell me, who are you that you know about such things? How could you have known something like this would happen?" The girl's face looked worried. This was the first time she had encountered something like this, and this unknown and mysterious thing frightened her greatly. Felix began to explain everything. He said he was just a man with a lot of random thoughts in his head, and all these thoughts were the result of long study and the huge number of books he had collected in his library. Irene looked at the island in shock and, after listening to the young man's words, asked, "Then what should we do now? It seems there's no way we can handle this. This spirit's power must be immense." A moment later, she saw Claudia climb onto the side of the boat with both feet and peer into the ocean water beneath her. Irene immediately called out the girl's name. Irene screamed loudly, urging Claudia to stop and not act rashly. She ran quickly after her, intending to stop her. For a moment, it seemed to her that time behind her had stopped, as if a bolt of lightning had illuminated everyone, and the girl's cry about why Claudia had climbed up there remained on her lips. A few moments later, the sea outside the ship suddenly began to rage. High waves rose, and the ship began to rock in the middle of the sea abyss. Claudia didn't wait to be stopped, and took a few steps straight towards the sea. The sea waves immediately rose even higher, covering the deck and sides of their ship. It seemed as if it was about to sink. After some time, the seawater completely swallowed up the traveler's ship, and a quiet, dark, calm sea closed over them.